I have a question for you. A thought experiment, if you will. Would British catgirls say Rule Britannia? Hi, I'm Spartan, and welcome to British Aircraft Carriers. Another question. Can you be arrested for human rights violations inflicted upon yourself? Because the creation of this fucking video was downright unconstitutional. But it exists. Welcome to the wonderful world of British naval bullshit. If I want to get this series done before the heat death of the universe, I gotta actually talk about the Anglos, since they are arguably the most important nation when it comes to the history of naval aviation for a number of reasons. This is also the episode where things start to get a little long. So, without further ado, let's start at the beginning. As per usual, we will start with the most interesting warships ever built. Seaplane Carriers. I love these little guys. They're so strange, yet so brilliantly practical, and genuinely one of the most important innovations in naval history. Like, the fact that so many countries all at once made the same connection of, alright, so we have these seaplanes, right? They can land on the water, but problem, they still gotta go back to land to refuel. So what if we made a boat on the water that these seaplanes could go in? Planes are in the boat on the water, and the boat can take them to other water and drop them in and pick them up and refuel them and everything. Anyways, the British were very early adopters of the idea of naval aviation, having done some experimentation with seaplanes in the lead up to World War I. Having a big fuck-off world-spanning empire meant that they needed to stay on top of naval technology developments and exploit every potential advantage possible. So naturally, when they heard the French and Japanese were building dedicated seaplane-carrying warships, they immediately jumped feet first into it. As a final note before we begin, the British had a habit of reusing ship names, so I have taken the liberty of numbering the carriers of the same name so that nobody gets confused. We will kick off this trend with our first ship of today, HMS Hermes, the first. Now, Hermes is one of those ships that only kinda sorta counts because it was, above all things, an experimental ship designed to test the practicality of naval aviation. That said, she was also the first Royal Navy ship actually capable of utilizing aviation and is therefore still incredibly important to mention. She was initially built as a high-flyer class, second-class protected cruiser right at the tail end of the 1800s. She was built to displace 5,740 tons, could make a respectable 20 knots, and initially came strapped with a shitload of small caliber guns because pre-dreadnought cruiser. There ain't much else of notes about her design other than that her boilers were shit. She was laid down on April 30th of 1897, launched almost exactly a year later, and would be commissioned into the Royal Navy in October of 1899. She was initially slated as flagship of the West Indies station, but on her maiden voyage to the West Indies, her boilers shit the bed completely, having to sit in Jamaica for a year and a half while they were repaired so she could make the journey back across the Atlantic to the Harland and Wolff yards in Belfast to have them replaced completely. The ship spent several irrelevant years serving as the flagship for various smaller fleets around the world until 1913, when she was selected as the lab rat for aircraft trials. Most of her guns were stripped, and she was given a small tarped hangar and a weird catapult-esque launching system on the front of the ship that didn't work very well and was only used a few times. Instead, the standard crane drop system was the usual way planes were launched. She was rigged to carry 3 seaplanes, but usually carried 2 due to space. For most of 1913, she just played around with these planes, wargaming with other ships and launching pretend recon missions, figuring out what worked and what didn't. The ultimate realization for the British Admiralty was that yes, ship-based aircraft are totally possible and have a ton of potential, but we need purpose-built aircraft, not just rinky-dink converted land-based ones. She would eventually be recommissioned into the proper navy with the outbreak of World War I, where she ferried aircraft from Britain to France. Of course, though, World War I was where all sorts of new shit was being used. On October 31st of 1914, she was sunk in the Strait of Dover by a German U-boot, taking 21 of her crew with her. She wasn't a ship that did much, but the proof of concept alone makes her absolutely critical in the history of naval aviation. The lessons learned from Hermes would be applied almost immediately to the construction of the Royal Navy's first purpose-built aircraft-carrying warship, Ark Royal. Now that the Admiralty figured out that these carriers were an idea that wasn't completely fucking insane, the 1914 naval budget had a small allocation towards converting a merchant ship into a full-blown seaplane carrier. For this role, they selected the Ark Royal, the first. She had been laid down in November of 1913 and was bought out in May of 1914, when she was still mostly a frame and was essentially built from the ground up as a carrier. After her completion, she came to displace 7,190 tons, could make 11 knots, and could carry an impressive 8 aircraft. She was launched on September 5th of 1914 and commissioned on December 10th because World War I. One of her most interesting features is the fact that she was strapped with a steadying sail, and she remains the only aircraft carrier in history to feature one, which is cool as hell, honestly. Me when aircraft carrying sailboat. Because the ship was slow as shit, her service life was primarily focused on the Mediterranean, where she cut her teeth at Gallipoli through limited bombing raids and recon missions. She would support the Anzacs during their part of the fighting, where she was almost sunk by a battleship and then a submarine on 2 separate days. After Gallipoli ended in disaster, she just mostly lurked around the Aegean, serving as a depot ship and bombing the occasional Turkish boat, as well as Smyrna a bunch of times, and eventually when the Turks surrendered, she took part in the occupation of Constantinople. After the end of the war, she served almost exclusively as a ferry ship due to the new and shiny Flattops taking up everyone's attention, and in 1930 she was converted into a training ship. She was given a catapult, which actually existed by this point, and in 1934 she was renamed to HMS Pegasus, because they wanted to use the name Ark Royal for some other ship. I'm sure it won't come up again in this video. During early World War II, she was given AA guns and radar and was deployed as a part of convoy runs due to a severe shortage of carriers that could be spared for the role. Her career was relatively long and prosperous as far as seaplane carriers go, but it ended on a bit of a shit note. In 1946, she was sold to a private individual that tried to convert her into a freighter. However, that private individual went fucking bankrupt in 1948, and the ship was seized by the bank. Can you imagine being the guy that has to repo a fucking warship? After which, she was sold to a Dutch shipbreaking firm that also went bankrupt. Resold a final time, she would be scrapped in early 1951. HMS Empress I was a mid-sized cargo ship laid down in 1906 and completed in mid-late 1907 to ferry various things across the English Channel. She did this until the beginning of World War I, where she was press-ganged by the Royal Navy to serve as a cargo ship for the military, along with her half-sisters Engadine and Riviera. Through September of 1914, she was converted into a seaplane carrier, coming to displace 2,580 tons, make 18 knots, and carry 3 seaplanes after her refit, and later carrying 4 when she was upgraded in early 1915. She was assigned to the Harwich Force, and her first main engagement was a landmark one, the raid on Cuxhaven on Christmas Day of 1914. She went with Engadine and Riviera to bomb some Zeppelin hangars, and while they did jack shit in the way of damage and lost 4 of their 9 combined aircraft, it was a major proof of concept for the usage of these carriers in such raids, and also served as a nice morale boost after the absolute shit show that was the opening months of the war. She was sent to the south coast of Ireland in the first few months of 1915 to patrol the region and hunt for submarines, but this was pretty uneventful. She was refitted again in summer of 1915 with some extra hangar space and cranes, as well as several secondary batteries and AA guns, before also being sent to the Mediterranean in 1916 with 3 other seaplane carriers to support Entente troops in the Levant. She bombed Turkish positions in Palestine and Syria, taking a brief vacation to go bomb Bulgaria until January 1918, where she was reassigned to ASW work. In November of 1919, she was returned to her original owners and then sold, where she did little of relevance other than splitting a British schooner in half in 1926. She would eventually be scrapped in 1933. HMS Engadine was the half-sister kinda of Empress I, being initially built by the same company in the same shipyard for the same purpose, that of a cross-channel ferry ship, with her refit being very similar design-wise. Her construction as a cargo ship began in early 1911, then completed by the end of the year. She didn't do very much before she was seized by the Royal Navy in August of 1914, where the decision was made to convert her into a seaplane carrier at the same time as Empress. She came to displace 2,590 tons fully loaded, make a solid 21.5 knots, and carry 4 seaplanes. Her first major action was, of course, the Cuxhaven raid. Among Engadine's aircrew that participated in the raid was one Robert Erskine Childers, a fellow who will come to be known for smuggling guns to the Irish volunteers in the lead-up to the Easter Rising and Irish War of Independence, and, of course, for his role as a prominent leader in the IRA, eventually being executed by the Free State government. His son would even later become a president of Ireland. It's good to see that Engadine is a true Irish patriot. In early 1915, she underwent a near-identical refit to Empress, but the rest of her career could not have been more different. In mid-1915, she was transferred to Vice Admiral David Beatty's battlecruiser fleet. For those of you who enjoy name recognition as much as I do, you know where this is going. I'll bet you didn't know that the first major naval battle in history to feature aircraft carriers was the Battle of Jutland, did ya? On May 30th of 1916, she was attached to 3rd Light Cruiser Squadron, and she put to sail when the BCF sortied out from Rosyth after reports of the approaching of the German High Seas Fleet. She was placed in the vanguard due to the seaplanes needing calm waters to take off, and her aircraft were the first to spot the advanced scouting formation of Vice Admiral Hipper's task force. However, her attempts to relay the spotting information to Beatty's flagship were unsuccessful due to the distance and the chaos that was rapidly unfolding. During the runs to the south and north, she continued to trail the fleet and conduct spotting maneuvers until the severely damaged HMS Warrior pulled up next to her. She attempted to tow the ship, but she was gradually sinking, eventually eventually needing to be abandoned. Engadine was able to save nearly her entire crew of 700 officers and men with some difficulty. This would prove to be her final major engagement, as she stayed with the BCF until 1918 doing pilot training until she was sent to Malta in early 1918 to go bomb submarines. After the war ended, she was returned to her owners, where she fulfilled her original purpose before she was sold to a company in the Philippines in 1933, being renamed to Corregidor, where she continued her transportation duties. Tragically, in 1941, a week after the invasion of the Philippines had begun, she struck a mine in the Manila Bay after her crew failed to inform the military of her intended departure. The ship was overcrowded, carrying hundreds of refugees and university students from Manila, and sank with the loss of upwards of 1,200 lives. HMS Riviera was Engadine's actual sister, and she was functionally identical in construction with a few minor tweaks here and there. She was built by the same company and was started, launched, and completed all within the year of 1911 as well. She was kidnapped by the Royal Navy in August of 1914 and converted into a seaplane carrier. She displaced 2,590 tons, could make 20.5 knots, and could carry 4 seaplanes. She took part in the Cuxhaven raid before she received her upgrade package, and then spent most of the rest of the war sailing for the Dover Patrol and the Western Approaches Fleet, performing trials with various seaplane designs and running scouting and spotting missions over the coastal regions of the Western Front. Then, in May of 1918, she rejoined her sister in Malta to bomb submarines until the war ended. She was returned to her ferrying role in 1919 and didn't do too much of note for 20 years, save for that time when French customs authorities accused her company of using her to smuggle Camembert cheese to England, and she was nearly seized in the process. Them fucking French, I tell ya. She was sold to a Scottish company in 1932 and renamed to Laird's Isle, running passengers between Scotland and Ireland. In August of 39, in anticipation of another war with Germany, she was commissioned into the Royal Navy again, but since by this point flat-tops were in fashion, they didn't need a little old seaplane carrier, so instead she was refitted as an armed boarding vessel to enforce a blockade of Germany. She would also be fitted with minesweeping capabilities in early 1940 and did some odd jobs like participation in Operation Cycle, the evacuation of Allied troops from Le Havre. She was having consistent and severe technical problems by this point, and as such spent a lot of time dry docked before, in 1944, she was converted into an infantry assault ship. She was promptly stuffed with a bunch of angry Canadians, went down to France, and proceeded to storm Juno Beach like an absolute fucking Chad. She spent the remainder of the war ferrying troops and supplies to France before being returned to civilian service in 1946. She continued her operations in retirements until 1957 when she was sold for scrap. HMS Campania I is unique because she was converted from an ancient fossil of an ocean liner. She was initially built as the RMS Campania, a luxury passenger liner that made transatlantic runs. She was laid down in 1892, launched on September 8th, and finished by the end of that year. She was a very advanced liner for her time and had won awards for her speed. She was also one of the first ships in the world to be equipped with wireless transmission radio in 1905. By 1914, however, she was no longer top of the line, and was old enough that she was actually sold for scrap in October. The Royal Navy, of course, wasn't about to let a good hull go to waste, though, so they bought her out in November and converted her into a seaplane carrier. Due to her being a transatlantic ship, she was an order of magnitude larger than the other carriers they had built by this point, displacing 18,288 tons and carrying 12 aircraft, while still being able to make 19.5 knots. She was also given a rather large flight deck and was one of the earliest British ships capable of fully launching aircraft without dropping them into the water. She didn't do this very often, as it required the ship to be sailing into a strong wind, but it was a possibility, and it gave her a theoretical large leg up over the competition. These flight decks did not cover the full length of the ship, and as such could not recover aircraft, and they still needed to be landed in the water to be hoisted on board. Of course, as we know, flight decks would come to define carriers, making the British pioneers in the field to a degree that nobody would fully understand for another 25 years. She would be commissioned into the fleet on April 17th of 1915, after which she would do very little. She was assigned to the Grand Fleet, but the North Sea made launching her aircraft very difficult, so she mostly just did exercises and pilot training. She was given a refit at the end of 1915, where her flight deck was extended and given a slope that made launching aircraft significantly easier. After this refit, the Navy saw some potential and ordered the development of the world's first dedicated carrier aircraft, the Ferry Campania, which would be her main legacy as a ship. She missed the Battle of Jutland by a couple of hours due to some defective signaling equipment, and she did some anti-submarine patrols until it was determined that her ancient machinery made her unfit for active service, so she went back to pilot training. The British were building a dedicated flat top by this point, and she was very useful in training pilots for that exact purpose. Eventually, on November 5th of 1918, her watch officer made a bit of a boo-boo. She was sitting at anchor with several other ships when a squall came in and shoved her into the battleship Royal Oak and then into HMS Glorious, who will be a recurring character. Watch officer failed to order the second anchor dropped, and as such, these collisions proved fatal, sending her to the bottom of the Firth of Forth, thankfully with no loss of life. HMS Anne is interesting because she was actually German. She was built as the Anne Rickmers in 1911 as a freighter. In 1914, when the war started, she happened to be in Port Said, which happened to be British, so she was kinda just stolen. Like, fuck, what were the germs gonna do? Let's be real. Interestingly, because she was a heavy freighter, they actually didn't make any special conversions when they conscripted her to handle seaplanes, simply using the cranes the ship already had and clearing some space in her cargo holds. She displaced around 4,100 tons, could make 11 knots, and could carry 2 seaplanes. She ended up doing not a lot. She was assigned to the Mediterranean, doing recon in Syria and Palestine and bombing Smyrna in 1915. In March, she got torpedoed by a Turkish torpedo boat and ended up spending some time in Lemnos, where she got caught up in a storm and promptly ran aground. She ended up being stuck there until mid-May as a result, before going down to Alexandria for further repairs. She was fully commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Anne in August of 1915 and spent the remainder of the war performing spotting missions and transportation jobs in the Eastern Med. Save for some time, she spent providing air support to the Arab revolt down in Hejaz. In 1922, she was sold to a Greek shipping company and renamed Itachi. Then in 1939, sold to Romania and renamed Moldova, then sold to a Panamanian company in 1942, then to a different Panamanian company in 1949, and renamed Jagarat, before being renamed Moldova in 1955, before she was sold for scrap in Hong Kong in 1958. Okay, so I immediately need to break the ship numbering rule I mentioned earlier because HMS Raven II's full legal name was Raven II. Raven II was another German ship that was yoinked when World War I started. It began life as the SS Rabenfels, a cargo liner built in 1903, being seized in Port Said at the same time as Anne Rickmers. She displaced 4,750 tons, could make 11 knots, and could carry a maximum of 6 seaplanes if you really jam them in there. No major conversion work was done, and she was thrown right into the fray as a seaplane carrier. She was formally commissioned and renamed to Raven II in June of 1915, and her career was spent pretty much duct tape to her adoptive sister. The main interesting thing of note was that she was the victim of what is perhaps the first airstrike ever conducted on an aircraft carrier on September 1st of 1916, when she was attacked in port by a German bomber. Interestingly, most of the strikes that Raven II conducted were directed against infrastructure, hitting bridges and railroads with increasing success as the war dragged on. Between March and the end of May 1917, she went around the Indian Ocean searching for a German Q ship, but did not see success. And she rounded out the year by partaking in the Third Battle of Gaza. In early 1918, she was returned to regular shipping duties, serving as a coal ship until the end of the war. In 1923, she would end up in the hands of a Japanese shipping company who renamed her to Hayai Maru. She was sold to another Japanese company in 1935, with which she served as a cargo ship until January of 1945, where she would be sunk off the coast of southern Vietnam by American aircraft. This is the one with the odd name. It actually comes from the language of the Isle of Man, Manx Gaelic, and apparently means woman of my heart, which is genuinely so cool. I love it when less well-known cultures and languages get some representation. Ben Maithri was initially built as a packet steamer, carrying passengers and cargo between the Isle of Man and the other parts of the British Isles. She was laid down in late 1907, launched in March of 1908, and completed in August of that year. She performed her task without issue until 1915. Since by this point, the Royal Navy had gotten very invested in the idea of aircraft carrying warships, they were converting as many of these ships into carriers as possible just to maximize the experience gained. As such, on January 2nd, her conversion into a carrier began, and unlike the previous two, she did actually see significant modification. She was given a hangar, cranes, and a launch deck, and after her conversion, she would displace 3,950 tons, make an impressive 24.5 knots, and carry between 4 and 6 seaplanes. Her conversion was complete by the end of April, and she sortied for her first mission on May 3rd to go bomb a small German village, which had to be abandoned 3 separate times due to fog, and on one occasion a destroyer plowed into her just as a nice fuck you to the future of naval warfare. After this shit show, she was sent to the Aegean, being based on the island of Lesbos, which means Ben Maithri is canonically a lesbian. In August 1915, her torpedo bombers flew a series of missions where they actually notched a couple of hits, and she saved a bunch of Australians whose transport had been torpedoed on September 2nd. After the Gallipoli campaign ended, she was made flagship of the assembled squadron of seaplane carriers in the region. She did some scouting over Libya against the Senussi Order before being rammed by another ship and being dry docked in Suez until late April. She continued recon missions in the Eastern Med until December of 1916, where she was sent to the island of Castellarizo off the Turkish coast to do some scouting there. While she was at anchor on January 11th of 1917, Ottoman heavy artillery on the mainland opened fire, striking her several times and setting her on fire. She was abandoned and sank a few hours later, and remarkably, every sailor, including a cat and dog that were on board, would survive. She was refloated in August of 1920 and sold for scrap in 1923. She holds the distinction of being the first aircraft carrier in history to be sunk by hostile action, and the only carrier of any side to be sunk during World War I. HMS Windex was built as the SS Viking, a passenger steamer that once again made trips to the Isle of Man. She was built between 1904 and 1905 and did her job until 1915 when she was press ganged by the Royal Navy into becoming a seaplane carrier. Her conversion was quite similar to Ben Mechri, being given a flight deck and a hangar, coming to displace 2,997 tons, make 23 knots, and carry 7 aircraft. Her conversion was finished in November of 1915, and she immediately continued the British string of innovations and records by being the first naval vessel to successfully launch a land-based wheeled aircraft, pretty much directly leading to the existence of HMS Argus, and cementing this random boat as one of the most important warships to ever exist. Anyways, the Windex didn't actually do all that much. It operated in the North Sea for most of the war, and since she didn't take part in the Battle of Jutland, she mostly just mulled around and notably failed multiple raids due to severe technical issues with her aircraft. Of note is one specific attempted raid with the help of Engadine, where of the 11 planes between them, 10 of them had problems and didn't even make it away from the strike group. Yep, she was arguably the least successful of the seaplane carriers and is low-key carried by her major accomplishment right at the start of her service life. In 1918, she was sent to Malta and then to the Eastern Mediterranean doing escort and scout missions until the end of the war, and in 1919 she was sold back into civilian service. When World War II came around, she was press-ganged again, but this time as a troop ship, and notably became the second former seaplane carrier of the Royal Navy to partake in D-Day. It's not a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. After the war ended, she was sent back into civilian service and would eventually be scrapped in 1954. HMS Manxman was another passenger liner that made trips to the Isle of Man. I'm starting to notice a theme. She was built in 1904, eventually being requisitioned by the Navy in 1915. She wouldn't be commissioned until April of 1916, however, because her conversion took a while and she was still being used as a transport ship for a little bit. Her conversion was once again similar to Ben Mechri and the Windex, coming to displace 2,581 tons, barely make 22 knots, and carry an impressive 8 aircraft. She was initially assigned to the Grand Fleet for a little over a year, which means she did jack diddly shit fucking all, because after Jutland, the German Navy hid for the rest of the war. In October of 1917, she was actually kicked out of the Grand Fleet because she was a bit slower than average, and as such was seen as a liability by the very technologically conservative David Beatty. Her one big thing was being the first ship to successfully launch the Sopwith Pup from her deck, which was a rather interesting aircraft that was accidentally perfect for carrier operations due to the fact that it was light as fuck, and it went on to be a very useful training aircraft during the interwar period. She was sent to the Eastern Mediterranean for the last year of the war, where she continued to do not a lot until 1919 when she was sold back into civilian service. In the Second World War, she was recommissioned as a troop ship and renamed to Caduceus, making over a dozen runs across the Channel performing evacuation missions during the fall of France, and at one point she was nearly captured by Erwin Rommel in Cherbourg. She spent some time as a radar ship until she was renamed back to Manxman and finished out the war ferrying troops again. She continued to perform this duty until her scrapping in 1949. HMS Nirana I was initially a passenger steamer that was built for an Australian company beginning in mid-1914, but the arrival of the war to end all wars put a kibosh on those plans because fuck passenger liners, we need warships, goddammit. Her construction was halted, and the only reason she was finished was to clear her slipway for more important stuff. She was launched in June of 1915 and proceeded to sit in port doing nothing for the next year and a half until the Royal Navy brought her out in February of 1917. By this point, seaplane tender conversions had become rather standardized, so her modifications were similar to the other ships converted around this time. She came to displace 3,119 tons, make 20 knots, and carry a maximum of 8 aircraft. She was commissioned in August 1917 and did basically nothing other than pilot training and aircraft transportation until the following year, when she got to take part in the British intervention in the Russian Civil War. Dread it, run from it, the Russian Civil War content arrives all the same. I am never going to escape this fuck-ass country. Her main contribution was leading the assault on Arkhangelsk in August August of 1918. She was kept in service until October of 1919, carrying out recon and transportation missions until she was returned for decommissioning. She was sent down to Australia in 1921 and served as a transport ship between the mainland and Tasmania, and during World War II, she was the only commercial liner to not be brought back into military service, although she was given guns. She would eventually run aground in a storm in 1951 and was scrapped 3 years later. HMS Pegasus is a lot like Nirana in that she didn't do a whole lot since she showed up so late. She was laid down in early 1914 as a passenger liner and a cargo ship, but the start of World War I caused work to be suspended until 1917, when the Royal Navy bought her out because why let a good hull go to waste? The decision was, of course, made to turn her into a seaplane carrier. She was launched in June of that year and commissioned into the fleet in August, coming to displace 3,353 tons, make 20 knots, and carry 9 aircraft. She continued the trend of having a flight deck, which by this point were becoming more and more refined to the point that they were becoming the primary aircraft deployment method. I wonder if this will be a trend. After her commissioning, she did nothing in the North Sea for a year before once again being sent into the Russian civil kerfuffle. She helped out with the campaign in northern Russia in 1919, and later was sent to support the armed forces of South Russia in the Black Sea, helping out with the evacuation from Novorossiysk in March of 1920. She actually remained in British military service, since she had essentially been built ground up as a carrier and couldn't really be reconverted, but her flight deck was removed and she was used as a dedicated seaplane tender. She would eventually be scrapped in September of 1931. Okay, so HMS Vindictive is an odd little duck. She was technically converted after HMS Furious, and was the first ship that they tested a semi-full deck conversion out on, with Furious having a flight deck on both ends of the ship, one for taking off and one for landing. However, Furious was later overhauled and given a full deck conversion in the 1920s, so she isn't a seaplane carrier and gets lumped in with the fleet carriers. Vindictive had this semi-full deck design, unlike HMS Argus, which was commissioned a month before. Vindictive never received a full deck conversion, so she is technically a seaplane carrier, despite having a similar design to Furious and being finished after Argus. I fucking love ship classifications, it's so much fun. Anyways, Vindictive was the 5th ship of the Hawkins class of heavy cruisers, laid down as HMS Cavendish in June of 1916. Her construction stalled heavily as the need for heavy cruisers had diminished as the war progressed, and in April of 1917 the decision was made to convert her into an aircraft carrier. She was given flight decks and a hangar and came to displace 12,599 tons fully loaded, make 30 knots, and carry 6 aircraft. Now, carriers in this configuration, proven by Furious first but reinforced with Vindictive, kinda just didn't work, since the compromises required meant that actually landing aircraft on the deck was nearly impossible due to turbulence, but they finished her this way anyway just to make sure. She was launched in January of 1918, renamed to Vindictive in June, and commissioned in October of that year, just in time to miss everything of note. As such, her operations were primarily against the Bolsheviks in Russia, as she was dispatched to the Baltic Sea to support operations there. She arrived to the theater in July of 1919, only to immediately run aground near Tallinn, and saved 8 days later by a windstorm that raised the water level just enough to wrench her free. She would later carry out bombing missions on Bolshevik naval targets until the collapse of the White Offensive on Petrograd, and in December of 1919 she was sent back to the UK. Unlike Furious, she was not given a full deck overhaul, and instead was reconverted into a cruiser in 1923. She spent time in and out of reserve until 1936 when she was converted into a training ship, then in 1939 was turned into a naval repair ship, causing more changes to her structure and effectively making her a cruiser of Theseus. She also served as a troop ship, making her the 3rd ship on this list to participate in the D-Day landings in some form, and at the time of writing I am genuinely fucking curious to see how high this number will go. After World War II ended, she was sold for scrap in 1946. Now, there is one more, the Albatross, but she is technically Australian, and as such, we're not going to talk about her in this video. But that concludes just the seaplane carriers. Jesus fucking Christ, we still have so much to get through. Towards the end of World War I, the British caught on to the fact that carriers could be 1,000 times more efficient if they could also land the aircraft on the decks that they were already launching them from. After dicking around with these weird 2-deck configurations that didn't work, they elected to adopt the KISS principle and simply make the entire top of the ship the flight deck. That way, there was enough running space to both launch and recover aircraft without the need for cranes or flotation devices or very specific wind and speed combinations. As it turned out, they were the first ones to this concept, and as such, hold the title of world's first true flat top in the form of HMS Argus, which we will discuss in a moment. That said, they weren't the first to a keel-up carrier, that title going to the IJN's Hosho by almost 2 full years. Regardless, the Royal Navy continued to be a major naval innovator, as literally every other flat top can directly trace its design decisions to these early carriers. HMS Furious was the third ship of the Courageous class of battlecruisers, but she gets to be the first because she was converted into a carrier first if we get technical. The entire class was a product of one Admiral John Fisher, who was as big of a naval innovator as he was completely insane. His plan to win World War I involved bypassing the trenches of the West by simply going around them, straight through the fucking Baltic Sea by smashing 600 ships through Denmark to go naval invade Pomerania. Look, I can respect the hustle, but brother. Anyways, he was able to slide a design for a very light battlecruiser through to the shipyards that was designed to operate in the Baltic Sea. They had very limited armor, but would have carried 2 gigantic single-turreted cannons. Yamato wasn't even a dream yet, and the Brits were already toying with strapping 18 inches of fuck you to a warship. Only 3 of these guns were ever built, after testing revealed that the Courageous class were literally not heavy enough to fire them in succession without cracking under the sheer blowback. As such, only Furious ever received the very funny guns, and after this issue was realized, the decision was made to repurpose her into a carrier. Furious was laid down in June of 1915 and was almost immediately altered to only have 1 gun instead of 2, with space made for a hangar. The second gun would be replaced in 1917. She was launched in August of 1916 and formally commissioned in June of 1917. By the time she was finished, she had been given the standard Seaplane Carrier flight deck on the forward of the ship, and in August of 1917 she became the first warship to have an aircraft land on her while moving, adding yet another record to the list the Royal Navy was accumulating. In November of 1917, she was dry docked again for a bit of an experiment. 2 flight decks. They put an extra one on the aft of the ship to land aircraft and theoretically remove the need for cranes and shit to recover aircraft. This configuration had problems, primarily because there was not enough runway on the landing deck to actually consistently land, and her odd superstructure configuration disrupting airflows meant that the turbulence inflicted on the aircraft attempting to land could legitimately rip some of them apart. Anyways, Furious spent the rest of the war mostly just doing nothing, and she was benched soon after it ended. In June of 1921, the decision was taken to convert her into a full-deck carrier, which took 4 entire years. With her final conversion, she came to displace 26,900 tons, make 30 knots, and carry 36 aircraft. Interestingly, she actually kept her original flight deck, with the new one simply built on top of it, which meant that she could launch some smaller aircraft for scouting or combat air patrol while she was cycling aircraft on the top deck. This made her impressively modern. When the Second War to End All Wars began, she was sent to reinforce the home fleet at full combat readiness because her sister Courageous had immediately died. Actually, Furious would be the only ship of the Courageous trio to survive the war. She partook in the Norway campaign, her participation in which was hindered by consistently shit weather, as well as several runs across the Atlantic to go collect some Canadians and drop off the British gold reserves in Canada for safekeeping. And on her return trip, she made extra sure to clear space for as much sugar as she could carry, which single-handedly won the war, by the way. She did these runs completely unescorted, by the way, which takes balls of fucking tungsten. Or, I guess, oak, you could say. In July of 1941, she took a quick jaunt with Victorious to go sneak attack the Germans in northern Finland, and after this she spent much of the rest of the war partaking in convoy escorts like Operation Pedestal, and transporting literally hundreds of desperately needed aircraft to North African and Mediterranean bases. Except for that one time where her planes also destroyed 74 aircraft during Operation Torch, which is a fucking crazy kill ratio. She was returned to the home fleet in February of 1943, where she took another jaunt to Norway to attack the Tirpitz about a dozen times before she was placed in reserve in September of 1944, because by this point she was old and frail. She sat around for a few years, briefly being used as a target ship, before being unceremoniously scrapped in 1948. So, having all of these cool seaplane carriers, the Admiralty put their thinking caps on, until someone had the biggest think of them all. Continuous flight deck. Long enough to comfortably launch wheeled aircraft, and long enough to land them without crashing into the ocean. Such a design had actually been proposed as early as 1912, but it had initially not been accepted because more battleships equals more gooder. But now that it was clear that the carriers they had would not be the future, they pulled it off the shelf and got to work. So, they found a half-finished Italian cargo ship, the Conte Rosso, and said, "Our hours now, and decided to finish it as the world's first full-deck aircraft carrier. The name of the new Trailblazer was to be Argus, the name of Hera's watchman, the all-seeing hundred-eyed giant of Greek myth. It's a fitting name for a carrier, really. Her initial design called for a really weird two-tower setup, but that was found to cause crazy turbulence based on the testing of Furious, so she was completed as a flush deck instead. Her conversion began in September of 1916, she was launched in December of 1917, and commissioned in September of 1918. She came to displace 14,680 tons, make a reasonable 20 knots, and carry between 15 and 18 aircraft. Her construction was hampered by labor shortages. She initially didn't have arresting gear because those didn't exist yet, and she was very top-heavy, even with a bunch of fucking concrete being dumped in the bottom of her hull, but her design was pretty much exactly how you build a carrier. It's genuinely kind of impressive how correct the British got it on the very first fucking try. They rule the waves for a reason. Also, apparently one of her nicknames was the Diddy Box, which I will not be calling her, I will tell you that much. Anyways, despite her nature as one of history's biggest naval innovations, she didn't really do a whole lot because the Great War ended almost immediately. She essentially did exercises, experimentation, and the critical task of pilot training for her entire existence, save for 1922 when she went to the Dardanelles for the Channel Crisis, and 1927 to 28 where she bombed Chinese pirates, which is really fun. She would be overhauled 3 times during the interwar period, which took the form of various miscellaneous upgrades like proper arresting gear. She would be repressed into service during World War II, where, due to her age and outdated design, she primarily served as an aircraft transport and escort ship, a role in which she made several gauntlet runs to Malta and Gibraltar. Her instances of actual combat were limited. She fought with Admiral Hipper in December of 1940, where she took no damage and didn't actually launch any planes before Hipper was driven off. November 1941, when she was a part of the convoy where Ark Royal II got nuked by a submarine and she needed to step up as the only remaining carrier. And June 1942, where her aircraft shot down a couple of Italian bombers. Her final operation was the assault on Algiers during Operation Torch, during which she was hit with a bomb and was forced to return to the UK, while almost being torpedoed by a submarine. She was repaired and refitted in 1943 and declared unfit for further combat service, so she was relegated to pilot training. The final aircraft to launch from the ship was fittingly a ferry Swordfish on the 27th of September of 1944. The pioneering warship would tragically not be turned into a museum, instead being unceremoniously scrapped in 1946. That said, her bell is preserved in Bristol Cathedral. HMS Hermes II continues the trend of total Anglo domination in the naval arms race by being the first ship in the world to be designed from the keel up as an aircraft carrier. Of course, as I said earlier, there was an asterisk here. She was not the first keel up carrier completed because Japan hit a fucking miracle half-court by commissioning the Hosho over a year before Hermes, despite construction on Hosho being started nearly 3 full years afterwards. Come on, England, get your heads in the fucking game. Anyways, Hermes was the first purpose-built British carrier. Her initial design from 1917 was really stupid and was supposed to have a whole-ass slipway for launching seaplanes, but everyone realized this was dumb after construction began, so she was just finished as a regular full-deck carrier. Her construction was plagued with bullshit as well, which is why she took so long to be completed and commissioned. She was laid down in January of 1918 and launched in September of 1919, after which she sat around while Argus and Eagle underwent sea trials, which led to her getting a single island superstructure instead of the double design they were toying with. The shipyard that was building her also closed, so she had to suffer in bureaucratic hell while moving to a new yard. Her design was revised again in 1921, requiring extensive changes to her deck to accommodate new elevators and arresting gear, and she was finally completed in the closing months of 1923 and commissioned in February 1924. She came to displace 13,900 tons, make 25 knots, and carry 20 aircraft. Her career was similar to many of these early carriers. For much of the 1920s, she bounced between sailing around the world, undertaking pilot training and exercises, and revolving in and out of shipyards for refits and the occasional repair. Seriously, she undergoes like half a dozen minor refits in the 1920s to fix little problems that kept popping up. Her first offensive action was helping out Argus with bombing those pirates I mentioned while she was in China, and she spent a lot of time in East Asia visiting all sorts of places, including Japan. This included saving a couple of submariners who survived an accident, helping the Chinese conduct surveys of flooding damage on the Yangtze, during which Charles Lindbergh, of all people, launched from the ship as an international aid volunteer, helped rescue some stranded Japanese merchantmen who had run aground, and in 1935 recapturing a merchant ship that had been taken over by pirates and rescuing the hostages aboard. She was honestly just running down the side quest list, and it was a very Chinese time of her life, what can I say. When World War II broke out, she was given a quick refit to bring her up to combat readiness, and she spent most of 1939 and 1940, performing anti-submarine sweeps and patrolling the Atlantic for German surface raiders. She was docked in Dakar in Senegal for this, which caused issues when Senegal declared for Vichy France at the end of 1940, so she turned around and torpedoed the Richelieu and then fucked off to Sierra Leone. She mostly continued her patrolling around Africa until Japan did the funny and she was sent to Ceylon to shore up the Indian Ocean fleet. On April 9th of 1942, she bailed from port with HMAS Vampire after news of incoming Japanese air raids that were a part of the infamous Indian Ocean raid, but they would be spotted by Japanese scout planes soon after. The Japanese carriers launched 85 dive bombers at the pair, which decimated the two ships with little difficulty. Hermes was struck with over 40 bombs and sank in less than 20 minutes. She went down with 307 men, including her captain. HMS Eagle I started her life as, of all things, a Chilean super dreadnought ordered as a part of the South American arms race in 1912. Now, the British were happy to supply warships to literally all sides of this arms race because it made them a piss pot of money, so this super dreadnought was laid down in the UK in February of 1913. The hull of the ship was mostly finished, sans armor, by the time World War I broke out and work was suspended. She proceeded to sit on the slipway until 1918, when the British Admiralty decided to convert her into a carrier and bought the ship out from the Chileans. The design went through a couple of changes before settling on a pretty standard flat-top design with a single island instead of the again planned two-island thing. However, Admiral David Beatty, being a bit stupid, insisted that the ship carry 12 6-inch guns, have its entire AA battery stripped, and carry 18 fucking torpedo tubes. Naturally, the shipyard took the liberty of not putting torpedoes on the carrier, and later trials saw the armament scaled back in favor of actual AA stuff. She was finally launched in June of 1918, after which she underwent multiple years of fitting out, trials, and refitting out that was slowed by a strike wave and a temporary cancellation because Chile asked to have the ship back. But the Admiralty wanted to carry her with a single island for testing, since by this point no other carrier did, and they didn't know that single islands didn't actually cause a lot of turbulence, so Chile got told to go away, and they brute force finished the carrier. Construction resumed in 1921 after some revisions based on testing were made. She was finished in late 1923 and finally commissioned in February of 1924, literally 2 days after Hermes. She came to displace 22,200 tons, make 24 knots, and carry between 25 and 30 aircraft. Her pre-World War II career was pretty uneventful, as per usual. The most interesting thing that occurred was she rescued the brother of future Spanish dictator Francisco Franco after his plane crashed in the North Atlantic in June of 1929. She also spent 1934 in the Far East bombing pirates and dying of heat stroke and requiring more refits. When World War II kicked off, she had just finished a refit in Singapore and was sent to go patrol the Indian Ocean for German surface raiders. In March of 1940, a freak accident occurred where a bomb exploded in the magazine, killing 14 people and being immediately followed by the saltwater fire control system, destroying her entire air arm, so that was fun. After she was fixed up, she went to the Mediterranean to go fight the Italians. In July, her aircraft launched a very successful raid on Tobruk Harbor where she sank a destroyer, and then raided Sicily a few days later where she sank another. Her planes also shot down several bombers and partook in more raids over several months in 1940. In September, she joined up with Illustrious and attacked some Italian air bases, taking heavy casualties in the process. She spent much of 1941 escorting convoys and patrolling various places for German ships, and whenever she was in port, her aircraft were usually disembarked to go blow shit up or spot for the people who were blowing shit up. From October to January 1942, she was in Britain being refitted, after which she was sent down to Gibraltar to support the convoy runs to Malta. She made nearly a dozen of these convoy runs, transporting over 100 aircraft to the island personally. She took zero damage for several months until she didn't. Operation Pedestal would prove to be her last run. On the afternoon of August 11th, 1942, a German submarine managed to breach the screens and smashed 4 torpedoes into Eagle. She sank in less than 4 minutes, but she was surrounded by Allied ships that were able to rescue the majority of her crew, going down with 131 men. Okay, so recall the Furious? Well, Courageous was the first and lead ship of that class of battlecruisers. All the wacky bullshit I mentioned with the development of Furious applies completely here. Unlike Furious, however, she was actually completed as a battlecruiser initially. She was laid down in March of 1915, launched in February of 1916, and completed and commissioned by the end of the year. Less than 3 weeks after her completion, she was absolutely beat to shit by a rough wave during her sea trials, and was nearly written off right then and there, as it revealed some problems with the rigidity of her construction and led to her needing extensive repairs. After her commissioning, she was also just strapped with a bunch of random bullshit, which included torpedo tubes and mine-laying equipment. Her only major engagement in her battlecruiser configuration was the Second Battle of Heligoland Bight in November 1917, where she shot at some cruisers and minesweepers and didn't really hit anything. In 1918, she was given aircraft launching decks on her turrets for making use of scout planes, but didn't do a whole lot for the rest of the war. Afterwards, the British had a ton of ships that were bound for the scrapyard, especially after the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 limited capital ship tonnage. However, there was a neat little asterisk on there that said that you can keep some of these existing ships if you convert them into aircraft carriers. Furious had already seen some solid success with her conversion, and the tonnages of the other two ships in the class meant that they could do all three. Furthermore, they could make improvements on Furious's design with the new experience they had. As such, in June of 1924, the conversion work on Courageous began. It was completed in February 1928, and she was recommissioned as a full-deck carrier, coming to displace 27,470 tons fully loaded, make 30 knots, and carry 48 aircraft. She was initially assigned to the Mediterranean for a couple of years, where the main thing of note she did was participate in the suppression effort during the 1929 Palestine riots. She was then moved to the home fleet for basically all of the 1930s, where she underwent several refits which saw her AA armament strengthened and her deck augmented with catapults. By the end of the decade, she was primarily serving as a training carrier, but was reactivated with the outbreak of World War II. Courageous would prove to be perhaps the least lucky warship on this entire list. Her first operation was to go hunt submarines in the western approaches in early September. This was early in the war, and nobody quite knew how to properly use carriers yet, so she only had 4 destroyers as an escort, and combat air patrol was a rather novel concept. The evening of September 17th, 1939, while 2 of her destroyers had fucked off to go help out a merchant ship, the German submarine U-29 stumbled across the carrier. Shadowing her for 2 hours, the sub found an opportunity and slammed 2 torpedoes with near-perfect accuracy. She went down in 20 minutes with 519 men. She was the first British warship to be sunk by the Germans in the entire war, and prompted radical alterations to British carrier policy. Finally, the second ship of the Courageous class, HMS Glorious, was also selected to be converted into a carrier. Her conversion was finished last, just roll with it. She was laid down on the 1st of May, 1915 at the Harland and Wolff shipyards, was launched in April the following year, and commissioned in January of 1917. As with Courageous, she was fully completed as a battlecruiser and served in that role until the end of the First World War. However, she proved to be a rather unlucky ship. During her first major action at Heligoland Bight, a shell prematurely detonated in her forward turret's gun barrel. Nobody died, and it was fixed pretty quickly, but after the shit show at Jutland with exploding magazines, it spooked everyone a fair bit. In 1918, she was given flying off decks on her turrets for launching scout planes, but they didn't have the intention of giving her a full conversion just yet. Continuing the unluckiness, if you recall, on November 5th, she was anchored with Campania and Royal Oak when a squall hit and smashed the Seaplane Carrier into her. After the war ended, the Admiralty decided to abuse the clause in the Washington Naval Treaties to keep her around. Her conversion began in 1924, and much like Courageous, was an improvement over Furious in most ways, most notably being given an island and a proper funnel, which greatly improved her operational efficiency. Interestingly, the 15-inch guns that were used on HMS Glorious were put in the shed and would eventually be reused for HMS Vanguard, which would be the world's last battleship. Shut the fuck up! Anyways, her conversion took until 1930 because epic budget issues, and upon her completion she displaced 27,859 tons fully loaded, could make a solid 30 knots, and could carry 48 aircraft. She was recommissioned into the Mediterranean fleet, where she almost immediately rammed a French passenger liner in heavy fog on April 1st of 1931. Ha! Heavy fog, yeah, fucking right. Saw the tricolor and saw blood. Old habits die hard, I suppose. She was refitted in 1934 with arresting wires and a longer flight deck to accommodate heavier aircraft. When World War II began, she spent some time in the Indian Ocean before being assigned to the dreaded Norwegian theater in 1940. Norway is where ships go to die, so it should be no surprise that this is where Glorious dies. She was conjoined at the hip with Ark Royal II and undertook a dozen or so attacks on various German positions in central Norway, as well as being attacked herself several times. Then, in early June, she was sent to cover the Allied evacuation from Narvik. In the early morning of the 8th, the captain was given permission to return to Scapa Flow independently of a strong escort for reasons that remain disputed to this day. The official one was that the captain wanted to rush to court-martial a guy for refusing orders, or something like that. In the meantime, the germs were at it again. On June 4th of 1941, German Admiral Wilhelm Marschall sortied out from port with the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, and the destroyers Z7, Z10, Z-10, Z-15, and Z-20. He was told by Erich Raeder to go attack the Allied-controlled naval base at Harstadt to support the ground offensive on Narvik. But after some recon, he realized that the Allied troops were actually in the process of evacuating Norway. He disregarded those orders, turned off his body cam, and went to go hunt the evacuation ships. After sinking a few random ships of no significance and failing to find the convoy, Hipper and the destroyers were detached to go attack Trondheim, while Marshall elected to go for all-out personal glory after receiving reports of British carriers in the region. The weather was perfectly clear. So clear that on the evening of June 8th, the lookout for the Scharnhorst spotted a cloud that was attributed to Glorious and her two escorts, Acasta and Ardent. Now, Glorious's captain made a bunch of fuck-ups, like not launching a combat air patrol, sailing under low power, and not actually having the lookout positions manned. Without waiting for Marshall's approval, Scharnhorst fucking booked it in their direction, closing the distance with the slow carrier. By the time the British spotted the German ship, Scharnhorst was already within 15 kilometers of the trailing destroyers, and within 24 of Glorious. Now, I must unfortunately give credit to the German Navy here, because Scharnhorst put on a display of genuinely excellent naval gunnery skill, and proved that she is literally just the Kriegsmarine at 99% power. She tilted back and went, "Now watch this drive," and proceeded to smash a shell straight through Glorious's deck at 24 fucking kilometers, following it up with another straight into the ship's bridge, killing basically the whole command staff. After a third hit into the engine room, Glorious went down just after 6 p.m. Acasta and Ardent would also both be sunk, but not before Acasta smashed a torpedo into Scharnhorst and nearly sank her right then and there, but the German ship would limp on. Due to this damage and fears of potential British counterattack, the German ships did not pick up survivors. The Royal Navy was also caught unaware and did not know the group had sunk due to a spectacular failure of communication with the nearby HMS Devonshire. As such, Glorious sank with 1,207 of her crew, of which 900 died in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic after abandoning ship. Only 38 sailors would be picked up by passing merchant ships. Acasta and Ardent only had singular crew members survive, bringing the total to 40 survivors against 1,519 casualties. It was one of the Royal Navy's worst disasters of the war, simply due to the nature of her sinking and the massive casualties that occurred because of it. Escort carriers. After the sinking of Courageous, it was determined that sending fleet carriers to go hunt submarines was a bad idea. However, further action during the Battle of the Atlantic made it abundantly clear that aircraft were insanely valuable when dealing with subs, being able to aerially drop depth charges and providing a spotting angle that regular guys on ships simply couldn't. Due to heavy carrier losses early in the war, fleet carriers could simply not be spared for this role, especially after Japan entered the war. So the escort carrier was born. They were smaller, slower, lighter, and carried fewer planes than a fleet carrier, but they were cheap as fuck and easy to build, and they could utilize the superior naval industry of the Allied powers to simply overwhelm the enemy through sheer numbers of carriers in the water. As the war stabilized, escort carriers also served in attack roles, usually being attached to invasion fleets to provide extra air support for ground forces, and as transport ships carrying extra aircraft for regular battlefields. The Royal Navy had wanted to develop escort carriers since the early 1930s, going off of the experience of World War I, but a lack of money and a lack of planes meant that they were shelved until World War II, when the absolute disaster of 1939 and 1940 made it abundantly clear that escort carriers would be mandatory to keep the Atlantic run safe. The first escort carrier the British had was HMS Audacity, which is a kick-ass name, and I am so sad she dies horribly. Audacity was probably named as such due to the sheer audacity of her construction. Remember those German cargo ships in World War I that the Brits turned into seaplane carriers? Well, what if we did that again? She started her life as the Hanover, a German merchant ship that was launched in March of 1939 that transported bananas, of all things, from the West Indies. When the war broke out, she hid in Curaçao until May 1940, when she attempted to make a mad dash back to Germany, but she would be captured on the way over near Puerto Rico. She was renamed to Sinbad, and her cargo was looted and sold off, then was sent across the Atlantic before being renamed to Empire Audacity as a cargo ship. Admiralty determined that they were going to starve if they couldn't get the fucking U-boots under control, so they ordered a bunch of merchants converted to carriers. As such, in January 1941, she arrived at the Blythe shipyard to be converted. Her conversion would be finished in June, after which she was quickly commissioned into the Navy as an escort carrier. She came to displace 11,177 tons, make 15 knots, and carry 14 aircraft. Due to her crazy rapid conversion, she did not have a hangar, and was also flush-decked, meaning aircraft were simply carried on the flight deck. She was also finally renamed to HMS Audacity on July 31st. Audacity's purpose was to support convoys to Gibraltar, and as such, she was primarily concerned with fending off German bombers. On her first convoy run in September, her aircraft shot one down, and on her third run in late October, they shot down 4, which is pretty solid. Her fourth run came in mid-December, where she shot down 2 more bombers and had a hand in revealing the location of a U-boot, which was promptly scuttled. This pissed the Germans off, and their sub-crews were given orders to sink the carrier as a priority. On the night of the 21st of December, one of the merchant ships shot up a flare at a stupid time and revealed Audacity's position. She was promptly hit with 3 torpedoes and sank in a little over an hour, going down with 73 crewmen. Interestingly, one of the survivors was Eric Winkle Brown, perhaps the most prolific pilot in history, having flown 487 different types of aircraft, holding the world record for most carrier takeoffs and landings with nearly 4,700 combined, and was also the first pilot to land a jet on an aircraft carrier. He himself shot down one of the bombers during his time on Audacity. Overall, unfortunate start for the escort carrier program, but she had already proven the concept through her success against the bombers, so a bazillion more would be ordered over the next few years. HMS Archer has a really wacky history. She was initially built as the cargo ship Mormaclon by the United States, laid down in August 1939 and completed by April 1940. Her service was uneventful since the United States was neutral until the signing of the Lend-Lease Act in March. Under this act, a huge number of American-built escort carriers would find their way into the hands of the British, augmenting their desperately overstretched navy. Mormaclon would be requisitioned and sent down to Newport News and turned into HMS Archer, with her conversion being finished by November of 1941, being commissioned into the Royal Navy immediately. She was the sister of the USS Long Island, and as such, the designs were functionally identical. That said, her conversion was super cheap and kinda shoddy. She had a wooden flight deck, a small hangar with a single lift, and really shitty diesel engines that made her puff Kuznetsov-level smoke. She came to displace 16,000 tons fully loaded, could make 16.5 knots, and carry 15 aircraft. She had a bad time. Before her trials were even completed, her aircraft accelerator broke and she lost a Wildcat to the Atlantic Ocean, which took a week to fix. Then, in January 1942, before she had even left North America, her compass broke and then her engine shit the bed, requiring more repairs. She finally left on January 13th, and then was forced to return after her compass broke again and her steering systems crapped out as well. This only took a couple of hours to fix, so she again left on the same day, only to immediately ram a cargo ship and sink the damn thing, thankfully with no casualties. She was towed to Charleston on January 21st and spent 6 more weeks being fixed up. Holy shit, we may have found Kuznetsov's ancestor. Finally, in mid-March, she crossed the Atlantic, transporting some aircraft to Illustrious and doing a few anti-submarine patrols. However, her engine shit the bed again, and she was sent up to Bermuda in July to spend nearly 4 months docked up. Finally, in November, she actually started running convoys, which she did relatively without issue. She received a quick refit in the UK in February 1943, then made several convoy runs, including one in May where one of her aircraft sank a U-boot with rockets, the first submarine sunk with such a weapon. Her engine broke again in mid-July, after which she was dry docked again, where it was determined that her engine and machinery were so fucked and held together with duct tape and WD-40 that the ship couldn't serve further without costly rebuilding. As such, she was decommissioned in November 1943 and was relegated to random tasks like storing ammunition and ferrying aircraft. She would be fully repaired in March of 1945 and was renamed to Empire Login, serving as a ferry until the end of the war. She was returned to the United States, then sold off to a Swedish businessman and converted into a passenger liner in 1948. She was then bought out by a Greek line, and then in 1958 was converted back into a cargo ship and resold to a Taiwanese company. On November 7th of 1961, she was in the port of Houston, Texas, when she had one last stroke of bad luck, ramming a Norwegian tanker, catching fire, and wrecking. 12 sailors were killed, the ship was abandoned by the owners, and was sold for scrap in January 1962. HMS Avenger was laid down as the passenger liner Rio Hudson in Pennsylvania in November of 1939, being launched almost exactly a year later. She would never undertake her civilian role, as once Lend-Lease was signed, she was one of the merchant ships called up for conversion into an escort carrier. Her conversion took place at the Bethlehem Yards in Staten Island, being transferred to the Royal Navy in July of 1941, and fully completed and commissioned as the HMS Avenger in March of 1942. Her design was based on the Long Island, but with some tweaks, and as such, she was very similar to Archer, although with somewhat fewer mechanical issues. She came to displace 9,144 tons fully loaded, could make 16.5 knots, and could carry 15 aircraft. Her trials in April were interrupted by engine failure, and after they were repaired, she began her convoy escort duties by making the run across the Atlantic. When she arrived in the UK, there was a chronic shortage of naval fighters, so there was a crash conversion of a few Hawker Hurricanes to be carrier capable. The testing for these Hurricanes was, of course, carried out by Eric Winkle Brown, and it was found that they could, in fact, land on escort carriers. This guy will get around, I can tell you that fucking much. Her first major role came with Convoy PQ-18, which was as much a convoy as it was a show of force, with over 40 escorts and Avenger to guard 40 merchant ships. The objective was Arkhangelsk, and the Germans threw everything in the kitchen sink at the convoy trying to wipe it out. They threw hundreds of bombers and a dozen U-boats at it, and while they did sink 13 of the cargo ships, they suffered irreplaceable bomber losses, thanks to Avenger having access to radio interception equipment that enabled her to know when the bombers were coming and scramble her air arm, and her Sea Hurricanes could claim over a dozen aircraft shot down. Her return journey as part of QP-14 was less eventful, with only one ship sunk before she detached from the convoy. Avenger's experience did lead to a report from her captain, who rightly believed that a single escort carrier is simply not enough, and most convoys would double up going forward. Upon her return, in late October, she was sent down to the Med to assist with Operation Torch by escorting the British invasion force. After this proceeded without incident, she shifted to covering the landing operations on November 8th. Tragically, on November 15th, while sailing for Gibraltar for repairs, she was struck by a single torpedo from U-155, hitting her in just the right spot to sink her in less than half an hour. She went down with 516 men, with only 12 of her crew being rescued. HMS Biter was one of the sister ships of Avenger, with her initial configuration as the passenger ship Rio Parana being essentially identical, and was laid down in December 28th of 1939. She was launched in December of the following year and was requisitioned in May of 1941. Her build was functionally identical to Avenger's, with the exception of actually having an island on her flight deck. Her conversion work was finished by May 1st of 1942, and she was turned over to the British a few days later. She would displace 9,144 tons, make 16.5 knots, and carry 16 aircraft. She immediately caught fire and then had engine room problems before she even left the States, but after those were fixed, she set off for Britain. Her engine broke down repeatedly during the journey. Early American carrier conversions were fucking dog shit if you couldn't tell, and when she arrived in the UK in late June, she was almost immediately dry docked to have her shit fixed. This started a trend of all American-built escort carriers being immediately overhauled in British dockyards. She arrived in Scapa Flow in October, just in time to link up with Avenger and Victorious to go fuck shit up down in Operation Torch. Biter was stationed off Oran along with Dasher and Furious. The only major thing that happened here was one of her Hurricanes crashing into her bridge a day after operations began. Afterwards, she spent a few months doing exercises and ASW patrols, as well as getting overhauled once until April of 1943, when she was assigned to Cross-Atlantic Convoy ONS-4. She served in a very effective spotting role, and the convoy took no losses while sinking 2 U-boots. The return convoy she was assigned to in May was more eventful, with Biter losing multiple aircraft to shitty weather, with numerous submarines being engaged, but the convoy again took no casualties, and they sent 2 submarines to the bottom. After that convoy reached the air cover of the Isles, she turned south to link up with another that was being harassed by submarines. She showed up, and the subs scattered like rats, and the convoy arrived in Britain without incident. After 3 casualty-free convoys, Admiralty realized just how crazy good these ships could be, so her air arm was bumped to 21. She continued making cross-Atlantic runs until one in November 1943 that saw a Swordfish crash into the sea in bad weather and accidentally send its torpedo straight into Biter's ass end, but she was able to limp home and be repaired. On her first run back in February 1944, her aircraft shot down a bomber, but did lose multiple to weird weather again. She spent a few more months escorting convoys and conducting anti-submarine sweeps without much incident, and in August of 1944 was demoted to aircraft transport due to her age and her shitty American hardware. She was returned to the Americans in April 1945, before being loaned to the French and renamed the Dismoud. She participated in some good old-fashioned imperialism in Indochina for a couple of years before being re-demoted to transport ship and kinda just doing random bullshit until 1966, when she was returned to the United States. She was subsequently blown up as a target ship. HMS Dasher was the third ship of the Avenger gang, built on top of the hull of the Rio de Janeiro passenger cargo ship. She was laid down in this configuration in March of 1940 and launched in April 1941. Like her sister Biter, she was never completed in this configuration, being immediately requisitioned for carrier conversion under Lend-Lease. She was closer in design to Biter than Avenger, even down to having the islands that Avenger lacked. She was finished and commissioned as HMS Dasher in July of 1942, coming to displace 8,200 tons, make 16.5 knots and carry 15 aircraft. Her service life was brief and rife with problems. During her flight training, she lost 2 aircraft to accidents, and then at the end of July, her fucking engine exploded, which injured 2 people and took a month to repair. She didn't leave the States until the end of August. She made it to the UK without incident, and after further training, she was sent to go aid Operation Torch in November as a part of the Oron gang with Biter and Furious. She lost 4 of her aircraft in one operation, which was crippling and reduced her to simple combat air patrol duties for much of the campaign. After this, she returned to the UK for some repairs to her engines. Again, this fucking class, I swear their engines don't even work. These 3 carriers might as well have been rowboats with how often their engines broke down or caught fire or exploded. Anyways, she was back in service condition by February 1943 and successfully escorted convoy JW-53 to the Soviet Union with no combat but taking severe weather damage. She was dry docked on her return to fix this all, being sent back out in mid-March. But suddenly, on March 27th of 1943, while still in British home waters in the Firth of Clyde, she was rocked by 2 gigantic explosions that tossed her aircraft lift 60 feet into the air. She sank in less than 8 minutes, with 379 of her 528 crew perishing in the process. What exactly caused Dasher to cook off like it did is not known, but the generally accepted conclusion reached by an official investigation was improper fuel storage and safety procedures, which led to an ignition caused by buildup of vapor in either the fuel storage room or the depth charge magazine. Multiple aircraft were in the process of being refueled, causing a chain reaction that essentially blew the top off the thing. News of her loss was initially censored by the British government, but it did trigger reforms of fuel handling procedures and mandatory alterations to all American-built escort carriers relating to how much fuel the ships carried and how that fuel was transported. A memorial to those lost on the ship was constructed in the town of Ardrossan in Scotland, near where the disaster occurred. HMS Activity is funky because she is her own independent design due to the odd nature of the ship she was built on top of. She was initially built as the refrigerated cargo ship Telemachus, laid down in February 1940. A year later, she was requisitioned by the Royal Navy to serve as a regular wartime cargo ship and later for conversion into an escort carrier. She was launched in May of 1942 and her structure would be finished by August of that year, being commissioned in September. Her design featured a long but narrow steel flight deck, no catapult, and a comparatively small hangar. She came to displace 14,470 tons fully loaded, make 18 knots, and carry a measly 10 aircraft. She wasn't the best carrier, but she was good enough for the jobs that needed doing at this point in the war. Her workup was completed by the new year 1943, and she spent pretty much the entirety of that year serving as a deck landing training carrier. In October, she was sent for refit again to participate in actual operations, and in mid-January 1944, she began escorting convoys in the western approaches. Then, in March, she was assigned to escorting Soviet-bound convoys in the Arctic, being tied to HMS Tracker for convoy JW-58. She was able to claim a few aircraft shot down, as well as a kill assist on U-355, and damage numbers on 3 other submarines. In April, she made her second run with HMS Fencer, where she shot down more aircraft on the return trip. She spent May to August back in the western approaches, which included some ASW sweeps to cover the ass of the D-Day landings, before being assigned to ferry duties for the Far East in August. She made several ferry runs between India and the UK, before being sent to Australia to go do more ferrying in January 1945. Her final action would be to partake in the reoccupation of Singapore in late August and repatriate a bunch of POWs. She returned to the UK in October 1945 and was sold back into merchant service in March of the following year. She was eventually sold for scrap in 1967. Yeah, there really isn't much to say about most of these, so I'll provide real and true fun facts to round them out. HMS Activity is wanted for war crimes in the former Yugoslavia. HMS Attacker was the first of the Bogue class of escort carriers supplied by the United States. The Bogues were also converted from merchant ships, much like the Avenger class. In order to differentiate, the Bogues that served in the Royal Navy were collectively known as the Attacker class, named obviously for Attacker herself. She was initially laid down as the cargo ship Steel Artisan, later renamed to Barnes in April of 1941. She was bought out by the US Navy while still under construction, and after she was launched in September of that year, she was sent to New York to be finished as a carrier, being completed and commissioned as HMS Attacker in October of 1942. She came to displace 14,630 tons fully loaded, could make a respectable 18 knots, and could carry a maximum of 24 aircraft, although the usual air wing for the Attacker class was 20. The Attackers were just flat upgrades over the Avengers in pretty much every way. They were bigger ships that had bigger hangars and longer flight decks, more well-designed interiors and machinery, a greatly improved suite of anti-aircraft armament based off of experience in the war up to this point, and they even had islands. They also had far fewer technical issues, which means the vast majority of these ships actually had solid service careers. Her trials were completed without major incident aside from a few aircraft accidents by February of 1943, and after a brief rectification of any minor issues they found, she sailed for Curaçao in March, joining a convoy and crossing the Atlantic to the UK by the end of the month. She spent 2 months getting some modifications and upgrades to bring her up to Royal Navy standards. This included an improved radar array, better AA suite, a longer flight deck, and some new internal systems more familiar to British sailors. These upgrades and refits will occur with every single bogue that was sent to the British, and the upgrades were basically the same every time. Then in August, she linked up with her sisters Battler, Hunter, and Stalker and made for the Mediterranean. On the way, they all got beat to shit in a storm, which required some minor repairs. They arrived in Malta on September 7th, where they joined up with a big-ass task force which included a very rare HMS Unicorn appearance. This was Force V, which covered the landing efforts of Operation Avalanche near Salerno in Italy. With 109 aircraft between the five, operations went smoothly, save for several planes and people lost to tragic accidents. After this, the task force was disbanded, and Attacker, along with Hunter and Stalker, were converted into assault carriers, essentially carriers that were dedicated to providing air support to naval invasions. Attacker was essentially given a suite of new bullshit that turned her into a floating command post and airbase. These upgrades were finished by the end of December, afterwards spending a few months doing training. Her next assignment was convoy escort in the Mediterranean, being conjoined at the hip with Hunter and Stalker. Then in August, they were finally utilized in their assault carrier role and partook in Operation Dragoon in southern France, with Attacker carrying out dozens of airstrikes over a few weeks. In September, Attacker was sent to Alexandria and undertook several operations in the Aegean Sea against German troops on the islands, before being sent back to the UK in November for a refit and some R&R with Hunter and Stalker. In April, they were assigned to the Pacific, and over the next few months aided in amphibious operations against various Japanese-occupied islands in Malaya and Indonesia. Finally, in August 1945, she was present for Operation Jurist, Zipper, and Tide Race, accepting the capitulation of Japanese forces on the Malay Peninsula. She returned to the UK in October, and returned to the United States in December. In 1947, she was sold off to be reconverted into a cargo ship and then a passenger liner. She served various companies until 1979 when a bad fire broke out and essentially destroyed the ship. She was scrapped in May of 1980 in Hong Kong. HMS Battler was the second of the Bogue class supplied by the United States. She was laid down in April 1941 as the freighter Mormocmile, being bought out by the U.S. Navy in January 1942 before she was even halfway completed. She was launched in April 1942 and would be completed and immediately transferred to the Royal Navy at the end of October, taking the name HMS Battler. Basically everything about her design can be copy-pasted from Attacker, which is how most of these escorts will be. Her sea trials were delayed by her slamming into a jetty, but after that everything went well. Her career began in June of 1943, with her escorting a couple of convoys to and from Gibraltar, and her aircraft shooting down a German bomber. She was then pressed into Operation Avalanche in September, with her sisters Attacker, Stalker, and Hunter, which went well, although again she lost several aircraft accidents. While her three sisters were sent back to the UK to be reworked, Battler was not. Instead, she broke off from the squadron at Gibraltar and was assigned to the East Indies Fleet to protect convoys in the Western Indian Ocean. She spent October to January 1944 running convoys from Aden to Mumbai, before spending much of January and February hunting German U-boat supply ships. One of them they couldn't find, but the other ship, Battler had a hand in sinking by spotting it with her aircraft. From March to June, she was refitting in Durban, South Africa, afterwards continuing anti-submarine patrols and convoy escort duties until December, when she was sent back to the UK by way of Sydney, Australia, so she could drop off some planes on the way. Her journey around the backside of the Earth took until March 1945, stopping to collect aircraft along the way. Since the naval war was effectively won by this point, she was used for deck landing training until January of 1946, after which she was returned to the United States. Unlike Attacker, she was not bought out by a merchant company, instead simply being sold for scrap in June of 1946. Fun fact, Battler runs an illegal gambling parlor. HMS Stalker was the third ship of the Attacker class, laid down in April of 1941 as an initially unnamed freighter. She was launched in March of 1942 and would be completed and commissioned by December 21st of that year, being named HMS Stalker. Her trials were mostly smooth, other than the seemingly fucking mandatory mechanical issues that required repairs. She left North America in March of 1943 with her sister Hunter, making a stop in Casablanca to drop some MISC bullshit off for the US Army, and then made their way to the UK, arriving in April. She sailed down to the Mediterranean Mediterranean with attacker Battler and Hunter, where she partook in Operation Avalanche with the group. The high attrition rates hit her as well. She lost 4 aircraft and another 14 were damaged beyond on-ship repair. After this, her career was essentially identical to that of attacker, as the two were squatted up with Hunter pretty much constantly. Stalker received the assault carrier conversion in late 43, partook in the actions in Italy in Operation Dragoon in August 1944, where Stalker's aircraft notably spotted for the USS Texas of all ships, then dicked around in the Aegean from September to November, where she sank a few transport ships and covered the invasion of Greece. After this, she was refitted until February 1945, then was sent with her sisters over to Asia, where she provided air cover for the reoccupation of Rangoon in Burma in early May, during Operation Dracula, which is an awesome code name. She then spent the rest of May bombing airfields, harbors, and the occasional random Japanese boat that happened to be unlucky enough to appear in the area. Then in June, she was sent down to Malaya and Sumatra, where she bombed more airfields, destroying dozens of aircraft on the ground and all the buildings and rail connections for good measure. Then, of course, she partook in Operations Jurist and Zipper, and was a part of the 90-ship force that was in Singapore for the capitulation of Japanese forces in Southeast Asia on September 12th of 1945. She returned to the UK at the end of October and was returned to the United States in December. She was sold off to be converted into a passenger cargo ship and served various companies based in various countries around the world in that role until she was scrapped in 1975. Blah blah blah, Stalker's a closeted furry. HMS Hunter was the 4th ship of the attacker class and is functionally the same ship as Stalker down to the service history. She was laid down in May of 1941 as the cargo ship Mormacpen and was bought out as the USS Block Island in January 1942. In March, the decision was made to give her to the British, and she was subsequently launched in May and completed at the end of December 1942, being commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Hunter in early January 1943. She was named as such in the honor of the H-class destroyer Hunter, which was sunk during the First Battle of Narvik. After her trials during January and February, she was essentially attached to a convoy with her sister Stalker in mid-March, and would not leave her side for the remainder of the war. Much like Blueprint and Brainstorm, these two were made for each other and have a very healthy relationship. After the stopover in Casablanca, she arrived in the UK in April, spent 3 months working up and receiving Royal Navy modifications, and then in August went down to the Mediterranean along with Stalker, Battler, Attacker, and Unicorn to go fuck up some Italians during Operation Avalanche. The only unique thing that happened to her was that the storm the group sailed through beat her to shit the worst, to the point that she lost 13 aircraft and needed to return to the UK for repairs. She was fixed in time for Avalanche in September, and afterwards joined Attacker and Stalker for conversion into an assault carrier. Her conversion was finished in mid-January 1944, and after a couple of months of exercises and training, she went back to the Mediterranean with her sisters. I'm going fucking insane repeating myself here, so we're gonna lightning round this. She bombed a bunch of German shit during Operation Dragoon, she bombed a bunch of German shit in the Aegean, then in April 1945, she was assigned to the East Indies Fleet with Stalker, where they attacked Rangoon. The first thing she did separate from Stalker were the 2 Operations Mitre and Dukedom in May, which was the hunt for the Japanese cruiser Haguro and destroyer Kamikaze, which had been spotted evacuating Japanese troops from the Andaman Islands, as well as the relief force of a tanker and subchaser sent to go help them. After a week of near misses and general shenanigans, Hunter's task force actually found Haguro by accident. Hunter's air wing did carry out a strike on Haguro, but she would be finished off by a flotilla of destroyers. After this, she did some more airstriking and convoy escorting before rejoining Stalker for Operations Jurist and Zipper. She returned to the UK in October, at the end of October 1945, before being returned to the United States in December. She was sold off in September 46 and spent her retirement as a tanker. She would be scrapped in November of 1965. We finally have a ship that actually had a unique service career divorced from her previously mentioned sisters. She was laid down as the freighter Mormacmail on November 3rd of 1941 and was very quickly bought out by the US Navy for use as an escort carrier. She was launched in March of 1942 and completed to the Bogue Attacker class design. Her completion and sea trials took until mid-January 1943, after which she was commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Tracker. She is notable for being the first escort carrier built in Portland, Oregon, and her badge represents an indigenous figure from a local tribe for that reason. After some further training and sailing, she made the Atlantic run, stopping over in Casablanca in June to drop some cargo off, and finally arrived in Belfast in early June 1943. She was promptly overhauled by Harland and Wolff to meet British standards, and after further training and a couple of almost fatal aircraft accidents, began her actual career in September. Her first mission was, of course, convoy escorting duties in the western approaches. This is actually where an interesting tactic starts to appear. Escort carriers from the UK would sail without going outgoing convoys until they were about halfway across the Atlantic, then would swing around and sail back with the inbound convoy. Carriers on the other side of the Atlantic would do the same on their half. This meant that a smaller number of carriers could cover far more convoys and would be more readily available to engage U-boots due to not needing to sail all the way across the fucking ocean and then all the way back. In early November, she had basically her entire air wing obliterated in a storm because escort carriers were not the most stable ships on Earth, and she made the transit trip to North America for repairs and a new host of aircraft. In the new year, she was assigned to anti-submarine patrols on the Gibraltar route for a bit with HMS Biter. After encountering no submarines for 2 months, she was reassigned to the infamous Arctic route to Murmansk. She joined with HMS Activity for convoy JW-58 in March 1944, during which her aircraft shot down a few German aircraft. There was also an incident on April 1st where an ASW bomber crashed through her flight deck, caught fire, and nearly exploded, but damage control was able to control the fire and prevent a disaster. She made up for this 2 days later when her aircraft were able to sink U-288, which was a major achievement, and the convoy reached the Soviet Union without losing any ships. The return convoy was thankfully uneventful. In June of 1944, Tracker partook in Operation Neptune, the D-Day landings, by conducting anti-submarine sweeps and covering the Atlantic flank of the invasion force from any U-boots that tried to go and attack the landing force. On the 10th, due to darkness and poor visibility, she rammed a Canadian frigate and fucking obliterated it, killing 4 sailors, although the frigate itself was saved by the timely arrival of another frigate to tow her to port. The damage was enough to force a refit, and she spent until October in dry dock. She made one final run to Russia in late October and early November before she was returned to American service in December and spent the rest of the war as a transport ship. She was sold into merchant service to an Argentine company in 1946 and spent the rest of her life as the Corrientes until she was scrapped in 1964. HMS Fencer was another bloody attacker class, laid down in September of 1941. She was pretty quickly bought out by the US Navy to be converted into an escort carrier, was launched in April 1942, and would be completed in February of 1943. She would be commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Fencer on March 1st. Her trials were uneventful and successful, and she arrived in the UK in late May. She spent June to mid-September being refitted and undergoing landing training, and at the end of September she formally began her duties with Operation Alacrity, which was the planned invasion of the Portuguese Azores. But Portugal agreed to give the Allies basing rights, so it ended up just being a quick transportation run down to the islands to set up shop in early October. She then spent most of the rest of the year escorting various convoys in the Atlantic. She spent the winter in dock for some repairs before she was dispatched to escort duties in February 1944. On the 11th, her aircraft managed to blow up a submarine, which automatically puts her in the wildly successful escort carrier tier. Noticing this success, Admiralty assigned her to Operation Tungsten, one of the many raids against the Tirpitz. In early April, they threw 6 fucking carriers at her, Victorious and Furious, as well as Fencer and her sisters, Searcher and Pursuer, and rounded out by the ruler-class escort carrier Emperor. The raid achieved complete surprise, and they smashed Tirpitz up and killed hundreds of her crew, but the battleship did not sink. While the raid did not succeed in its objective, they only lost like 4 aircraft out of 100, so it was a major fucking W in a roundabout way. In the days following, she was assigned to an abortive effort to raid German shipping, which was stymied by bad weather, and after that she spent the rest of April and May running Soviet convoys where she sank U-277 on May 1st. Then, the next fucking day, her aircraft sank U-959. Battle of the Atlantic is really funny because literally anyone involved in the sinking of a U-boot is just showered with medals. Yeah, I don't know if you've been keeping track, but the most successful aircraft carrier on this list so far is HMS Fencer. She made a brief excursion to patrol the North Sea for submarines in June to cover the Normandy invasion, whereafter she was reassigned to transatlantic convoy duty. In September, she went on a brief side quest to drop mines on the Norwegian coast, spent some time on R&R, and then linked up with her sister HMS Striker and was sent to the Pacific. She sailed down to Australia to deliver some stuff, and then Fencer spent basically the rest of the war ferrying aircraft and miscellaneous items around the Pacific and Indian Oceans. In November 1945, she was converted into a troop ship along with a bunch of other escorts, since there were now millions of soldiers around the world that needed to find their way home. She performed this task until October 1946, after which she was returned to the United States. She was sold into Italian service and converted into a passenger liner, eventually being scrapped in 1975. HMS Searcher was laid down as a freighter in February 1942, being bought out by the US Navy in July of that year for completion as a carrier. She would be launched in June and completed and commissioned in April 1943, brought into the Royal Navy as HMS Searcher. After her workup and trials were completed, she joined with her sister Striker and set sail for the UK at the end of June. She spent July to October being refitted to be more British-ish, and in December 1943 she began running convoys, making a couple of Atlantic crossings without incident. Searcher Searcher is notable for being a primarily fighter-based carrier, and she was almost always sortied with other carriers to serve in a fighter escort role. In March of 1944, she was assigned to the Home Fleet to aid in the aforementioned Operation Tungsten to go gang stalk Tirpitz for a bit. For Tungsten, Searcher was in the attacking AA batteries role, and she only suffered 3 aircraft somewhat damage after a couple of botched landings. She was initially supposed to participate in another raid on Tirpitz, Operation Planet, in late April, but it was kiboshed by shit weather, so instead she was sent to blow up some merchant ships around Norway with assorted other carriers, including a very successful run in early May with Furious, where her fighters shot down 2 German flying boats and helped sink 3 tankers. She also got a personal visit from the King on May 11th, which was cool. In July, she was exiled to the Mediterranean, being assigned to escort, spotting, and bombing duties for the assault force of Operation Dragoon being undertaken in August. Once again, Dragoon was uneventful because the Germans kinda just didn't show up. Fucking posers. Searcher herself flew rather few sorties because her aircraft caught an extreme case of repeated engine failure and her catapult shit the bed at one point. She did still do a good deal of spotting and escorting and even got a few strike raids under her belt as well. After this, she was attached to the task force with attacker, hunter, pursuer, and stalker to go cyberbully Germans in the Aegean in September, which was pretty successful, and Searcher had a fun time blowing shit up. However, at the end of September, she would be detached and sent back to the UK, where she would be refitted from November to February 1945. She returned to service in March and did some random bullshit for 2 months, then partaking in Operation Judgment with HMS Trumpeter, a raid on a German U-boat base in early May. This one was remarkably successful, sinking a coastal defense ship, a cargo ship, and U-711. This was the final North Sea naval operation against the Germans, and a few days later, Searcher would be one of the ships to accept the surrender of Prince Eugen and Nuremberg. So she does actually have some cool-ass accolades to her name. She was then briefly refit in preparation to go fight Japan, but by the time she arrived in the Far East, the war was already over. She was returned to the US in November 1945, being sold into merchant service the following year. She had a solid and uneventful career, being scrapped in 1976. HMS Chaser started her existence as the freighter Mormacagulf, laid down in June of 1941 and bought out by the US Navy for conversion in December and the weeks after Pearl Harbor. She would be launched in June of 1942 and would be completed and commissioned in April of 1943, being transferred to the Royal Navy as HMS Chaser, named for a sloop of war from the 1780s, which is pretty neat. Her workup and trials were completed by mid-June, and she arrived in the UK in early July, just in time for her boilers to fucking explode. Thankfully, nobody was killed or seriously injured, but she did need to sit and dock an extra 3 fucking months to repair the damages. She completed further trials and training before being docked again for further repairs for random bullshit that kept popping up. As such, she didn't actually join the fleet until January of 1944. Her first mission was convoy JW-57 to the Soviet Union in February, where due to shit weather, Chaser's aircraft struggled and they were absolutely accosted by U-boats. One destroyer was sunk in exchange for 2 of the subs, U-713 and U-601, but Chaser only gets a spotting credit for 713. The return journey in March was similarly eventful. Her fighters shot down a flying boat, and her ASW aircraft helped sink U-472. Her air wing also outright sank U-366 and U-973. Absolute fucking giga-chad carrier right here. It is wild how much of the convoy war was changed by simply sending carriers with the convoys. 5 U-boots in 2 months for a single convoy run is a baller ratio. Upon her return to the UK, she was almost immediately grounded in bad weather, so she had to spend a couple of months laid up. It was also determined to convert her into a ferry carrier because apparently she was just too good at her job that the Admiralty had to ruin her sparkle. She was also rigged to take on partial maintenance and replenishment roles, like a few ships we will get to later. She reappears on the records in January 1945 when she was assigned to be a ferry in the Pacific Fleet, arriving in Australia in April. She partook in the second half of the Battle of Okinawa, providing aircraft to Formidable after she caught fire and nearly exploded. She essentially just sailed between various naval bases and the warships near Japan, replenishing their air wings and keeping the pressure up. It was a small but extremely vital role that allowed the Allied carriers to constantly cycle aircraft to simply overwhelm the badly outnumbered Japanese. After the war ended, she served as a transport ship before being returned to the United States in May of 1946 and sold into merchant service as a passenger ship. Eventually, while in Taiwan in November of 1972, she caught fire and was beached, effectively destroying the ship. She was scrapped the following year. HMS Ravager was an unnamed freighter laid down in April of 1942 that was pretty quickly bought out by the US Navy to be converted into a carrier, and later earmarked for transfer to the Royal Navy. The American industrial machine was finally starting to come to life, so she was launched only 3 months later in July of 1942, although her completion as a carrier would take until April of 1943, when she was commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Ravager. She left North America in July, making a rather uneventful crossing of the Atlantic. Side note, it's kind of funny how the U-boots never appeared during these initial crossings for these ships. Their captains were just fucking terrified of carriers, I guess. She received a much smaller refit than most of her sisters and was immediately put to work joining up with the now elderly HMS Argus to serve as a deck landing training carrier. She took over training duties completely at the end of September, when Argus was given some much-needed retirement and placed in reserve. In November, in some bad weather, she accidentally bulldozed another escort carrier, Pretoria Castle, which forced 2 weeks of repairs for both ships. She continued serving as a training carrier until April of 1944, when the only things of note that occurred were a bunch of training accidents, but shit happens. In mid-April, she was overhauled and also doubled as a ferry carrier, and for literally the rest of the war, she would alternate between making transport runs to various places and training squads of pilots. She had her job, and she fucking stuck to it, that's for sure. For carrying a name like Ravager, she sure didn't do a lot of ravaging. She was returned to the United States in February 1946 and was sold into civilian service as a passenger liner the following July, and served in that role until she was scrapped in 1973. Fun fact, Ark Royal II is in the destroyer files. HMS Striker was laid down as another unnamed freighter. She was laid down in December 41, a week after Pearl Harbor, and as such, she was almost immediately bought out by the US Navy for conversion into a carrier and eventual transfer to the Royal Navy. She was launched in May 1942, and almost exactly a year later, in May of 1943, she was commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Striker. At the end of June, she joined up with Searcher and made the jaunt across the Atlantic, afterwards being refitted and undergoing trials until October. She was then actually assigned to escort duties beginning in December, and she served in this role for a large chunk of her career. Her first stint lasted until April 1944, and was largely uneventful save for one battle with a submarine which managed to escape. Beginning in late April, she was paired up with Searcher once again for a series of offensive operations in the North Sea, and everything I said in her section also applies here. Striker's aircraft didn't see much combat themselves, save for a brief skirmish with some German planes. After Searcher was detached, she would go on to partake in a few more raids in May and June, including that one uneventful distraction mission with Fencer, and then spent most of July and August performing anti-submarine sweeps. The common thread here is that Striker didn't usually come across anything significant. In August, she linked up with the HMS Windex, the second, and ran convoy JW-59 to Russia, where the group was notably joined by a certain battleship Arkhangelsk, ex-Royal Sovereign, for escort duties. Convoy only took a single casualty, a sloop, and upon arrival in the Soviet Union, Striker was host to an officers' party and a concert, which was cute. She made another Arctic run in late September with HMS Campania, the second, where Striker again didn't do much and Campania the second got the singular U-boat kill. She returned to the UK in October and was then allocated to the Pacific Fleet, arriving in Australia a few days before New Year's. Striker was allocated to a replenishment role like several of her sisters, not carrying out strikes but resupplying other Allied carriers with fresh aircraft when needed. After the war ended, she undertook primarily humanitarian work in Southeast Asia and China before being recalled to the UK in late November. She was returned to the US Navy in February 1946 and was sold for scrap later that year, being broken up in 1949. Fellas, it's time. We have finally arrived at the final attacker class escort carrier. Let's fucking go. Okay. To get a bit meta here, it has taken me like 5 real-life days to slog my way through this fucking class of ships. You might think, oh, so we're almost done escort carriers now, right? We still have 27 more to get through after this. This script is already 36 pages. I'm going to fucking die. Holy shit. Anyways, the final ship of the attacker class was, of course, HMS Pursuer. She began her life as another SS Mormacland, initially laid down in July 1941 to take the name Mormacland since Archer had already taken it once already. In January 1942, she was bought out by the US Navy for conversion to a bogue and was later provided to the Royal Navy under Lend-Lease. She was launched in July of 1942 and completed and commissioned in June of 1943 as HMS Pursuer. She arrived in the UK in August and spent until July 1944 being refitted and worked up. Her first mission as a part of the fleet was escorting a convoy down to West Africa in February, during which her aircraft shot down a German plane. In April, she was assigned to Operation Tungsten, after which she joined Searcher in a couple of planned raids on German shipping in the Norway area, although 2 of the 3 were cancelled by bad weather. Pursuer did get picked for something more interesting afterwards, at least. August, joining up with HMS Tracker to sweep the western approaches for submarines that might threaten the D-Day landings. In July, she was assigned to the fucking Giga CV fleet that was sent down to the Mediterranean, so you know what that means. Dragoon and Aegean Sea. Yeah. She was detached in October to go back to the UK, raiding more German shipping in Operation Stake, and a couple of others, where she blew up 2 trawlers and a radar station. In December 44, she was sent back to the States to be refitted, returning to the UK in February 1945. The next month, she was sent to South Africa to be refitted further before moving on to the Pacific, arriving in July. The one thing she did here was partake in Operation Zipper, the reoccupation of Malaya, in September. She dicked around transporting troops and shit for a month before returning to the UK in January 1946, being returned to the US the following month. She would be scrapped in late 1946. Yeah, a bit of a letdown for final ship of the class. Not much to say, really. Pursuer sold me Fent in the Superstore parking lot, I don't fucking know. For something slightly different, there is HMS Pretoria Castle, a carrier actually built by the British in a British dockyard. She began her life as the passenger liner Pretoria Castle, on a date nobody seems to know. Like, genuinely, I could not find the day she was laid down anywhere. We can assume sometime in late 1937 or early 1938. She would be launched in October 1938 and completed in her passenger configuration a couple months later. She made exactly 2 voyages before the Admiralty yoinked her in October of 1939, initially to be used as an armed merchant cruiser, i.e. she was strapped with some guns and told to hopefully not die to Admiral Graf Spee when she rolled around. Through most of 1940, she was conducting convoy defense missions in West Africa and the South Atlantic before being equipped with aircraft catapults in February 1941. She had further uneventful convoy duties for the rest of the year before the Admiralty went, "Congratulations, you are being promoted to aircraft carrier" in June of 1942. Her design was essentially a larger and more well-put-together HMS Activity, which included actual catapults, more arrestor wires, and a way bigger hangar. After her conversion, she was to clock in at 23,450 tons, be able to make 18 knots, and carry 21 aircraft. She was formally commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Pretoria Castle in July of 1943 and was designated as a training and trial carrier for preparing new pilots and testing new technologies. She made very few operational voyages. Her first was in October and November 43, where she ran a convoy to Iceland, but otherwise she pretty much exclusively performed trial work. She would be host to several aviation firsts in this role. Several, of course, undertaken by Eric Winkle Brown, the fucking Chad, who in April 1944 made the first tail-down catapult launch of an aircraft from a British carrier, and then made the first landing of a tricycle undercarriage aircraft, the Bell Air Cobra, on any aircraft carrier. The latter he was very explicitly told not to do, but who gives a shit, he's Winkle Brown. Oh, and he crashed into her deck one time. That was fun. She did a lot of this, and broke a lot of aircraft in the process, but the knowledge gained was invaluable. Of particular note was in May of 1945 when she conducted turbulence tests by landing big-ass gliders on the ship, and in August she was given a prototype of the Gloucester Meteor to play around with to see how a jet aircraft would handle the hangar and decks on the water. At the end of 1945, she was stood down and was sold back to her original owners in 1946, being renamed to Warwick Castle and turned back into a passenger and mail ship. She would eventually be scrapped in 1962. Oh, what, you thought we were done with Bogues? Sit the fuck down, kiddo, because the second set of American-built carriers were the Ruler class. The Ruler class, which you will sometimes see referred to as the Amir class, were essentially super Bogues, if that makes sense. While the attackers were converted merchant ships, the Rulers were carriers built on top of specially ordered merchant ship hulls that were designed to work with the Bogue carrier design for pre-launch conversion if the need arose, if that makes any sense. With mass production in mind, nearly every one of the Ruler class were built by Seattle Tacoma at a single shipyard. They still followed the Bogue design, but with improved machinery and generally higher build quality. As the attacker class deliveries were running their course, the US Navy offered the Admiralty to keep building Bogues for the Royal Navy instead of sending them the newly designed Casablanca class ships, since the Bogue design was tried and tested and British sailors would adapt easily to them. This is also where the Americans started getting crazy fast at building these fuckers, so they were able to crank them out easily. The first of the Rulers was HMS Amir. Her original name was USS Baffins, laid down in July of 1942 and launched in October of the same year. She would be completed and commissioned as HMS Amir in July of 1943, with a spec sheet that is functionally identical to that of the attackers, but they on average displace a couple hundred tons more here and there, so I'm probably just not going to repeat it. They were still Bogues, you get the picture. Her British refit was undertaken in the port of Vancouver, British Columbia, which would be completed by late October, with her arriving in the UK for service only in January 1944. Once she was there, she entered dock again to be fitted out as an assault carrier, which took until May May of 1944. After this, she was sent to the Indian Ocean, the transit taking until July before she could finally actually enter service, for real this time, I promise. She initially performed some merchant protection duties for a few months before doing some training, and then in January of 45, she would actually see combat. Finally. These were Operations Lightning, Matador, and Sankey, which were amphibious operations in Burma. Everything went well, and the only casualties taken by Amir were a few aircraft accidents. In February and March, she went on some recon runs in Sumatra, and then in June joined up with Stalker to bomb some airfields for shits and giggles. Strikes on Malaya continued until the end of the war, and she had the honor of being present for the recapture of Singapore and the surrender of Japanese forces in the harbor. She returned to the UK in November 1945, and was sent back to the States in January 1946. She was sold into merchant service and converted into a passenger freighter, eventually being scrapped in 1969. HMS Begum began her life as USS Bolinas, laid down in August of 1942 as a cargo ship and later assigned for shipping to the Royal Navy. She was launched in November of 42, completed in July of 43, and commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Begum in August of 43. She underwent her Royal Navy refit in Vancouver, which will be the case with the majority of the rulers, and after completing her sea trials, she sailed for the UK in late December. She arrived in the UK in February 1944 and was promptly assigned to the Far East with HMS Atheling, so she loaded up a stock of aircraft and went on her way. She arrived in India in April and spent the next few months performing ASW sweeps around the Indian Ocean. In June, she aided in the sinking of U-198 off the coast of East Africa, but the rest of the year was essentially without incident save for the occasional accident. Eventually, in December of 1944, she was sent back to the UK for a quick refit to serve as a ferry carrier, and in April of 45, she was back in the Pacific running aircraft to various bases until June, when she was reassigned to deck landing training duty. Then, in late August, she was allocated to Operation Zipper with the gang of misfits, Attacker, Hunter, and Stalker, but on her way out of the harbor, she smashed into something and was held back for repairs. HMS Begum, the Nothing Ever Happens carrier. By November, she was back in the UK, and on Christmas Day of 1945, she was returned to the United States, after nearly being destroyed in a storm on the trip back. She was sold into merchant service as a freighter in 1947 and would be sold for scrap in 1974. Fun fact, if you were wondering, no, she doesn't love you. HMS Trumpeter. No, she is not affiliated with the Chinese model company, trust me, I checked, and tragically, the company Trumpeter has not made a model of the Trumpeter, which is a hate crime and discrimination against escort carriers. Anyways, she started existence as the USS Bastion in August of 42, before the decision was made to ship her off to the Royal Navy. She was launched in December of 1942 and would be completed and commissioned as HMS Trumpeter in August of 1943. After completing her trials successfully, she set off for the UK in mid-September, eventually reaching the Isles by the end of October. As soon as she had arrived in the UK, her engines shit the bed a few times, so her first mission was to join a convoy back across the Atlantic to get fixed again. She was back in early December and was promptly told that she was going back across the fucking pond to collect more aircraft and bring them back. Yippee! All of these runs were made without incident, and she was back in the UK by February. However, since those modifications that the Vancouver dockyards had been doing hadn't been done, she then spent February to June in dock being overhauled to Royal Navy standards. These late war escort carriers don't do a whole lot if you couldn't tell. After a bit of time training, in August she was sent to the Norwegian coast to lay mines and airstrike a few places, where she blew up 2 entire ships, which is pretty solid. Then later in the month she was sent for Operation Goodwood with Victorious, Furious, and Nabob to go attack the Tirpitz some more. However, Trumpeter would not partake, as Nabob got smashed with a torpedo from a U-boot, and she had to hang back and help her not sink, later escorting the crippled ship home. In September, Trumpeter did some more aerial mine laying, and absolutely banished an unlucky German freighter to the fucking Shadow Realm in the process. In March, she was sent to escort convoy JW-65, but not before she got a visit from a fucking helicopter while she was in port, which promptly saw its engine die and crash into the sea. So yeah, no helicopters for the convoy. It went okay, they only lost 3 ships on the way there, but didn't sink anything due to shit weather. In May, she partook in Operation Judgment with HMS Searcher and her sister HMS Queen, which as previously stated was successful as hell, with Trumpeter squadrons providing fighter cover and also hitting the various flak positions to make the way for the obliteration of everything else. On May 11th, representatives of every ship in the home fleet made their way to Trumpeter as she was hosting the end of war celebration and Thanksgiving event, and the assembled parties were addressed by the First Lord of the Admiralty, A.V. Alexander. After this, she was refitted for service in the Far East, but by the time she arrived, Japan had surrendered, so all she really did was partake in Operation Zipper, the reoccupation of Malaya, in September. She dicked around in Southeast Asia, performing unknown tasks until January of 46, when she sailed for the UK. In March, she had returned to the United States and was returned to her builders, who decommissioned her and sold her off to be converted into a cargo ship at the end of the year. She served in this role until she was scrapped in 1971. HMS Emperor started out as USS Pibus. Brother had a single chance at life and was going to be named fucking Pibus. And of course, it's the name of a planet in Star Wars, and it's the first result that comes up. Get real. Anyways, she was laid down in June of 1942, launched in October of 42, and completed in May of 43, and was actually fully commissioned as the Pibus, and made her first voyage to Pearl Harbor before the decision was made to give her to the Brits. She was actually commissioned into the Royal Navy in early August, a couple of days after Trumpeter, and given the name HMS Emperor, which, big glow up from Pibus. She arrived in the UK in early September, where she was refitted until December and then assigned to the Western Approaches. She was worked up and ran a couple of transatlantic convoys where she ferried some aircraft until March of 44, when she was assigned to the Go Fuck Up the Germans wing of the Home Fleet. She took part in Operation Tungsten against Tirpitz with the gang, where her air wing only suffered a singular aircraft loss due to some technical difficulties. She then went along with the miscellaneous operations that followed, raiding German shipping on the Norwegian coast, partaking in basically every mission that HMS Striker was a part of. Her air wing claimed hits on several merchant ships, as well as a dozen German aircraft shot down and a fuel refinery blown up. In May, she was returned to the Western Approaches fleet and undertook convoy escort, as well as ASW sweep missions to shore up the rear of Operation Neptune. Then, in July, she was sent to the Mediterranean to join up with the escort carrier Mega Death Stack. So, guess what? Blew up a bunch of shit during Operation Dragoon and blew up a bunch of shit in the Aegean Sea. And was then sent off for a refit in November before being assigned to the Pacific upon its completion. She left for India in early March 1945, arriving by the end of the month and immediately being drafted into recon missions over Malaya and airstrikes in Sumatra in April. Her air wing would destroy several aircraft and storage dumps, and her catapult would actually break at one point, but otherwise things were pretty uneventful. She then joined up with Hunter and Stalker for Operation Dracula against Burma, which was also pretty uneventful. In May, she was assigned to Mitre and Dukedom, the hunt for Kagero and Kamikaze, but Emperor wasn't able to get any hits on the ships. After this, she spent some time being fixed up, before in July being sent to do some more airstrikes. Her final operation was that of Zipper, again in September, before being sent back to India and then on to the UK in October of 1945. She was demobilized and returned to the United States in February 1946, being sold for scrap 3 months later. HMS Slinger was laid down as the freighter hull that would turn into USS Chatham in May of 1942. She was launched in September 42 and was completed in early July 1943, undergoing brief trials before she was commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Slinger in August. She underwent her working up and some exercises with her sister Trumpeter, which went poorly when one of her arresting wires snapped, causing one of her aircraft to crash into the sea and one of her AA gunners to get whipped and nearly have his head cut off by a gigantic steel wire. She left for the UK in mid-September, arriving on November 1st. She was fitted out to Royal Navy standards, a process that was completed in early February 1944. However, as she sailed out for her trials and working up, disaster occurred, and she struck a mine that had drifted into a spot it wasn't supposed to on her way out of port, which destroyed large parts of the ship and caused her to take on water. She nearly sank right then and there, but she was able to limp to port fast enough with the help of some tugs. She then spent 9 months undergoing repairs, slowed down by many of her parts being stripped to hasten the refits of other escort carriers. She was finally fixed up in October of 44, and finally in January 1945, she began her journey to the Pacific, arriving in Australia in late February without incident. She was assigned to a role as a replenishment and transport carrier, and as such, did a whole lot of that for basically the rest of the war, save for about a month in dry dock to have the gears of her propeller fixed since they broke. After the war ended, she ran some humanitarian missions to the formerly occupied regions of China and Southeast Asia, and also was assigned to transport a couple of high-value prisoners who had collaborated with the Japanese in their internment camps, before being sent back to the UK in November. She was almost completely obliterated in a storm on the way, but otherwise she made it back by the end of December. She was returned to the US in February 1946, and was sold off to be converted into a passenger freighter. She would be scrapped in 1970. Slinger has committed hundreds of thousands of dollars in insurance fraud. HMS Empress II began life as the USS Carnegie, laid down for a brief moment as a cargo ship in September of 42, and launched literally 3 months later in December, which is crazy turnaround time if I do say so myself. During her construction, she was determined to be transferred to the Royal Navy as an escort carrier, and after her completion in August of 43, she would be commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Empress II a week after Emperor. When she arrived in Vancouver, she was fitted out to Royal Navy standards and then completed her sea trials through the winter. She was finally sent on her way in January of 1944, arriving in the UK in early April 1944. She spent April to November serving as a training carrier, training hundreds of pilots during this time. In December, she was briefly refitted for service in the Pacific. Yeah, it was clear that Germany was losing. The Allied powers basically just threw every naval asset they had at Japan after this. They were so fucked it's not even funny. She arrived in Sri Lanka in February 1945 and was placed in 21st Aircraft Carrier Squadron. For reference, this is the formation that included Amir, Attacker, Emperor, Hunter, Pursuer, Searcher, Stalker, and several of her other sisters. Gangs all here, everyone. Her first mission was some air recon in March that went hot and resulted in a few Japanese aircraft shot down, and then in April she was assigned to the covering force of Operation Dracula, which involved a bunch of airstrikes in Malaya and Sumatra to distract from the main operations in Burma. In July of 1945, she sailed with Amir to cover minesweeping operations and obliterated a shitload of Japanese aircraft when they attacked some air bases. Her operations for the next month were cancelled after the surrender of Japan, and then in September she partook in Operation Zipper because everyone was there, so might as well. She did some troop repatriation to Australia and New Zealand before being sent home in November 45. She was returned to the United States in February 1946, who promptly sold her for scrap in June. USS Enterprise is an informant for the feds, and she's reporting on all of you, by the way. Oh, I'm going insane. HMS Khedive was laid down in September of 1942, being launched in January of 1943 and completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy in August of that year. After completing her trials, she sailed for the UK beginning in late September, arriving in mid-November. Her Royal Navy refit to an assault carrier took until March, but was extended by a month because the fucking nanosecond she left port, she rammed into a freighter and needed to be repaired. Her trials and training would be completed by July of 44 before she was assigned to the Mediterranean. Take a wild fucking guess where she ends up. Khedive actually served as the command ship for her task force for the operation, and her aircraft engaged in several successful raids on infrastructure and military targets. Then in September, she joined in on the Aegean campaign, and Khedive is actually the carrier that rounds out the carrier task force in that region, which is neat. 7 carriers was definitely a bit overkill, but no force like overwhelming force, am I right? In October 1944, she went back to the UK to be refitted for Pacific duty, completed in early January. She arrived in the Indian Ocean in February and spent March and April undertaking Operation Sunfish, a series of recon flights and airstrikes in Malaya and Sumatra alongside Emperor. Khedive's aircraft were able to blow up a bunch of planes as well as some workshops and even a cargo ship, flying 113 sorties over 2 months. Her next operation was Dracula in May, and then she was sent to chase around Haguro to no avail, before launching a strike on some Japanese positions on the Andamans. After some further recon missions in June and July, her August operations were cancelled due to the surrender of Japan. She was assigned to Operation Zipper as her final military mission in September and did some menial bullshit until her return to the UK in December. She returned to the United States at the end of January 1946 and was sold off as a cargo freighter the following year. She would be scrapped in 1976. HMS Shah was laid down in November of 1942, launched in April of 1943, and completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy in late September of that same year. Her Royal Navy modification work was undertaken in Vancouver between October and December, and she underwent a brief training arc before, a few days into January, she actually saw a unique first voyage. She was not sent to the UK, instead immediately being sent to the Pacific Theater to serve as an ASW carrier. This already makes her interesting, thank fucking God. In mid-January, she sailed for India with a load of aircraft, making a stopover in Australia before arriving to India in March. After some time spent pilot training, she was assigned to ASW work in the Western Indian Ocean along with her sister Begum. The main action she had was chasing down U-198 in August of 1944, with one of her aircraft literally stumbling upon the U-boat at one point and nailing it with 2 depth charges, which crippled the sub and allowed the force of corvettes and frigates to close the gap and absolutely violate it, leading to it sinking. In February of 1945, she was sent down to South Africa to be refitted, which lasted until April, when she was sent back to the front to go fuck up some folks in Malaya as part of the distraction airstrikes during Operation Dracula in May. She was then assigned to go hunt down Haguro along with every British warship in the fucking Indian Ocean, but she herself didn't get to do too much because she got fucking blood poisoning, so she moved her bombers to Emperor and kinda just chilled. She underwent some brief repairs and served as a ferry ship until August, when the operations she was supposed to partake in were cancelled. The reduced versions of these plans did not need Shaw to be there, so she was stood down and sent to the UK in September. She arrived in the UK, for the first time, remember, in October, and the following month was immediately sent back to the United States for decommissioning. She was sold off to become a passenger cargo ship in June of 1947, serving various companies until she was scrapped in 1966. HMS Atheling was laid down in June of 1942 as the USS Glacier, which was transferred under Lend-Lease after her completion. She was launched in September of 1942 and would be completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Atheling in October of 1943 after her refit in Vancouver. Her work took a while because of labor issues. Most of the workforce were temps who were effectively just mobilized by the Canadian government to fly through these ships, and many had never actually worked on a ship before in their lives, and the Admiralty kind of just didn't provide drawings and blueprints, so they had to just wing large parts of the construction. She set sail for the UK in November along with Amir, as the two would sail together, and the duo arrived in January of 1944. Then, in early March, she was sent off to the Far East, arriving in Sri Lanka in mid-April along with HMS Begum. In May, she ran convoy protection for the Bay of Bengal, defending against the rare Japanese air incursion from Burma, and was also briefly attached to HMS Illustrious for diversionary operations as an extra deck. However, she was slow because Bogue, so this didn't last very long. She continued to perform convoy protection duties around the Indian Ocean until December 1944, when she was transferred back to the US Navy to serve as a ferry carrier. She effectively spent the rest of the war running between San Diego, Pearl Harbor, and Guam, transporting aircraft and war material for the US Pacific Fleet until she was returned to the UK at the end of August. She served as a troop ship for repatriation duty until she was returned to the US again in December of 1946. She was sold off as a cargo ship in 1947, serving until she was scrapped in late 1967. HMS Illustrious has an OnlyFans account. HMS Patroller was laid down at the end of November 1942, launched in May of 1943, and would be completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy in late October. Patroller ended up with a career trajectory very similar to Shaw's, and she never ended up making it to Vancouver for her Royal Navy overhaul. Instead, Patroller, along with her sister Rani, were pressed straight into ferry duty in the Pacific due to a shortage of transportation ships. As such, initially she was not given a full staff for her air wing, and the work done on her after her commissioning was very limited. At the end of November, she was sent down to San Francisco, loaded up with as many aircraft as she could carry, and made a mad dash across the Pacific. She was in Australia for Christmas and had arrived in Sri Lanka by mid-January 1944, only to turn around and sail all the fucking way back, ending up back in San Francisco in March. She was then placed under American Army Command to bring some planes to the US Army Air Force that was fighting in the islands. She made 2 ferry crossings doing this, before in May being actually placed under British command. Only then was she dry docked in Vancouver for her modifications and further trials until July, after which she continued her role as a ferry carrier. She sailed across the Atlantic 3 separate times between late July and late December, carrying loads of aircraft without incident. In January 1945, she was assigned to the Pacific for a few months, and then spent May doing another Atlantic run. In August, she was refitted to serve as a troop ship since the war was, fucking over, and she spent an entire year after completion repatriating troops from the Far East to their home countries. She was returned to the US in December of 1946, making her the last Lend-Lease carrier to be returned to her makers. She was sold off into merchant service in 1947, serving as a cargo ship until she was scrapped in 1974. I don't fucking know what to write, just pretend I said something funny here. HMS Premier was laid down in October of 1942, was launched in March of 1943, and completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy in early November of that year. I'm going insane. Can you tell I'm going insane? She was shuffled off to Vancouver for her Royal Navy refit and her workup, which would be completed by the end of January 1944. She set sail for the UK in February and arrived with a ferry load of aircraft at the end of March. She made 2 more cross-Atlantic ferry and convoy runs before spending the months of June and July in dockyard undergoing a brief refit before being assigned to the Western Approaches as an actual escort carrier. She did some ASW sweeps and exercises between September and November before being sent to the home fleet to go actually fight some people. In December, she was paired up with Trumpeter and Implacable, but she was kind of in the cuck chair, not gonna lie, and undertook 2 more missions where she laid mines and attacked some German shipping, although there, wasn't much German shipping to attack anymore, I'm gonna be real. She spent the new year 1945 being fixed up, and spent the rest of January with Trumpeter laying mines and other shenanigans. She was then paired with assorted other carriers in the Norway area, alternating between mine-laying operations and airstrikes on either the occasional German freighter or various targets in Norway. Her air wings could claim a few miscellaneous aircraft destroyed and 2 merchant ships sunk, which is pretty solid. Then in mid-April was assigned to Convoy JW-66 to the Soviet Union, alongside HMS Windex II. The trip there was uneventful, but the trip back saw the final convoy battle of World War II. The group lost 1 frigate, but managed to sink 2 U-boots, although Premier didn't get any tags herself, only spotting and harassing the occasional aircraft. Then, at the end of May, she was reserved and sent for deck landing training. She did this until February of 1946, after which she was sent across the Atlantic with a cargo full of disgruntled Canadians, before being returned to the United States in April. She was sold into merchant service as a passenger liner, eventually being scrapped in 1974. HMS Rani was the first ship on this list to be laid down in 1943 in the first few days of January. She was launched in June, with her completion and commissioning into the Royal Navy coming in November. Upon her commissioning, she was sent to Vancouver to have her Royal Navy modification work completed, which took until late January of 1944. The only thing of note that happened here was her having to go rescue her sister Nabob, which had run aground on a random sandbar. She was one of the carriers selected to immediately be sent to the Pacific for ferry duties, spending February to May running aircraft and transporting some troops. In September and October, she loaded up more aircraft and made trips to South Africa and then the UK, arriving in the Isles in early November. She spent a few months as a training carrier before, in late January 1945, being assigned to the American Pacific Fleet, again as a ferry ship. Her Atlantic crossing was hamstrung by shitty weather, which obliterated her hangar when a bunch of jeeps she had stored broke their ties and started ice skating. At one point, she apparently had a 28-degree roll in said shitty weather, which is both terrifying and miserably awful for the sailors. She made a few transit runs in the Pacific, then in May 1945 returned to the UK, where she was intended to be sent to the Pacific Fleet. But the war ended, so she was relegated to troop repatriation duties. Her troopship conversion was completed by November, and she spent December to November 1946 going on a bunch of trips around the world, shuffling people around. After her final trip, she was returned to the United States and was sold off in June of 1947, becoming a cargo ship and serving in that role until her scrapping in 1974. HMS Thane was laid down in mid-February 1943, was launched in July, and was completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy in mid-November 1943. She shacked up in Vancouver in December for her modifications, which took until June of 44, during which she also hosted a wedding for an officer, which is pretty cute. Her designated purpose was transportation, and her first run came in July and August, when she made a ferry trip across the United States and then to South Africa before returning to the US in September, picking up another load of aircraft and shipping off to the UK, where she arrived in mid-October. She then ran a convoy to Egypt in November, which she handed off to Battler, who took it off to the Pacific. Her next transit came in December, when she made the trip across the Atlantic again, where she was tasked with bringing a squadron of helicopters back to the UK for experimentation. Her return run also saw her load up a crazy 86 aircraft, and also saw her nearly sink in a storm, which sucks, but, what can you do? It's the Atlantic Ocean. She arrived safely mid-January, but on the 15th, she was immediately torpedoed in the Irish Sea by U-1172. 10 people died, and she took a shitload of damage that effectively crushed her ammo stores and severed her propeller from her engines, so she was dead in the water. Thankfully, the U-boot didn't stick around to confirm the kill, and Thane was towed to port without further losses. After several days of very careful defusing of all the shit in her hull that was bound to, explode, she was given a proper inspection and determined to be a complete constructive loss. She was decommissioned and left in port until the decision was made by the Americans to just scrap her, since they couldn't even sail to the United States. She would be scrapped in 1946. Oh, and also, Thane killed the Emperor. HMS Speaker was laid down in October 1942, launched in February 1943, and completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy in mid-November. She then went to Vancouver and did their fucking, thing, which would be completed in February of 1944, but she had to wait around a bit because there was a shortage of sailors at this point. Yeah, turns out when you build 1 Gorillion aircraft carriers, you run out of warm bodies pretty quick. She set sail for the UK in March and would arrive in early April. She would make 1 more Atlantic crossing as a ferry carrier before being drafted into the assault assault carrier role, and she spent May to September in dock being further refitted for this task. She sailed with Khedive and Slinger in January of 1945, arriving in India in early February, and then continued on to Australia to link up with the mustering Pacific Let's Fuck Up Japan death stack. Her assault carrier role would not be used, as she was assigned to the air train as a replenishment carrier, taking a role in the British portion of Operation Iceberg against Okinawa. However, at the very least, she did provide combat air patrol fairly frequently, although there were very, very few Japanese aircraft that still existed at this point, so they didn't do all that much. But otherwise, she just moved around aircraft for several months. Like, genuinely, there's so little to talk about here. Speaker commits tax fraud, I don't fucking know. Anyways, war ends, and she did a couple more replenishment missions until she had the opportunity to be the first Allied ship to sail into Tokyo Bay at peacetime readiness rather than action stations. So, that's a bit of a flex, I guess. Getting to mentally dominate Japan is always fun. Her purpose was humanitarian, taking care of and transporting released POWs and helping out civilians if they had the opportunity. Tokyo by this point was a smoldering ruin, so it was definitely needed. She continued this role in a few other places around Japan, as well as in the Philippines and Hong Kong. She spent November and December in Sydney for a quick fix-up, and then made another trip to Hong Kong in January of 1946, where she transported, among other things, a literal magician, a concert party, and 36,000 bottles of beer. Fucking party ship right there. She eventually returned to the UK in May and was returned to the US in July. She was sold off, became a cargo ship, and would be scrapped in 1973. HMS Killer Queen was laid down in March of 1943, launched in July of that year, and completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy in early December. She was sent to Vancouver, did the thing, and was all fine and dandy for early February 1944, which was followed by her running aground accidentally during her trials on the 26th, requiring her to be docked for 3 more weeks while it was fixed. She finally left Vancouver in April of 1944, arriving in the UK in late May. She made the Atlantic run that took detours down to Morocco and Sierra Leone, before she was refitted again from September to December. In January 1945, she was assigned to the Home Fleet for a while, conducting fleet exercises for 2 months before being sent to the Norway region. In March, she did some mine laying and hunted for merchant shipping, with her air wing shooting down a few Bf-109s in the process. In May, she partook in Operation Judgment, with her aircraft scoring a few hits on the various ships that were struck. Then, in the days after the war ended, she was assigned to escort the final convoy to the Soviet Union, JW-67, as there was a fear that not all U-boot captains would have received surrender orders yet. The passage was thankfully uneventful, so her aircraft mostly did some practice dogfights with each other to give the merchantmen a show. She returned at the end of May, briefly trialing some radar before being assigned to the Pacific Fleet. She loaded up on aircraft and was 1 day away from sailing when Japan surrendered, so she went precisely nowhere. Instead, she was converted for troop transport duty, undertaking several trips all over the place between November and September of 1946. She returned to the United States afterwards, stopping over in Canada for a bit on the way. She was sold off as a cargo freighter in mid-1947, serving in that role until she was scrapped in 1972. HMS Ruler is funny because she is actually the named ship of this class, but she was really late to the party of actually entering service. She was laid down in March of 1943, launched that August, and completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Ruler in late December. She did her time in Vancouver, fucking whatever shenanigans happened, and she set sail in late March for the UK, making a stopover in Virginia to collect aircraft, the works. She arrived in May and then turned around to go do the trip again for more aircraft, and then did it again. Beginning in November, she was docked up for a refit and flight training, as she had been assigned to the Pacific along with the bazillion other escort carriers. She arrived in Australia in March of 1945, then proceeding to make a few transit runs to various Royal Navy bases and undertaking some combat air patrol missions in the meantime. Then, in June, she partook in her only major combat encounter, a British raid on the Truk naval base called Operation Inmate. She was then returned to her replenishment duties for the remainder of the war. She was lucky enough to be one of the British ships to enter Tokyo Bay to oversee the formal surrender of Japan, with the objective of bringing POWs home. In October 1945, she was sent home because, again, nothing ever happens, god damn it. She was returned to the United States at the end of January 1946 and was sold for scrap later that year. Yep, nothing else to say really. HMS Belfast is secretly a Provo. HMS Arbiter was laid down in April of 1943, launched in September, and completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy on December 31st, right under the buzzer. She was shipped up to Vancouver to undergo her Royal Navy refit, which lasted until mid-March 1944. She partook her maiden voyage, beginning in April, which was delayed after she reached the Panama Canal because her engine shit the bed out of nowhere and she had to awkwardly be repaired before transiting to the Atlantic. Then, on her way to Virginia to pick up her cargo, salt water found its way into her boilers, so her engines broke again. again. As such, she didn't leave North America until June 6th, which was surely the most important event happening on that particular day, and she finally arrived in the UK in late June. She made 2 more cross-Atlantic ferry trips since the Allies needed a shitload of planes for the European War before being dry docked in early September for a refit since she was going to the Pacific. This was all finished up by January 1945, but her workup was defined by just 7 billion air accidents. Arbiter, I think, has the highest number of air accidents out of any carrier I've talked about so far, but I didn't bother to count, so that's pure conjecture on my part. She arrived in India in April, made a few quick transit runs, and then made her way to Australia for May. She then made several transit runs to the base at Manus in the Admiralty Islands, and then in July, she was assigned as a replenishment carrier. Following the end of the war in August, she made a few ferry trips between Hong Kong and Sydney before sailing for home in November. She was returned to the US in February of 1946 and was sold off as a cargo ship in 1947. She served in that role until her scrapping in 1973. Don't ask where HMS Arbiter was in 1999. HMS Raja was laid down in December of 1942, launched in May of 1943, and completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy in mid-January 1944. You're never gonna fucking guess what she did next. Went to Vancouver to be reworked to meet Royal Navy standards, did a bunch of training, and I saw Raja shoot a man in Reno just to watch him die on May 9th of 2011. Her work was finished in mid-March 1944, and after working up for a bit, she set off to the UK, but didn't arrive until July because she kept getting sidetracked in various American ports. She then spent a few weeks doing deck landing training. She lost multiple aircraft in like a week because of a string of mechanical failures that the plane suffered from, which is allowed to be funny because nobody died. In September, she loaded up on aircraft and shuffled off to Asia on a round trip, arriving in October and returning to the Isles by November just to be told that she was being pawned off to the Americans and she was going all the fucking way back, but this time going backwards around the world. She began transport operations on the San Diego Pearl Harbor Guam run in January and literally just did that without any incident until August. She returned to the UK in August and was promptly told that she was going back to the fucking Pacific to repatriate troops after a 2-month refit. Like, fuck's sake, make up y'all's minds. She made 3 round-trip voyages over the next year, again without incident, save for a week in August 1946 where her engine shit the bed in the middle of the Arabian Sea and she was left adrift while that was DCP'd. She left the UK for a final time in November and was returned to the Americans in early December. She was sold off as a cargo ship in 1947 and would be scrapped in 1975. HMS Smiter was laid down in May of 1943, was launched in September, and would be completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy in January of 1944. She was also sent to Vancouver for her Royal Navy refit, go figure. This would be completed by the 1st of April, and she worked up for a month before shipping off to the UK, where she arrived in mid-June after some miscellaneous journeys around the east coast of North America. Of course, she immediately turned around and went back to North America to collect more aircraft, returning to the Isles in mid-July. After this, she spent some time in dry dock for unspecified, quote, urgent defect rectification, but we can only assume her engines or something had exploded because that seems to be a theme with British escort carriers specifically. She also had her electrical system completely reworked because American construction standards bottom text. After this, though, she low-key did not do a lot. She spent December to May training pilots, and then was selected to go guess fucking where. Her intended purpose was as an actual carrier, i.e. she would be equipped for ASW patrols and airstrikes rather than just as a ferry, with her modifications taking until late June. She arrived in Sri Lanka in early August, performed maybe 5 sorties in total, and then the war ended. She spent the rest of the year as a ferry ship, transporting POWs and soldiers around Southeast Asia and performing several humanitarian missions to Singapore and Hong Kong to help put the place back together after 4 years of war. At the end of December, she was sent home, arriving back in the UK in February and being returned to the United States in March. She was sold off in January of 1947 to become a passenger cargo ship, serving in that role until 1967 when she ran aground off the Channel Islands and was written off, being scrapped that same year. Smiter runs a Christian fundamentalist cult in Appalachia. HMS Trouncer was laid down in February of 1943, launched in June of 1943, and completed and commissioned at the end of January 1944. We're getting to those kinds of ships that just don't do much simply because they appear so light. She was refitted in Vancouver and would be completed by mid-April. In early July, she set sail for Casablanca with a load of aircraft after making her way to the East Coast. This journey was completed without incident, and she returned to the US to take another load of aircraft to the UK. where she arrived in late August. She made 3 more Atlantic crossings before she was assigned to deck landing training in January of 1945, and then in March she was docked to be converted for assault carrier duties. This took just long enough for the war to end, and she wouldn't be out of dock until September. Admiralty basically went, fuck, well, we already did the Renos, might as well send her to East and hope she does something. At the end of September, just before transiting the Suez Canal, she was called in a panic by the refugee-filled passenger liner Empire Patrol, which had caught fire and was undergoing a chaotic evacuation. She was the first ship on the scene and made rescue efforts using the small boats she had for her use as an assault carrier. Tragically, 33 people died, including 14 children, but Trouncer was able to save over 400. She arrived in Sri Lanka in October and was almost immediately sent home because she wasn't needed, really, arriving back in the UK in December. She was returned to the United States in February 1946 and was sold off as a cargo ship the following year. She would be scrapped in 1973. Trouncer sold out humanity to the Combine Empire. Fellas, this is the last fucking ruler class. Holy shit, I never thought I would see the day. This has been a uniquely exhausting endeavor. Extra note is that Reaper was technically the last escort carrier commissioned by the Royal Navy. However, we still have 3 to talk about after this because I wanted to keep the Nirana class together, otherwise I would have to intersperse them amongst the late rulers and that would just be annoying. Anyways, HMS Reaper was laid down in June of 1943, launched in November, and would be commissioned into the Royal Navy in late February of 1944. Now, despite her awesome name, she wouldn't do very much reaping due to how late she entered the conflict. Her Royal Navy refit began at the end of March in Vancouver, completed in mid-May. She spent most of June undergoing her trials before shipping off to the UK by way of New York, where she arrived mid-August with a ferry load of aircraft. She then made several more trips between the UK, Gibraltar, and North America until December 9th of 1944 when she rammed a Dutch troop ship accidentally, which took a month to repair. After this, she was allocated to the American Pacific Fleet to briefly ferry some stuff for them. She set off for the Pacific in January of 1945, nearly rammed another ship while doing a mail transfer, and would formally enter Pacific operations in mid-February. She ferried shit. Yeah. Nothing of note. She was given back to the UK in late May and then spent June and July being repaired and refitted before being reassigned to the Pacific. But on the way, she would be the carrier tasked with carrying out Operation Seahorse, which was the plan to transport captured German equipment and take it places for study. Reaper was basically given every intact German airframe the Allies had found, which included 10 Me-262s which had been captured on airfields in literally pristine condition, as well as 3 German helicopter prototypes and a bunch of other aircraft. She left France in mid-July 1945 and delivered her cargo to New York for further analysis. She then went back to the Pacific but didn't arrive until mid-September, making a few trips to Hong Kong, Australia, Singapore, and New Zealand to repatriate soldiers and deliver humanitarian aid. She returned to the UK by the end of March 1946 and was given back to the US in May. They sold her off in 1947 as a cargo ship, and she was scrapped in 1967. Okay, so technically I lied. I told a fib and you all bought it. There are 2 more ruler-class ships, Nabob and Puncher, but they are a bit odd. They were commissioned in the Royal Navy and sailed under their flag, but they were for all intents and purposes operated by the Royal Canadian Navy and were staffed by overwhelmingly Canadian sailors. So, since I am petty and because it is way funnier, I am going to skip them for now and include them in the eventual video on Canadian carriers like I did with the Australian one back in Chapter 1. We finally arrived at something new, the Nirana class. After HMS activity was completed, the Admiralty made the decision to take over 3 more unfinished merchant hulls for conversion into escort carriers. They were similar to previous escort carrier designs, since if it ain't broke, don't fix it, but they did feature steel flight decks, which was a step up from the wooden decks of the American carriers. The 3 ships would be named for seaplane carriers from World War I, Nirana, Windex, and Campania. Obviously, the first ship in the class was HMS Nirana II. She was laid down in early November of 1941, but her construction was heavily delayed due to, a fucking world war. She was bought out by the Admiralty in July of 1942, and work began to turn her into a carrier. She was launched in May of 1943 and would be completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy in December of that year. She came to displace 14,275 tons fully loaded, make 17 knots, and carry up to 23 aircraft in some instances, but she usually carried around 18 to 20. She was initially paired up with HMS Activity to go hunt U-boots in the western approaches in January of 1944. war, and on her very first sortie, she was nearly murdered by U-592, but one of her escorts was able to catch it on sonar and sink it before anything bad happened. She would run convoys on both the North Atlantic and Gibraltar runs, effectively without incident save for some air accidents until October, when she was sent off to go escort Soviet convoy JW-61 with Tracker and her sister Windex II. The fact that 3 entire carriers were there meant that, save for 1 frigate damage, the convoy suffered 0 casualties, as the U-boots didn't even try to hit them very hard. She would then sail JW-62 with her other sister, Campania II, in December. Nairana's squadron shot down 3 German aircraft, but Campania claimed both sunk U-boots. She returned to the UK by late December and was allocated to a merchant ship raid in late January 1945, where she partook in the destruction of 4 merchant ships alongside Campania, after which the pair ran convoy JW-64 in February, where the 2 carriers shot down 14 German aircraft with 1 merchant ship lost. Her final operations with Home Fleet were a few shipping raids in mid-March, but these were largely uneventful for Nairana. She began a refit into a flag officer training carrier in April, returning to service in September of 1945, after the war was already over. She did training missions until December, after which she was decommissioned and loaned to the Royal Dutch Navy of all things, being renamed HNLMS Karel Doorman, the first Dutch aircraft carrier. She was only there for 2 years, and her only action of note was a few airstrikes against independence fighters in Indonesia before being returned to the Royal Navy in mid-1948 and given back to the original cargo line, who promptly reconverted her. She would be scrapped in 1971. The second of the Nairanas, Windex II, had a rather different career trajectory than her sister. Also of note is that the 3 ships of this class were all slightly different, since the ships were built by 3 different shipyards. The only thing this really affects is their final displacement and size, so it's not a huge deal, but it's still good to mention. Windex II was laid down in July of 1942 as a cargo ship, being bought out by the Royal Navy for conversion alongside her sisters. She would be launched in May of 1943 and completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy in December of that year. Her displacement came to 13,671 tons, and her other stats are basically identical. Her trials and training were marked by mechanical issues and a minor collision with HMS Pursuer in late January when she dragged anchor one time, requiring some repairs, but by March of 1944 she was ready to go. Her first deployment was ASW operations in the Western Approaches. These were actually pretty successful. On March 15th, her aircraft sank U-653 with the help of the escort group, which is chill. On the 24th, a swordfish crashed into her deck, caught fire, and exploded, punching a hole in the deck and forcing her back to port for repairs. She was back out in May for more ASW, where her aircraft split U-765 in half, but she suffered an insanely high attrition rate due to mechanical failures and shitty weather. Her next major operation was in August and September, escorting JW-59 to the Soviet Union with HMS Striker, where she sank 2 submarines, U-344 and U-354, with the convoy taking no losses. She then sailed JW-61 with Nairana in October, which you already know how that went, and then JW-63 in December and January 1945, which was relatively uneventful. She kind of falls off the record for a few months before reappearing in April of 1945 for JW-66 with Premier. The trip to Russia was uneventful. The trip back saw 2 U-boots sunk by escorts at the cost of 1 corvette sunk. Finally, she was assigned to the Pacific Fleet, doing a whole lot of nothing for a few months until the war ended. She served in repatriation roles in the Far East before returning to the UK and being sold back into merchant service in 1947. She would be scrapped in 1971. Fun fact, HMS Windex was sued for false advertising, lying about the toxicity of the chemicals in their cleaner, and price gouging based on the misleading labeling. Oh, wait, that actually happened. Hold on. What the fuck, Windex? And here it is. The final escort carrier. Holy fuck, I thought this day would never come. HMS Campania II started her life as a passenger liner, laid down in August of 1941, bought out in July of the following year, launched in June of 1943, and completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy in early February in 1944. Her other stats were the same, but her commission displacement came to 15,970 tons fully loaded. She worked up and underwent a lot of pilot training, after which she was assigned to the Western Approaches to escort convoys down to Freetown in West Africa. She ran 6 between May and September, after which she was reassigned to the northern run to the Soviet Union. Her first was JW-60 in mid-September with HMS Striker. The trip there was without incident. The trip back in October saw 2 merchantmen sunk and U-921 probably exploded at Campania's hands. Or, I guess, wings, In November, she sailed with the covering force of JW-61, which was uneventful save for a single shot-down German plane, after which she sailed JW-62 with Nirana in December, where Campania claimed 2 U-boots sunk by her air wing. She spent New Year 1945 in a shipyard undergoing repairs, and in the new year she was sorted with Nirana for the next few operations, which included mine laying and anti-shipping raids, as well as convoy JW-64, where again, the 2 carriers shot down 16 aircraft on the 2 legs of the trip. She was then split from her sister and sorted with Trumpeter for JW-65 in March of 1945, which suffered 2 merchantmen and a sloop lost, but was otherwise uneventful. Upon her return in April, she was allocated to serve as a training carrier since the germs were completely fucked by this point, which she did until early June when she smashed into a dock on her way out of port and was put up in repair for the rest of the war. This is where things get a tad different. She wasn't immediately demobilized and sold off. Instead, while in reserve, she was selected to be what was called a festival and exhibition ship, i.e. a traveling museum, which is so incredibly fucking cool. I wish we had more things like this. Like, come on, Iowa's seaworthy. She can sail around as a museum. Please, I don't want to travel to the United States right now. Can you please come, like, I don't know, fucking somewhere in Canada? Campania II in her festival arrangement was a crazy popular attraction, seeing tens of thousands of visitors in every town she passed through. She did a full year as this before being returned to the Navy and deconverted in early 1952. The Admiralty then decided, well, she can still float, so let's make her test nuclear weapons. She was selected as the flagship for Operation Hurricane, the first British nuclear bomb test in October of 1952. She carried all of the observation equipment, as well as helicopters for flyovers and rescue in the event something went bad. The bomb was detonated off of Montebello Island, off of Western Australia, inside the hull of a frigate, and Campania recorded everything, being only about 24 kilometers away from the blast. She returned to the UK in December with all sorts of scientific data, and was re-reserved for the last time. She would then be rather unceremoniously sold off for scrap in 1955. And there it is. Escort carriers done. Holy fucking shit, that was exhausting. Okay, well, while we're here, go get a drink of water, go for a walk or something, because we aren't even close to done, not by a fucking long shot. Okay, so these 3 ships are odd. They're not technically escort carriers, since they didn't officially serve in escort roles, but they're also not lumped in with the fleet carriers because they didn't serve the role of a fleet carrier. They are a mysterious third thing that is generally dubbed the aircraft maintenance carrier. The easiest way to describe them is, while fleet carriers were floating air fields, maintenance carriers were floating air bases. These ships were designed to operate in tandem with aircraft carrier fleets and provide maintenance, repairs, ammunition and fuel storage, and general transportation that improved the operational efficiency of other carriers, and would also be capable of handling ground-based aircraft in the event that there was a lack of proper aircraft facilities in their theater of deployment. They were a very niche concept, and the British only had 3, but they're interesting enough to warrant their own section before we get into the meat and potatoes of this video. Oh, yeah, we aren't even at the main fucking section yet, by the way. American carriers are going to actually kill me. Anyways, so back in grade 5 and 6, I played the shit out of a mobile game called Battle Nations. It was shut down over a decade ago, but it was absolutely a canon event in my childhood and was one of the things that foreshadowed my interest in military history that began a couple of years later. There was one specific unit in that game called the Unicorn Trooper, which looked like this. His gun is called the Corn Horn and shoots rainbows, by the way. Nothing really super special, but for whatever fucking reason, whenever the word unicorn comes up for literally anything, this little goblin is the first image that comes into my mind, even before the actual mythical creature itself. I say that to say this: if there are any artists in my audience, I am begging one of you to draw Azur Lane HMS Unicorn wearing a red Stahlhelm and wielding the corn horn. Anyways, HMS Unicorn emerged as a design in the late 1930s. She was interesting in that she was designed as a carrier, still capable of deck launches and joining in battle groups, but she was still envisioned as a ship that maintained aircraft as its primary function. The ship was to be about 70% hangar for this reason, with a double-decker setup that was large enough to accommodate every aircraft the British operated, including float planes. She also came strapped with catapults and even carried around a smaller boat that could be used to transit unflyable aircraft to and from the ship. She was laid down in June of 1939 at the Harland and Wolff shipyards, launched in November of 1941 due to the outbreak of World War II causing priorities to shift, and completed and commissioned in March of 1943. 4 years to build her was definitely kind of brutal, but they got there in the end. She came to displace 20,600 tons fully loaded, make 24 knots, and carry an air arm that changed with every mission due to her odd nature, but the number of operational aircraft was usually between 30 1930 and 36. Her first deployment came in June of 43, when she was essentially strapped to HMS Illustrious while her battle group launched a diversionary campaign in Norway to distract from the Sicily landings, while simultaneously trying to lure the Tirpitz out of her hiding hole for a nice quick bout of gang violence. After this, she was sent down to the Mediterranean, where she partook in one of her few offensive roles as part of Force V with Attacker, Battler, Stalker, and Hunter during Operation Avalanche in September. She did prove useful in her designed role here, being able to save a full complement of Seafires and bring them back to the UK to be repaired and sent back into the fight. After a brief refit, she was assigned to the East Indies Fleet, and Illustrious was made her semi-permanent handler. She spent the first 2 months of 1944 shuffling her way east, transporting some planes along the way. She was then effectively based in Sri Lanka as an aircraft training carrier from April to November, since there wasn't a whole lot of combat between the British and Japanese navies at this point. In November of 1944, she was sent to Durban in South Africa, where she was refitted to accommodate American aircraft types by receiving new equipment and tools, done with the anticipation of taking a more active role against Japan once Germany had been beaten into the ground. In January, she returned to Sri Lanka and then moved on to Australia to join with the mustering British fleet. She was assigned to aid with the Battle of Okinawa, aka Operation Iceberg, as a part of the naval air portion of the invasion, focusing on hitting air bases on nearby islands to prevent the Japanese from using them. In her intended role, for the first time, she performed her job brilliantly, servicing over 100 aircraft between March and May 1945, and allowing both the American and British fleets to keep up the pressure. She returned to Australia in June for servicing in preparation for operations against Japan proper, but counterpoint, Portable Sun, so instead, beginning in August, she served as a ferry ship between the UK and Australia. She spent a couple of years just existing before being reactivated in 1949 to go fuck around in Asia some more. A year later, Korean War, so guess who's going to Korea? She served in this war as a replenishment carrier, ferrying aircraft and supplies to Allied carriers as well as air bases in South Korea. She also transported British troops to the Korean War Zone a couple of times, most notably the Middlesex Regiment, one of the first British Army formations to see service in Korea. The same regiment would go on to adopt Unicorn as a token of their appreciation for the services of the ship. Swell lads, them. Her time in Korea was pretty much defined by her sailing between Singapore, Japan, and Korea 100 times, transporting war material, being refitted to carry early jet aircraft, although she was incapable of using them herself, and supporting other carriers in their operations. She went into combat herself only twice, but she played a major role in British naval efforts in the region, and would even be recognized by the Admiralty for her services. She eventually returned home in November of 1953 after the end of the war, where she was decommissioned again. There was talk of modernization to fully handle modern jet aircraft, but this was deemed too expensive to justify, and the British Navy was prioritizing the modernization of their fleet carriers, which was already proving to be expensive as fuck. She would sit in reserve until 1959, when she was sold for scrap in June. After the relative success of HMS Unicorn, the decision was made to fuck around a bit more. 2 hulls of the Colossus-class light fleet carriers that were under construction were picked out to be built with aircraft maintenance roles in mind. The first was HMS Pioneer. She was initially laid down in December of 1942, and the call to change her design came after she was launched in May of 1944. Her design was slightly different to Unicorn in that she was not designed to independently launch aircraft. In order to make room for all the workshops and machinery, her catapults were never installed, and her flight deck was obstructed by a bunch of shit. Instead, she was a dedicated maintenance carrier, and aircraft needed to be picked up by crane to be taken into the ship. She was formally commissioned into the Royal Navy in February of 1945, coming to displace 18,333 tons fully loaded, carry technically no aircraft, but she had hangar and deck space for roughly 20 to 30 aircraft at any one time. She was immediately sent to Australia at the end of March to join up with the British Pacific Fleet, and was then moved to the Admiralty Islands in late June, and while Unicorn would go off gallivanting to Okinawa, she remained down there for the remainder of the war. She would service 24 aircraft of varying size between June and August, and that's pretty much the end of her military career, so she just got up to side quests afterwards. Her first task in September was being a mobile workshop in Hong Kong, where she aided with the reconstruction of the city and its infrastructure. Then in December, she went back to Australia, where she spent the new year before being told to take 140 aircraft and dump them into the sea, since nobody wanted them and it was literally cheaper to destroy them than it would have been to recycle them. Her final task was to take £5 million sterling of gold bullion that was taken to Australia from the UK during the war and bring it back on her return journey. She arrived in the UK in the spring of 1947, after which she was placed into reserve. She would be rather unceremoniously scrapped in September of 1954. Pioneer has 39 DUI charges. The other Colossus class converted into one of these maintenance carriers was HMS Perseus. Her design was identical to Pioneer, so I won't repeat myself too much since everything I said in the previous paragraph applies here. Of note, however, is that she did even less than her sister due to the time frame of her construction. She was laid down in January of 1943 and launched in March of 1944, but she wouldn't be completed and commissioned until October of 1945, 2 months after the war had ended. After her completion, she sailed to Australia, arriving in December of 1945 to relieve Pioneer. She left in March of the next year and briefly served as an aircraft transport. She was placed in reserve in May, where she languished until 1950. She was then given new life, being strapped with an experimental steam catapult, which was groundbreaking technology at the time. She would make over 1,500 launches with this catapult, with many, of course, conducted by Eric Winkle Brown, because of fucking course he's here, why wouldn't he be? In 1952, her and Eric Brown even took a trip to the United States to show up this technology, and it would go on to see widespread adoption amongst the carrier nations of the world. In March of 1952, the catapult was removed and she was demoted to ferry ship, making several trips to the Far East carrying aircraft, supplies, and soldiers. In 1955, the Admiralty made plans to convert her into a submarine tender, but sweeping defense cuts in 1957 saw that plan kiboshed. She would be sold for scrap in May of 1958. Perseus shot JFK. This, of course, brings us to the fleet carrier. The big boys, the heavy hitters, and notably, the purpose-built. These are the ones you probably know about, so I'll just jump straight into it. Going into the 1930s, the Royal Navy had a problem. The carriers they already had were serviceable, but they were all beginning to show their ages. Not being purpose-built also meant they did not reach their full potentials when it came to air wing sizes, efficient use of space, or application of new technologies. Plans to build a new keel-up carrier with a theoretical 72 aircraft capacity had been in the works since 1924, but a series of budget cuts and economic crises meant that these were left in development hell. The plan was reworked several times, with the air wing being revised downwards to 60 and certain parts of her design being adjusted, such as the hangar being fully enclosed and her having 3 aircraft lifts, the first carrier in the world to have such a configuration. Eventually, in 1934, the British government finally earmarked the funds for such a carrier, and she turned out to be the most expensive warship ordered for the Royal Navy up to that point. She had to be revised downwards again to meet the Second Washington Naval Treaty to keep the ship within 23,000 tons at standard displacement, but otherwise construction went ahead. The new carrier was to be given a name fitting her size and planned role, a name that signified the power of the British royal family, a name with history. She was to be called Ark Royal II on this list. Ark Royal II was laid down on September 16th of 1935 and would be launched 2 years later in April. She spent another year fitting out and undergoing trials, eventually being commissioned on December 16th of 1938. She came to displace 22,353 tons standard, or 28,165 fully loaded, could make an impressive 31 knots, and could carry a practical maximum of around 60 aircraft, but she rarely sailed with more than 40 to 50. She was initially assigned to the Mediterranean fleet for the first months of 1939, but the international situation was rapidly going to shit, so she was recalled to the home islands until World War II broke out. In September, the U-boots came out in force and massacred a bunch of ships, so Ark Royal was deployed to the western approaches in a hunter-killer group with a bunch of destroyers. On September 14th, she would assist in scoring the first U-boat kill of the war after U-39 tried to attack her and got caught out of position. However, Courageous was sunk 3 days later, and Ark Royal was promptly recalled to port. Later in the month, she got into a skirmish with some German planes, shooting down a few and suffering from a very near miss. Joseph Goebbels made a big deal over sinking Ark Royal because the German pilots claimed to hit, but the ship was very much still floating, which embarrassed him a fair bit. Ark Royal would then score another indirect kill assist on Admiral Graf Spee. After she was pushed into the harbor at Montevideo by the cruisers Ajax, Achilles, and Exeter after the Battle of the River Plate, a fake communique saying Ark Royal was coming down to kick their asses pushed the Spee's captain to scuttle her. She did still sail down to help the crippled Exeter get home, which was nice. Her next assignment was Norway, where she dueled with German aircraft and shot down over 24 of them during April and May, until she was assigned to the evacuation from Narvik at the end of May. She then sailed down to the Mediterranean and obliterated the French fleet at Mers el Kabir in June, before skirmishing with the Italians in various places and escorting several convoys to Malta. In early 1941, she partook in Operation Excess, which was a series of raids on Italian ports to scare the Spanish into not joining the war. And then, in May, she was sent to hunt the Bismarck. Bismarck. After she sank the Hood, Churchill rang up Ark Royal and Force H and went, "Hey, find this fucker and sink it. All hands on deck, kill it now." Ark Royal Squadron would be the first to spot the ship, and after initially airstriking HMS Sheffield due to a miscommunication, her swordfish were able to hit Bismarck with 3 torpedoes, one of which knocked out her rudder. Functionally dead in the water, Bismarck was promptly jumped by every ship in the Royal Navy. She returned to convoy escort duties until the fateful November 14th, when U-81 got lucky, hitting her with a single torpedo off the coast of Gibraltar after penetrating her screen. Her damage control proved very inefficient, and she had no backup power supply, meaning the potentially savable ship went down after multiple hours of slow sinking. Remarkably, her crew only saw a singular loss, a fella named Edward Mitchell, although her captain would be court-martialed for his failures in damage control, and future British carriers would be better equipped to handle potentially non-lethal hits. The Admiralty figured as early as 1936 that the main problem with the Ark Royal design and all flush-deck carriers produced prior was a lack of armor. This meant that the ship could potentially be knocked out by smaller-scale attacks from, say, a submarine or a dive bomber, which would be very bad. A carrier would need ways to defend itself and its aircraft and remain in the fight, and an escort could only get you so far. So the next carrier design that was produced in 1936 was to make a trade-off, a much smaller offensive air arm, cut basically in half down to 33 to 36, in exchange for an armored enclosed hangar and flight deck, along with generally improved defensive capabilities in the form of greater AA armament. This design was to be pioneering for this reason, the world's first armored aircraft carriers. How many times have I said world's first in this video? Take a shot every time and find out. Actually, please do not do that, you will die. She was also slated to carry a catapult and 2 elevators, and was able to carry a portion of her air wing on the flight deck. These carriers would come to be known as the Illustrious class, named for their lead ship, HMS Illustrious the First. Illustrious the First was laid down on April 27th of 1937. Her construction was delayed due to a lack of armored plates because the King George V's were voring every steel plate in the country, and she would only be launched in April of 1939. She would be commissioned into the Royal Navy after the war had already begun in May of 1940, and was immediately evacuated to Bermuda to finish her trials due to the fall of France. She came to displace 23,369 tons, make 30 knots, and carried an average of 36 aircraft. She was sent to the Mediterranean for her first deployment in August to destroy all those who called themselves Italian, becoming the flagship of Force H in the Western Mediterranean. She started off with a bang, shooting down several bombers and sinking 2 Italian destroyers, one with an airdropped naval mine, in the first couple months of her career, along with escorting several convoys to Malta and Alexandria. One of her biggest claims to fame, however, came the night of November 11th, 1940, when she launched 21 Swordfish against the Italian naval base at Taranto. This raid effectively crippled the Italian Navy in the Mediterranean. Illustrious's Swordfish crippled 3 battleships, with Conte de Cavour never returning to service, and Littorio and Duello running aground to prevent total sinking and being knocked out for months, and also damaged several other ships in the process at the cost of a mere 2 Swordfish lost.
Italians, behead Italians, roundhouse kick Italians.
She conducted a few more small raids into the new year before on January 11th of 1941 she was caught out of position by a horde of angry German bees, hitting her with a dozen bombs in various places, including 2 that managed to penetrate her deck and unarmored aircraft lifts, causing severe damage. 126 men would be killed, but Illustrious did not sink. She was then attacked several more times in January while repairing in Malta, being hit another half-dozen times with more bombs, but again she endured. The armor saved her life, and the lives of hundreds of sailors. She was sent to South Africa and then to the United States, with repairs taking until October of 1941. But of course, while sailing for the UK, she ran into Formidable, literally, and required further repairs. She finally re-entered service in March of 1942, partaking in several actions in the Indian Ocean, notably covering the invasion of Madagascar. She returned to the Isles in January of 1943, undergoing a refit before being attached to HMS Unicorn and engaging in operations, including a feigned attack on Norway in July, and then Operation Avalanche against Salerno in Italy in August. In 1944, she spent basically the entire year in the Indian Ocean, pilot training and raiding some Japanese bases on assorted islands. She destroyed in the ballpark of 40 aircraft between January and November, being sorted with the likes of USS Saratoga and HMS Indomitable and Indefatigable. She was also responsible for demolishing several refineries in the East Indies, crippling the Japanese war effort. In February 1945, she was docked for repairs before being assigned to Operation Iceberg as a part of the Okinawa invasion in April. She was damaged in a near miss with with a kamikaze plane a few days in and was withdrawn to the UK for repairs. With the war ending soon after, she was refitted as a trial carrier, taking a central role in jet aircraft experimentation, as well as performing various side quests in the post-war period, including various naval exercises, several expositions where tens of thousands of people came aboard, and testing out the new optical landing systems that became standard on Royal Navy carriers going forward. Alas, the unsinkable Illustrious that survived like 20 German bombs did not survive budget cuts. She made her last landings in December of 1954 and would be sold for scrap in late 1956, ending her illustrious career on a bit of a downer. HMS Formidable was the second ship of the Illustrious class. She was laid down in June of 1937 and would launch herself on August 17th of 1939. Before her ceremony, the wooden berth she was on collapsed and she slid into the sea, killing one person and injuring 20 more. Absolute mad lass. She wouldn't be commissioned until November 24th of 1940, a week after her sister mauled the Italians at Taranto. Her stat sheet is literally identical to her sister, so I won't repeat myself here. In January 1941, she replaced Illustrious in the Mediterranean, escorting convoys until March, when an Italian fleet was spotted off the southern coast of Greece. Admiral Andrew Eater of Italians Cunningham brought Formidable out, along with the battleships Valiant, Barham, and Warspite, because of fucking course she's here, why wouldn't she be, and a fleet of destroyers and cruisers for the Battle of Cape Matapan. Formidable was able to cripple the Vittorio Veneto and sent the battleship running home, after which she sailed in the line formation between Valiant and Barham, and, at a mere 3.5 kilometers from the Italian fleet, became one of the only instances of an aircraft carrier attacking another ship with her surface guns in naval history. Her small little secondary battery of 110mm cannons opening fire with the three battleships and scoring at least one hit. Her captain, undoubtedly screaming, "Drive me closer, I want to hit them with my sword," while preparing his crew for a boarding action, was promptly told by Admiral Cunningham the Fun Police to get the fuck out of the line. David Beatty was creaming his fucking jorts in his grave. The British lost a singular swordfish bomber. The Italians were slaughtered, losing 3 heavy cruisers, 2 destroyers, and 2,303 sailors. She spent the rest of the year raiding air bases, shooting down aircraft, and providing air cover for the evacuation from Greece. In May, she was hit with 2 bombs when a rogue German squadron got through her air defense bubble, but again, she didn't sink, and only 12 people were killed. Armor turned out to be a crazy good investment. Repairs took a while, and were extended when she ran into Illustrious, again literally, being completed in February of 1942. She was then assigned to the Western Indian Ocean, also partaking in the invasion of Madagascar, as well as several abortive attempts to intercept Japanese air raids. She was back in the UK for September and partook in Operation Torch in November, where she shot down several planes and even sank U-331, avenging HMS Barham. Then, in mid-1943, she partook in the invasion of Sicily, posted around the island in case the Italian Navy came down and tried something, which it didn't. She arrived in the UK in October for a refit that lasted until June of 1944, bumping her air wing to upwards of 56, after which she was sent to Norway, attacking the Tirpitz 4 separate times over the next 3 months. She was then exiled to the Far East again, replacing Illustrious during Iceberg in April of 1945. In early May, she was hit directly by a kamikaze plane, putting a hole in her flight deck and sending shrapnel through enough of the ship to force her withdrawal, but not before she was hit by a second kamikaze plane a few days later that wiped out her air wing. Repairs were completed in Sydney by the end of June, and she went on to raid the Japanese East Coast, sinking multiple ships and blowing some shit up. After the war, she served as a repatriation ship before returning to the UK in February of 1947. She was placed in reserve, after which her wartime damage was deemed to be too great to continue service, leading to her being sold for scrap in early 1953. HMS Victorious was the third ship of the Illustrious class. Side note, can I just say that the British have the best ship names and it's not even close? Victorious is a name with so much aura, it is impossible to quantify. Like, it's not even HMS Victory, no, it's Victorious. As in, we have already won, what are you gonna do about it? It's so fucking baller. Anyways, Victorious was laid down in May of 1937, launched in September of 1939 after the war had started, and completed and commissioned into the Royal Navy in May of 1941. Now, upon her commissioning, she was informed that, while the war had just begun, the Germans had the biggest ship that had the biggest guns, with guns as big as steers and shells as big as trees. So, for Victorious's very first operation, she was told to go sink the Bismarck to the bottom of the sea. The carrier had only half of her air wing, and her pilots were barely trained, but she formed warmed up with King George V and Repulse, and her Swordfish managed to score a hit on the battleship with a torpedo. Her air wing did get lost since her homing beacon failed, and as such they had to ditch, but it was a symbolic victory, as Bismarck was promptly jumped and beaten to death with hammers. After this, she escorted convoys, and in July took a brief detour to go help out the Soviets in northern Finland, the following month escorting the first Allied convoy to the Soviet Union. She proceeded to escort half a dozen more of these convoys, including the fated PQ-17 in June and July of 1942, from which she was detached after fears of a German surface fleet attack spooked command. The convoy was scattered and promptly slaughtered, but Victorious didn't really have an opportunity to do a whole lot because of this detachment. In August 1942, she was sent to the Med for Operation Pedestal, during which Victorious herself was only lightly damaged. Then in November, she helped out with Operation Torch. At the end of the year, she was actually loaned to the United States, as they had a singular fleet carrier in the Pacific and they were absolutely crying for more while the Essexes got built and Enterprise was repaired. She was given an Americanized refit in January and February of 1943 and spent the year sailing as the colloquially dubbed USS Robin, being glued to Saratoga and conducting ASW sweeps and covering several island invasions. She returned to the UK in September and was refitted until March of 1944. She sailed JW-58 to Russia at the end of March and then was assigned to Operation Tungsten with the Gang of Escorts, and spent several months afterwards raiding German shipping in the Norway area. Then, in July, she was sent to the Indian Ocean to reinforce positions over there. She launched like a dozen airstrikes on various things for the rest of the year, taking breaks for escort duties and a quick refit in September. Afterwards, she basically spent the rest of the war raiding Japanese air bases and refineries with impunity as the empire disintegrated, as well as undertaking operations around Okinawa. She was hit by kamikaze aircraft twice in early May, but armor too strong, so she shrugged them off. She was initially intended to take part in the invasion of Japan, but face the sun, so she was instead sent home and ran repatriation missions for about a year. Victorious would actually serve well into the Cold War, undergoing a fucking 8-year refit beginning in 1950, with her design changing about a dozen times, and she was effectively rebuilt from the ground up with a bigger hull, a longer flight deck, with an angle, completely new machinery, and all sorts of fancy bullshit, coming to displace over 35,000 tons. She was recommissioned in 1960 and didn't end up doing much, but she got to play the role of herself in the movie Sink the Bismarck, which is really funny because, angled flight deck. She did a lot of sailing around, provided military support to a couple of Commonwealth countries, and even landed an F-4 Phantom, which is cool as fuck. In 1967, after the defense budget was cut, she would be decommissioned, despite the fact that, hundreds of millions were pumped into that long-ass refit, and she would be sold off in 1969 to be scrapped. HMS Indomitable was the fourth and final ship of the Illustrious class, but she had a slightly different design than the rest of her class. She lost some of her armor, but in exchange she was given a full second hangar, allowing her to carry a considerably increased air wing. This did, of course, mean her construction took a bit longer than her sisters, as she was redesigned halfway through. She was laid down in November of 1937, launched in March of 1940, and would be completed and commissioned in October of 1941. She came to displace 23,000 tons on the dot, could make 30 knots, and could carry a maximum of 48 aircraft. She made her first voyage in November to the West Indies, initially planned to link up with Force Z, the force sent to the East Indies to shore up defenses. However, she hit a coral reef in Jamaica and ran aground, so she ended up not being there to help out when Force Z got jumped by Japanese aircraft and destroyed in its entirety. She arrived to Sri Lanka in late January 1942, ferrying aircraft to bases in the East Indies until those all fell, with her being held back in India for safety while the fleet regrouped. She attempted to find the Japanese strike force in April during the Indian Ocean raid, but no dice, so she ended up going back and blowing up Madagascar to make up for it. She was sent back to Europe after this, partaking in Operation Pedestal in August, during which she was hit with 2 bombs and a few near misses by German aircraft. These were damaging, but again, armored carrier, so Perry build, and she was able to shrug it off, able to sail under her own power with little loss of speed for repairs. These were completed in February 1943, after which she was sent back to the Med to prepare for the invasion of Italy. In July, she would end up being torpedoed by an Italian bomber, but again, she walked it off, although she needed to be repaired in the United States, which took until April of 1944. After this, she was reassigned to the Far East with Victorious, and basically ran all of the same operations against Japanese bases in the East Indies. Then, during Okinawa operations on May 4th, she was also hit with a kamikaze plane, which didn't do a whole lot of damage, but it still happened. In the waning hours of the war, she was the leader of the task force that reoccupied Hong Kong in August of 1945, with sporadic combat continuing until the end of the month. She returned to the UK Bay in November and got up to a few side quests, like transporting the National Rugby League team to Australia in 1946, then undergoing a 3-year refit from 1947 to 1950. She was made the flagship of the home fleet for the last few years of her life. She was initially slated for a full jet capability conversion like Victorious, but due to Victorious devouring quadruple her expected budget, this was cancelled. She suffered a fire and explosion in 1943, the area of which was never repaired and instead covered over with concrete, because I guess the Royal Navy was Russia maxing at this point, and she was placed in reserve in October of that year, to be sold off for scrap in 1955. The Implacable class was essentially a super illustrious. Initially, the class was supposed to have 6 ships, but the final pair, Implacable and Indefatigable, were modified to the point that they were their own class of ships. The fundamental design was the same, but the Implacables made the same trade-off that the Indomitable did, a larger air wing at the cost of less armor, as well as having better internal machinery. However, those were designed in 1938, and by this point the British were saying fuck it to the naval treaties. So this trade-off wasn't really a trade-off because these ships were going to be 10,000 tons heavier than the Illustrious class. They also had the double hangar setup from Indomitable and, of course, the armor. HMS Implacable was laid down in February of 1939 and suffered from development hell and repeated reworks. She would be launched in December 42 and would be completed and commissioned only in May of 1944. She came to displace 32,630 tons fully loaded, could make 32.5 knots, and could carry 48 aircraft in the hangars. But if you stored stuff on the deck, she could crank the air wing up to a genuinely fucking terrifying 81 aircraft. However, despite these crazy good specs, the fact that she arrived so late meant she didn't really do all that much. She was assigned to the home fleet and worked up for several months before her first mission came about in October of 1944 when she kept an eye on Tirpitz and raided some German bases in Norway for Operation Athletic, sinking 2 freighters, 2 minesweepers, a Seaplane Carrier, U-1060, and a patrol ship. Gaming. She spent November chasing merchant ships, sinking a few freighters, and laying some mines going into December. In December, she went for a refit of her AA, which took until March 1945, when she was shipped off to the Far East. She arrived in Australia in June, too late to partake in Iceberg, and as such, she took out all of her anger on the, by this point, functionally irrelevant Japanese base at Truk Atoll, which was attacked by Implacable and her dedicated aircraft caddy HMS Ruler as a literal training exercise. You know the Japanese are fucked when the British are using their actual military bases during wartime as a training mission. In July, she was assigned to attack mainland Japan, bombing several inland targets as well as the carrier Kaio, which she crippled to the point of uselessness, so we'll give her the credit for that. She would sink a large number of small ships and destroyed tons of rail cars and buildings. She left in early August in preparation for the planned invasion of the islands, but the Japanese surrendered a few days later. She served as a repatriation ship for a few months and hung around the Pacific until May. She took a peacetime role as a training carrier and hosted the GOAT Eric Winkle Brown in June and July 1948, who performed the first landing of the Gloucester Meteor jet fighter on a carrier. She did a lot of exercising, a lot of sailing around, and taking trips to various parts of the empire in response to colonial crises, and was initially planned for an extensive modernization, but as we have seen, the British had $0, so this was cancelled. As such, she was kind of just decommissioned in 1954 and would be sold for scrap the next year. HMS Indefatigable was the sister of Implacable and the final ship of the class. She was laid down in November of 1939, launched in December of 1942, and commissioned in December of 1943, although she wouldn't be fully completed until May of 1944, and as such, she did technically enter service after her sister. During her trials, our good friend Eric Winkle Brown would land a de Havilland Mosquito on the ship, the first twin-engined aircraft to land on a British carrier. Her first mission in July of 1944 was an unsuccessful attack on the Tirpitz, because it is physically impossible to bully her too much. If you think you have bullied Tirpitz enough, you need to bomb her one more time for good measure. She hit the ship a few times, including smashing a 1,600-pound bomb through her deck, but it failed to detonate, so the bloody ship lived on. She raided targets in Norway until September, after which she was refitted for 2 months and then assigned to the Pacific, where she arrived in mid-December 1945. She undertook several raids on Japanese bases and refineries on Sumatra alongside Indomitable in January and February, doing sizable damage to Japan's oil production. In late March, she was assigned to Iceberg, bombing Japanese airfields to cover the Okinawa invasion. On April 1st, she became the first British warship to be struck by a kamikaze plane, after one got through her screen and smashed into her island. The bomb it was carrying was thankfully a dud, so only 21 people died, and she was able to continue operations unabated until late May when Iceberg had concluded, after which she returned to Australia for repairs. After these were done in July, she sortied with her sister Implacable, raiding the Japanese mainland like the world's most devastating pirates. After the war ended, Indefatigable was one of these ships used to occupy Japan, then in mid-September was sent down for a refit in Australia, which lasted until November. She was interesting in that all of the cities she stopped in, she was open to public visitation, so she became a bit of a traveling attraction as she made her way home. She was slated for repatriation duties in March of 1946, making several trips all over the place and completing these duties in January of 1947. She was initially decommissioned, but was recommissioned in 1950 to serve as a training carrier. Before her and her sister were both decommissioned in 1954 as a cost-cutting measure. She was sold for scrap in 1956. The Colossus class is where the design of British fleet carriers diverges quite sharply. The Colossi were a product of the war more than anything else. The Admiralty realized that these armored carriers, taking literal years to build, would not cut it, so in 1942, plans were made for what would come to be called the light fleet carriers. Lighter, faster, and notably unarmored, but bigger than the escort carriers that were also being built, and designed in such a way that they could be built in civilian shipyards. They were meant to be something fast and cheap that could get more hulls in the water faster. They planned to initially build 16 of these fuckers just to prove a point, so there are quite a few to talk about. However, they were universally far too late to do anything really significant combat-wise. The first was, of course, HMS Colossus. She was laid down in June of 1942, launched in September of 1943, and completed and commissioned in December of 1944. Yeah, so much for speedy construction, but it was undoubtedly an improvement over the 5-year average of the armored carriers. She came to displace 13,500 tons standard, or a little over 18,000 fully loaded, could make 25 knots, and could carry a hard maximum of 52 aircraft, but she very rarely had this many on her. She left the Isles in March of 1945 for the Far East, where she arrived in June, spending the next 2 months working up and sailing to Australia. She was on her way to an operation when the war ended, so she was instead sent to Hong Kong and then Shanghai, along with a couple of her sisters, to occupy the cities a few days later. In the closing months of 1945, she did some repatriation missions before being refitted in South Africa between January and March 1946, after which she did some exercising before she was loaned to France as the Automache for 5 years, but they would buy her out completely in 1951. Here she made 4 separate deployments to Indochina, as well as the Eastern Mediterranean during the Suez Crisis. She was refitted to have an angled flight deck in 1957, along with some other miscellaneous upgrades, and she was given a suite of helicopters to augment her ASW capabilities. She spent a decade as a training carrier before being fully converted into a helicopter carrier in 1968. She would be decommissioned in 1974 and scrapped in Toulon in 1978. HMS Vengeance was laid down in November of 1942, launched in February 1944, and completed and commissioned on January 15th of 1945. She did her trials in the Mediterranean and then was shipped off to the Far East, arriving in Australia in mid-July. She was originally slated to attack Truk, but the war ended first, and instead was sent to Hong Kong. Vengeance was actually the ship where the Japanese surrender of Hong Kong was signed and formalized, which is pretty neat. After this, she served as a flagship and barrack ship for the British occupation forces in Japan before leaving for the UK in July 1946. She kind of just dicked around for a few years doing training missions as well as a series of tests in the Arctic to determine how well ships reacted to these environments. In 1952, with the understanding that 2 other British-built carriers, the Majestic and Terrible, which will not be covered in this video because I can farm more content that way, were having some issues entering Australian service, the Royal Australian Navy requested to be loaned HMS Vengeance for a few years to keep themselves busy. She underwent a few small modifications and was pressed into service as HMAS Vengeance. She again mostly did training and diplomatic missions and the occasional escort run when QE2 came to town, and was returned to the Royal Navy once the 2 other carriers were up and running in 1956. She was not reactivated and instead put up for sale. The buyer? Why, Brazil, of course. Fucking obviously. She spent 1957 to 1960 being refitted for jet aircraft operation, including getting an angled flight deck, an entirely rebuilt superstructure, and advanced launching and landing equipment. She was commissioned into the Brazilian Navy as the Minas Gerais in December of 1960. Her career here was uneventful, but kind of funny in a few ways. For one, the Brazilian government was overthrown by the army a couple of years later, and the army, being the army, forbid the creation of a naval air force to prevent the Navy from potentially getting any funny ideas. As such, Minas Gerais was simultaneously operated by the Navy, which ran the helicopters, and the Air Force, which ran the fixed-wing aircraft. She spent most of her time as an ASW carrier and primarily undertook training exercises and diplomatic voyages. In the 1990s, she saw herself sustained by cannibalizing parts from her sister, the Argentine 25 de Mayo, and the 2 navies actually had very close cooperation in the field of naval aviation. However, Minas Gerais was also getting very old by this point, and she was increasingly unable to operate modern carrier aircraft, so she would eventually be decommissioned in May of 2001. At the time, she was the oldest carrier on Earth that was still in service, and the last of the World War II carriers to still serve. She was put up for sale, and an association of British museums tried to gather the money to have her turned into a museum and preserved, but in a genuine tragedy that makes me so sad they couldn't raise enough. In 2003, she was listed on fucking eBay at one point, but they hate fun, so that didn't last long. Unable to find a buyer, she would just be scrapped in 2004. Like I said, a genuine tragedy. I wish she was preserved so much. HMS Venerable was laid down in early December 1942, was launched in December of 1943, and commissioned into the Royal Navy on January 17th of 1945, 2 days after her sister Vengeance. She worked up for 2 months before she was linked up with her sisters, Colossus and Vengeance, and shipped off to the Far East in March. She didn't arrive in Australia until July because they made a stopover in the Mediterranean to do some exercises, and as such she did precisely nothing until the end of the war. Her first action was taking control of Hong Kong with the gang, during which she had to blow up a few Japanese kamikaze boats before the Japanese in the city formally surrendered on September 2nd. She was on repatriation duty until January 1946 when she was given a brief refit, after which she continued transportation and repatriation. She would return to the UK in March of 1947, and despite only being in service for less than 3 years by this point, she was actually marked for disposal because, again, we can't pay for all this shit no more. Well, lucky for them, the Dutch Navy had just returned HMS Nirana to them, and they offered to buy out the Venerable. She was commissioned as the HNLMS Karel Doorman II in May of 1948. They gave her a couple of major refits to adapt to new technology throughout her life, and as such, she became quite a unique ship. However, because the Cold War was a time of relative peace, she didn't do very much other than sailing around and undertaking fleet exercises and training, as per usual. The exception is the early 1960s, when the Netherlands nearly went to war with Indonesia again over their continued occupation of Western New Guinea. Doorman was on the front lines, sent to Indonesia as a show of force, and the crisis got so bad that Indonesia was about a month away from throwing anti-ship missiles at her in preparation for a full-scale invasion in 1962, but the crisis was diffused by an agreement before that occurred. She would suffer a major boiler room fire in 1968, and it was determined that the cost of repair was too great, and so she was sold again to Argentina as the 25 de Mayo in 1969. She underwent a few refits before invading the fucking Falklands in 1982 and nearly being sunk by a British submarine, which is a crazy fucking sentence to use on a Royal Navy carrier. She ended up being confined to port after the sinking of General Belgrano, which likely saved her from a very unfortunate fratricide. She started being refitted in 1988, but Argentine economy bottom text, so that dragged until 1996 when they said they would be scrapping her, which she was in 2000. Which, might I add, insane service life for her, bravo. HMS Glory was laid down in August of 1942, launched in November of 1943, and completed and commissioned in April of 1945. By the time she arrived in East Asia, the war was already over, so she kinda just sailed to Rabaul to reoccupy the base from the Japanese in early September, and then helped do the same in Hong Kong. She sailed around the Pacific, making repatriation runs, returning to the UK in 1947. Her first and only actual combat deployment came in 1951 as a part of the British deployment to Korea. Her primary purpose here was airstrikes and miscellaneous fighter patrols, which she performed fairly well. There is very little information I could find about her, unfortunately. In 1954, she would be converted into a troop carrier and a ferry ship, and was also tasked with fucking around with helicopters. However, the nefarious British defense budget of the 1950s meant she was decommissioned in 1956 and would be sold for scrap in 1961. Fuck it, fun fact time. Formidable stole my fucking wallet at gunpoint. HMS Ocean was laid down in November of 1942, launched in July of 1944, and completed and commissioned in August of 1945, a full 7 days before the war ended. Interestingly, the Australians had offered to buy her while under construction, and the Admiralty approved it, but the Aussies backed out due to chronic manpower shortages. She would be the final aircraft carrier to be commissioned by the Royal Navy in the Second World War. As such, she spent most of her time pilot training and undertaking various experimental trials. One such trial was in December of 1945, when none other than Eric Winkle Brown made the world's first jet aircraft landing on an aircraft carrier in a de Havilland Vampire on the ship. This fucking guy. Main character of a video not focusing on people is wild. She did some troop shipping in the Mediterranean, which was interrupted in October 1946 when Britain nearly went to war with Albania. Ocean was sent to go help out 2 British destroyers that had hit mines in the Corfu Channel that were allegedly laid by the Yugoslav Navy at the request of the Albanian government. These mines were not supposed to be there since the channel had already been swept, the sweeping of which saw the Albanians actually fire on British warships. Ocean aided the crippled destroyers, and the following month in November formed the head of a whole-ass battle fleet sent to sweep the mines and destroy Albania as a concept if they tried anything funny. The Albanians backed down. She was deployed to the Korean War in 1952 and 53, where her Hawker Sea Furies shot down a whole-ass MiG-15, making Ocean the only carrier in history to have her air wing shoot down a jet with a turboprop. Her final major deployment was during the Suez Crisis in 1956, where she served as the base and transport ship for the British commando force that attacked Port Said, and also holds the distinction of assisting in the first large-scale helicopter-based military assault. Her final notable action came in 1957, when she pissed off the Soviets by visiting Helsinki. Balls of tungsten, that one. She would then suffer epic budget cuts, being reserved in 1958 and sold for scrap in 1962. HMS Warrior was yet another Colossus class, with a rather unique history to boot. She was laid down in December of 1942 and launched in May of 1944, but she was initially not commissioned into the Royal Navy. She was originally supposed to be named HMS Brave, but the currently existing HMS Warrior, a 40-gun ironclad commissioned in 1861, temporarily gave up her name to the carrier so her legacy could be carried on, in the meantime being called Oil Fuel Hulk C-77. Really rolls off the tongue. She did very little until Canada rocked up and asked to take a couple of carriers on loan, which the Brits said yeah to, so in January of 1946 she would be commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy as HMCS Warrior. She arrived in Canada in March, and she served with the RCN for 2 years. However, since the initial plan was to rush Warrior out for service in Southeast Asia, she was not fitted with heating, which might cause some problems when you're in fucking Canada, eh? So when the option came through to take Magnificent, who will also not be talked about here instead, she was sent back, returning to Royal Navy service in March of 1948. Her primary service consisted of transporting troops to Korea in 1950, undergoing a few refits and deck training missions, and Operation Grapple, which was the first British H-bomb test in the Pacific, where she served as the command and research ship. She was decommissioned in early 1958 and promptly sold to Argentina. She was renamed Independencia and commissioned into their navy in 1959. She really didn't do much in Argentine service, other than pilot training and various cruises, and handling Argentina's emerging jet force. After they acquired the Venerable, Independencia would be slowly decommissioned and would be sold for scrap in 1971. HMS Theseus was laid down in January of 1943, launched in July of 1944, and completed and commissioned in February of 1946, long after the war had ended. Her workup and trials commenced rather leisurely since, war over, and in 1947 she was assigned as the flagship of the Far Eastern aircraft carriers. She returned to the UK after about a year and a half for a quick refit, and then was sent back to the East after the Korean War began in 1950. Her focus was on airstrikes and air interception missions, and for the 2 years she spent in the Korean War, she launched literally thousands of missions against infrastructure vehicles and troops. There was one specific incident in December of 1950 where a column of Chinese vehicles trapped in snow were descended upon and effectively annihilated by her air wing. She did lose numerous aircraft to accidents, enemy fire, and an incident of friendly fire, but otherwise her deployment was very successful. Her tour of duty ended in mid-1952 when she was replaced by HMS Glory and was sent back to the UK. She was flagship of the home fleet for a while and spent a lot of time doing exercises and pilot training until the Suez Crisis in 1956, where she joined up with HMS Ocean as an ad hoc invasion ship. She used her helicopters to transport commandos to Port Said and wounded away from the region, but otherwise she played a relatively small role. She was decommissioned in 1957 due to budget cuts and would be sold for scrap in 1962. Fun fact, the voices won't go away. Seriously, can someone make them stop? HMS Triumph was laid down in January of 1943, launched in October of 1944, and would be completed and commissioned in May of 1946. Her career is, again, not particularly eventful. She spent a while doing training missions under the auspices of the home fleet, and in July of 1946, she actually visited the port of Kronstadt in the Soviet Union to partake in the Navy Day celebrations on behalf of Britain, which is pretty cool. Upon her return in August, she rammed a barge in the Thames, requiring repairs and a quick refit. From January 1947 to March 1949, she was in the Mediterranean, and in 1950, she was assigned to the Far East. She was in Hong Kong when the news came through that the Korean War had begun, so she was one of the first British forces on the scene. She would actually join up with the USS Valley Forge for the first naval airstrikes of the war on July 3rd, hitting a few air bases in North Korea. She did have a friendly fire incident later that month due to her sea fires looking suspiciously like Yak 9s, and she lost a few aircraft to both accidents and combat, but she was very successful otherwise, even destroying 2 gunboats along with a massive amount of rolling stock. She was also assigned to provide air cover for the Incheon landings, playing a pivotal role in suppressing North Korean air power and spotting for ships bombarding the area. Her role in the conflict ended in September 1950 when Theseus arrived to relieve her, and she returned to the UK to serve as a cadet training ship. In 1952, she became the first British carrier to have an angled flight deck and was the ship they tested them out on. In 1955, she nearly crashed into the harbor in Leningrad due to a gale, after which she was sent to a dockyard for a 10-fucking-year conversion into a heavy repair ship in 1956. She served in this role until 1975 when she was decommissioned, and in 1981 she was sold for scrap. Okay, so the Majestic class is a little funky. We aren't going to talk about HMS Majestic in this video because she became HMAS Melbourne and never saw British service. We will also not talk about Terrible, who became HMAS Sydney, Magnificent, who went to Canada, or Powerful, who became HMCS Bonaventure. So that just leaves Hercules and Leviathan to represent the Majestic class of carriers. Except no, because Hercules was commissioned into the Indian Navy as the Vikrant, and Leviathan was cancelled after being launched in 1945 and was never completed, her hull being scrapped in 1968. But I'll still quickly go over the general design. The Majestics were the second set of the Colossus run, and were basically just improved Colossi. You see, naval and air technology had advanced to the point of near unrecognizability in less than a decade, and it was recognized that more Colossi were going to be obsolete the second they hit the water. You gotta remember, the Royal Navy still used the fucking swordfish until basically the end of the war, and now little Stringbag was sharing deck space with jet fighters. 1942 designs just weren't gonna cut it anymore. The Majestics were to be given upgraded arresting gear and catapults to handle better aircraft, as well as reinforced flight decks and massively upgraded AA suite. She also came with modern electronics and replenishment at sea capabilities. The cost was to be an extra 1,500 tons of displacement, which wouldn't have been too bad. All 6 ships were launched, but none were completed, all of them being sold off to other countries and completed to designs that were revised even further away from the Colossi. Gotta love technological development ruining all of that hard work. While the Colossi were the light carrier project, the British still saw the value of the heavier fleet carriers, as ships like Illustrious and Formidable had very strong showings during the early years of the war. As such, in tandem with the Colossi was developed the Audacious class, sometimes referred to as the Eagle class due to the changed name of her lead ship. They were envisioned initially as essentially upgunned Implacables in a lot of ways. As initially designed, the ships were to displace 32,500 tons, making use of that extra weight to dramatically increase the deck armor and the armor overall, with better designed plates building off the experience of their armored carriers getting smashed with bombs repeatedly. The air wing was also jumped to the 70 to 80 range, and her hangars were enlarged due to the need to accommodate the increasing size of naval aircraft. 4 of these ships were initially ordered, but 2 would be cancelled, and of the 2 completed, Eagle and Ark Royal III, both deviated from the original design due to being completed after the war. The first ship of the class was initially named Audacious, but was renamed to Eagle II after the third ship, named Eagle, was cancelled. She was laid down in October of 1942, but her production was very slow and meandering due to the need to finish other material, for the fucking ongoing World War. As such, she would not be launched before the war ended, and budgets got cut, slowing her down even more. Eagle's hull was relatively complete by mid-1946, so the decision was made to not completely scrap her and complete her pretty close to a revised 1945 design. She would be launched in March of 1946 and initially sat in limbo for a while before this decision was made. She would finally be completed in October of 1951, being commissioned formally in March of 1952. In this configuration, she reached nearly 47,000 tons fully loaded, could make 31 knots, and could carry 60 aircraft. She was capable of launching and landing early jets in her slightly revised configuration, but she was very outdated by the time she was commissioned. She was in service for less than 2 years before she underwent a major refit from June 1954 to February 1955, which included giving her an angled flight deck since she was completed with a straight one and those just didn't cut it anymore. Her first actual combat mission came in 1956 when she was sent to go do imperialism in Egypt as a part of the Suez Crisis, taking a direct attacking role by using her air wing to bomb Egyptian airfields and shit. Beginning in 1959, she was given her second major refit, which included a completely new superstructure, more deck armor, her AA guns being replaced with missiles, and new catapults, which was all completed in May of 1964. This brought her displacement to 54,100 tons fully loaded, making her the largest carrier in the Royal Navy. Even with this, though, she was still a World War II-era ship in an aging World War II-era hull, with a lot of impossible-to-replace World War II-era machinery, and Victorious's decade-long, bazillion-dollar rebuild was still fresh in everyone's minds. She also struggled to keep up with the rapidly developing aviation, and the Admiralty Admiralty figured that she would need near constant refits to stay relevant. And of course, Cold War British military budget cuts come for everyone eventually. So, while she continued to partake in exercises and diplomatic voyages, she was kind of just allowed to deteriorate in a sense. She would be formally decommissioned in 1972 and was effectively cannibalized for spare parts to keep her sister Ark Royal III running. Once she ran out of parts, she was sold for scrap in 1978. HMS Ark Royal III was the second ship of the Audacious class and was given the name to commemorate the ship sunk in 1941. She was laid down in May of 1943 and work was stopped when her hull was around half finished, not even being launched before the war ended. While Eagle was to be converted relatively close to original design, Ark Royal III was instead extensively modified due to her less advanced stage of construction. For one, she was purpose-built with the Eagle upgrade package from the get-go, with the angled flight deck, more advanced catapults, a larger island, and a mirror landing system. She was actually the first aircraft carrier in the world to be built with the angled flight deck rather than having it added later. Her displacement came to 43,750 tons fully loaded, she could make 31.5 knots, and could carry 50 aircraft. She was launched in May of 1950, exactly 7 years to the day from her laying down, and she would be completed and commissioned by February of 1955. This was because her sea trials were put on hold for fucking ever. Upon her commissioning, she was one of the most modern and advanced carriers in the world. It's too bad that she did jack diddly shit fucking all. She was supposed to go to Egypt in 1956, but counterpoint, Curse of Ra, broken propeller. Most of her career was spent doing Cold War Navy things, NATO exercises, pilot training, testing new technologies like VTOL aircraft, more specifically the Sea Harrier, and being refitted a bunch. In 1965, she partook in the naval blockade of oil and weapon shipments to Rhodesia, and then underwent a refit from 1967 to 1970, which allowed her to launch and recover their shiny new Phantoms with the help of a more angled deck, new catapults, new arrestor wires, backblast plates, and more, bringing her displacement up to nearly 55,000 tons fully loaded, with a reduced complement of 40-ish aircraft. She was also equipped with an American carrier approach radar, the only ship in the Royal Navy to do so. In November 1970, during a NATO exercise, she bulldozed a Soviet destroyer that had been shadowing her, so that was a nice little diplomatic incident, and in 1972, she waved a stick at Guatemala as Belize was gearing up for independence. She also partook in 2 separate television shows, which is interesting as well, and she was an absolute media darling in general, in many ways being the face of the Royal Navy. A ship to show that old Great Britain still had that heart of oak in her yet. She was able to keep trucking thanks to parts from her sister, but her aging hull and unupdated machinery and wiring meant she became increasingly prone to breakdowns as the decade went on. She would be decommissioned in February of 1979, and with that, the Royal Navy did not have fixed-wing naval aviation capabilities for the first time since 1913. This state of affairs was brief, with the next set of carriers entering service soon after, but it really sends a message about the absolute state of the British Navy by this point. She was also the final British carrier to be Catobar capable, and all carriers going forward could only launch VTOL aircraft or helicopters. She was sold for scrap in 1980 and was parked right next to her sister, who herself was in the late stages of her breakdown. It is said that many of her crew made their way to the yard to pay respects to the ship, with many breaking down in tears at the sight of her. In many ways, Ark Royal III was really the last of the Empire's ships, the last great carrier to uphold the legacy of the pioneering, record-setting Royal Navy. This had the effect of really pissing the general public off, as simply discarding such a symbol without care made people upset with the state of the once vaunted British Armed Forces. But of course, that didn't change things. With her scrapping, the sun had effectively set. The days of naval supremacy and global power projection were over. Or were they? Eagle III and Africa were the other 2 ships of the Audacious class. They were originally ordered in 1942 and 43 respectively, but due to all the other things going on, they didn't get very far. Eagle III, who gave her name to Audacious after World War II, was laid down in April of 1944, but work progressed slowly and was effectively suspended going into 1945. She would be fully cancelled at 23% completion in January of 1946 and was scrapped on the slipway. Africa was never even laid down and was initially reordered as a Malta class, but these 2 went nowhere. She would be cancelled in October of 1945. The Centaur class of carriers were the final evolution of the Colossus class, and themselves were sort of super majestics in a way. They were designed in 1943 as a more broad overhaul of the design, since the majestics they had already planned out could not be properly rigged to carry and play with the larger and larger aircraft that were entering production. The plan was to build 4 of them by 1936 to work alongside the planned Malta class, and final plans were approved in mid-1944. Unlike the previous 2 iterations, the Centaurs were to be generally larger to accommodate these bigger aircraft. They would also be armored, have a larger armament and more modern and well-designed systems, and come with catapults and all sorts of fancy bullshit. They were slated for 27,000 tons fully loaded and an air wing of 42, although this air wing crept down as jets got more more advanced. In 1947, the design was revised again to essentially make the ships less aggressively utilitarian since everyone was not killing each other anymore, as well as alter the island to make it a bit bigger. The only ship of the group completed to the original design was HMS Centaur. She was laid down in May of 1944, but by the end of the war, she saw her launch delayed until 1947. She would be completed and commissioned in September of 1953, and although she was completed to the initial design, this did not last long, as less than 3 months later, she was given an angled flight deck. She actually joined the fleet in April of 1954, and then did not a lot because Cold War. Lots of exercises and port visits. In May of 1956, she was selected for a limited modernization, since the Admiralty had fucked up their timelines, and there would have been a 5-year period with basically no naval air power, and this took the form of some miscellaneous improvements as well as new catapults. She did more exercises, and in 1959 joined Victorious in acting in the film Sink the Bismarck, herself portraying Ark Royal II, and launching restored swordfish from her deck. She then spent a while in the Pacific and Indian Oceans for old time's sake, sailing 81,000 nautical miles and conducting 7,800 separate aircraft launches, so you can't say they weren't getting their money's worth. She got refitted again during the winter of 1960-61, and then was sent down to Kuwait as a show of force against Iraq, which was threatening to eat the recently independent country. She would be in Kuwait a few more times over the next couple of years because the Iraqis just fucking refused to let the issue rest, and she also did some humanitarian work in Kenya and a few other places on her travels. She returned to the UK in mid-1962 and was in and out of dock because one of her steam pipes exploded while on exercise, and she did more assorted tasks before being reassigned to the Indian Ocean. In early 1964, she took charge of crushing a mutiny in Tanzania with some Royal Marine commandos, then went and airstriked some rebels in Aden, and briefly fought with Indonesia during their attempted invasion of Malaysia. She was eventually decommissioned in September of 1965, after which she was briefly used as an accommodation ship before being sold off for scrap in 1972. HMS Albion was another Centaur laid down in March of 1944, with work very briefly being suspended due to the end of the war, with her being launched in May of 1947. 2 years later, she was being towed to her final fitting out when she rammed a cargo ship, sinking it and nearly sinking herself, causing her to be laid up for even longer while the damage was fixed up. She was completed and commissioned in May of 1954, a full 3 years late, but she got there in the end. Her design was modified from Centaur. She was built with an angled flight deck rather than a straight one, and she had a few other tweaks, but they didn't affect her spec sheet all that much. She was initially assigned to the Mediterranean, her first major operation coming during the Suez Crisis in 1956, attacking several Egyptian airfields. She sailed around for a few years until 1961 when she was converted into a commando carrier, effectively a carrier that had a formation of Marines and commandos that could attack positions from helicopters. She joined her sister in Borneo for those skirmishes with the Indonesians I mentioned in the mid-1960s and spent most of the rest of the decade undertaking various exercises and visiting Singapore, India, Australia, and Brunei several times. She also helped British citizens evacuate from Bangladesh during the Third Indo-Pakistani War of 1971. Her final deployment was to Canada in late 1972, where she did some more exercises and visited Montreal before she returned to the UK for the final time. She was decommissioned in early 1973 and was initially planned to be converted into a North Sea heavy lift vessel for oil exploration, but this went nowhere and she was instead scrapped later that year. My brain is oatmeal. Can you tell my brain is oatmeal? Or are you also feeling the oatmeal? I'm going fucking insane over here. How the fuck does Drakenfell do this at the frequency that he does? This guy is a fucking Terminator. Holy shit. HMS Bulwark would be the third Centaur to enter service. Her design was similar to Albion in that she was built with an angled flight deck in mind rather than rigged with one later. She was the last of the set to be laid down in May of 1945, with her construction again being delayed by the end of the war. She would be launched in June of 1948 but wouldn't be commissioned until November 1954, due to the post-war British government shifting its priorities 100 times during the demobilization phase. Her first action came at the Suez Crisis in 1956, flying over 600 sorties against Egyptian positions and airfields. 2 years later, while exercising in the Gulf of Oman, 2 tankers collided and exploded a few dozen kilometers from her, so she made her way over to rescue the crews that had abandoned ship and used her helicopters to put out the fires. Later in 1958, she was chosen for conversion into a commando carrier, which took until 1960, and she was immediately shipped off to Kuwait to go help scare the Iraqis into, not fucking invading them. After this, she was sent to Malaysia with the British formation to go seal club Indonesia for trying to invade them. She spent a few more years in the Far East, earning the nickname the Rusty Bee, which is unbelievably cute and I love it. She was then sent to the North Sea and then the Mediterranean to round out the decade doing exercises and shit. She was refitted at the end of 1969, and in 1970 the ship attended Expo 70 in Japan. In January of 1973 she was in Charleston, South Carolina, and was caught in the worst snowstorm they had in 80 years, so she was stuck there for a little bit. In 1976, after a few more years of uneventful sailing around, she was decommissioned. She was initially offered to Peru, but this deal fell through, and instead the Admiralty decided to keep her around a little longer with a quick refit, with the intent of keeping her in service long enough for HMS Invincible to enter the field. She was actually decommissioned in March of 1981, and by this point she had suffered a fire and damaged boilers that went unrepaired. She was initially planned to be reactivated for the Falklands War, but her structure had deteriorated by so much that they said fuck that noise and just sent her to a scrapyard in 1984. This is literally 1984, SMH my head. The final Centaur to be commissioned was the Hermes IV. It'll make sense in a minute. Hermes IV was initially laid down as the HMS Elephant, but her name would be changed during her construction to Hermes. She was laid down in June of 1944 and then proceeded to sit on the slipway for nearly a decade. As a consequence, her design differed wildly from her sisters, having a full angled flight deck, side lifts, steam catapults, fully reworked electrical and power plant systems, a totally redesigned interior, and a larger island. She came to displace 29,200 tons fully loaded as a result, and came with a smaller air wing due to being designed to operate with the most modern jets. She would be launched in February of 1953 and would finally be completed and commissioned in November of 1959. Her operational career was slightly more eventful than her sisters. In 1962, a helicopter of hers carrying 2 members of parliament crashed in a freak accident, killing one of them. Then, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, she was loaded up with a series of bombs called Redbeards, which were tactical nuclear weapons. Yeah, that tracks. Fun fact, all British naval strike bombers were nuclear capable. All of them. Jesus fucking Christ. Hermes had a load of nuclear weapons and was parked in the Mediterranean with explicit orders to drop bombs on Sevastopol and other targets in Crimea if the missile crisis went hot. Yeah, we were that close. She did some exercising for a few years and was briefly offered to Australia after the naval budget got cut, but no dice, so she just sat in the Indian Ocean until 1970. After the Defense White Paper, which ended fixed-wing carrier operations, the determination was made to convert her to only take Stovall aircraft and double as a commando carrier, and she spent 1971 to 1973 being refitted. After this, she was further modified to operate as an ASW carrier, and her air wing became like 90% helicopters. She received a final refit in 1981, where she was given a cope slope so she could operate Sea Harriers. She was initially slated for decommissioning in 1982, but suddenly Argentinians, so she was made flagship of the British fleet that was sent down to retake the Falklands. She was also, notably, equipped with air-dropped nuclear depth charges, which is just, what the fuck? What the entire fuck? What could the Argentinians possibly do to require nuclear depth charges? Anyways, her and the other carrier that could be scrambled, HMS Invincible, went from literal maintenance readiness to sailing for the South Atlantic in less than 3 days, which was crazy turnaround time. Hermes' air wing capacity was exceeded by several airframes as the Royal Navy scrambled every Harrier they could. Her air wing did very well in the conflict. The British carriers were able to maintain air parity and were able to launch Marines using their helicopter fleets, providing air support in the process. Hermes' most notable engagement was serving as the assault ship during the SAS raid on the Pebble Island Air Base, which crippled Argentina's tactical air power on the islands. The performance literally saved the Royal Navy, as the force was staring down the barrel of budget cuts that would have seen the end of carrier operations completely. After her return, she was given a refit, partaking in more exercises before she was reserved in 1984. She was offered to Australia again, but was rejected again. She was bound for the scrapyard until an unexpected hero, the Republic of India, made an offer for her. In 1986, she was refitted and recommissioned as the INS Virat. She was given a very extensive refit to basically all of her aging systems, and she served as the flagship of the Indian Navy for nearly 30 years. By 2015, due to the ship being 60 years old by that point, the decision was made to decommission her. There were attempts to have her preserved as a museum, but they didn't go anywhere, unfortunately. She was formally decommissioned in 2017, and beginning in 2021, she underwent a long and arduous scrapping process. So, the Centaurs were A, originally an 8-ship run, and B, not even called the Centaurs. 4 of them were actually built, while the other 4 were cancelled. The original name ship of the class was HMS Hermes, the 3rd, but after her cancelling, the name was instead given to HMS Hermes, the 4th. The other 3 were to be named Arrogant, Monmouth, and Polyphemus. All 4 ships were ordered in 1943, deferred in early 1944, and cancelled completely in October of 1945, after it was determined that they didn't really need any more carriers at this point, considering how many they had in service. None of the 4 had any work even started on them, so it was just a matter of telling the shipyards to stop. As such, there really isn't a whole lot to say here. Finally, we have the Malta class. These were technically the last of the British World War II carrier designs. While the British were in the process of designing the Colossus class for mass-produced carriers, they simultaneously wanted something big and bold to serve as the primary striking arm of the Royal Navy. Naval aviation was rapidly advancing, aircraft were getting bigger and more powerful, and doctrine had evolved so much during the war that new carrier designs would be required when looking into the future. What came to be known as the Malta class went through about half a dozen designs between July 1943 and October of 1945. The plans that were eventually settled on called for essentially a British Midway class. Unenclosed hangar to allow air wings to warm up in the hangar and allow for quicker strike cycling, no deck armor, double island superstructure, hydraulic catapults, and a huge hangar, along with a massive AA armament and a large suite of electronics and radar systems, building on wartime experience. She was still to be armored, although much less so due to her open deck design. Depending on the specific design, the ships would have displaced around 58,000 tons fully loaded, been able to make 33 knots, and carry between 80 and 108 aircraft. Can I call them a flock of aircraft? Or is there some other word? I don't know, like a murder? Crows use murder, why can't carriers? Her murder of aircraft could have been 108, which is a lot of fucking planes. Before the designs were even finalized, 4 ships were ordered in July of 1943, Malta, Africa, Gibraltar, and New Zealand. However, as the war developed into 1944, everyone realized that these ships were really not needed. Final design was submitted in April of 1945, but was never approved, and as such, none of the 4 ships were laid down before the Admiralty canceled the project at the end of 1945. See, even the British had paper ships. Fellas, we have arrived at the final fucking stage of this video, the post-World War II carrier designs. The British were somewhat behind on carrier development in the early Cold War. They had about 1,000 of them that were either completed or under construction by the end of the war, and many of these, like the Centaurs and the Audaciouses, were modern enough to take a modernization very well. As such, their carrier program primarily focused on keeping the carriers they did have in tip-top shape and modernized. However, going into the 1960s, some of their older fleet carriers, like Victorious, were beginning to show their age. Not only that, but after World War II, the British had no fucking money, and their empire spent the late 40s to the late 60s collapsing, the attempted military prevention of which devoured money at a genuinely unsustainable rate. As such, military budgets were slashed repeatedly in the 1950s, and after Victorious's modernization on its own nearly bankrupted the Royal Navy, the British carrier fleet saw service lives flatly reduced across the board, and numerous hulls were sent to the scrapyard in quick succession. These ships still did theoretically need to be replaced as technology advanced, but this was done at a much slower rate than what had been done at the peak of Britain's naval power. She just wasn't the empire she was in the past. But of course, the old dog could still be taught new tricks, and they did get a few out the door in the late Cold War and modern period. They generally took a quality over quantity approach, and they are all, by any measure, very good ships. So, let's do this. One final time for the British Empire. We begin with Project CVA-01, a wonderful paper ship that will undoubtedly make every true Brexit geezer yearn for the days of British naval power, real or imagined. CVA-01 was a project, or a series of projects, born in 1962 out of the desire for large fleet carriers that could carry air wings of both Buccaneers and Phantoms, which were the new shiny planes on the block. Originally, the Admiralty looked at a 68,000-ton design that was based on the Forrestal's over in the States, but this was rejected because money, and instead a 54,000-ton design received approval. This was accepted much to the lamentation of the Royal Air Force, which was busy gaslighting the Treasury into their focus on a long-range strike-based air force that could be flown from the air bases Britain still had around the world, but this too would eventually be canned, so actually nobody wins Lamau bottom text. Anyways, the design called for an air wing of 50, which included a small helicopter and ASW force, while also being able to host a battalion of Royal Marines, plus vehicles for assault roles if needed. They would also be able to make 28 knots, carry 4 steam catapults, and would have been built with a lot of technical systems that were cutting edge for the time, including advanced radar and Sea Dart AA missiles. The plan was approved in 1963, originally for 4 carriers, but this was reduced to 1 by the time the plan was brought to Parliament. However, the following year there was an election, and the new government took to cutting defense spending, with the RAF being little shitheads and attacking the Navy in an attempt to keep its own shit from getting cut as well. Gotta love inter-service rivalry. The design lingered around until 1966, when Harold Wilson's government published the Defense White Paper, which not only canceled the CVE-01 project, but suspended all large fleet carrier development going forward until the 2000s. The Invincibles were the first British carriers to be designed and constructed after World War II, which is crazy to say in retrospect. They are an odd little duck of a class. They're classed as light aircraft carriers, so they do count for this video, but they have a lot in common with helicopter carriers in their general size and role. Now, the Invincibles have their origins in a design for a guided missile cruiser from the late 1950s and early 60s, designed as a ship to complement the planned Project CVA-01 heavy carriers. However, after those were cancelled, there was suddenly the need to have more carriers of at least some kind, as the rest of their carrier fleet was ancient by this point and were progressively heading to the scrapyard. They weren't allowed to be pure Catobar fixed wing because epic budget cuts and roll compression, so instead, carriers that were designed with STOVL and VSTOL in mind were conjured up. As such, the cruiser design was reworked into the Russian-style aircraft carrying cruiser type bullshit designation, and after VSTOL was proven a possibility with the testing of the Harrier, they expanded the design into a through-deck cruiser. She underwent more reworks through the 60s and 70s as budgets came and went until the decision was made to just drop all the extra missiles and shit and just make them proper carriers. The class were to displace in the ballpark of 20,000 tons and were to come equipped with cope slopes in place of catapults for operating the Sea Harriers that would now be attached to the ship. And they would have a sizable helicopter arm for ASW work. They would also come with all the bells and whistles of modern systems with the express purpose of counteracting Soviet submarine threats and the potential threat of their own aircraft carrying cruisers. The final designs were approved in 1973 and the orders went out and weren't actually cancelled this time. The first ship of this class was, of course, named Invincible. Very humble designation there. She was laid down in July of 1973, launched in May of 1977, and would be completed and commissioned in July of 1980. Their actual displacement seems to change with every source I look at, but the three clocked in at no more than 22,000 tons fully loaded, could make 28 knots, and could carry 22 aircraft, mixed between jets and helicopters. Invincible formally joined the fleet in 1981 after her trials were completed, but because of a certain wicked bitch named Margaret Thatcher slashing the defense budget again, she was offered for sale to Australia literally a year later. A deal that everyone had signed off on before Argentina did the funny, and it was kiboshed because suddenly they needed carriers. Invincible joined up with Hermes to lead the Let's Go Kick the Fuck Out of Argentina task force and immediately made her way south, which was plastered all over global media as a show of force. On the way, she nearly shot down a civilian airliner that had been confused for an Argentinian aircraft. Her role in the Falklands was primarily as both a strike carrier and an assault ship, hosting Marines and equipment. Her aircraft also dueled with the Argentinian ones to try and keep the skies clear for the rest of the force, and they very much took their prize, shooting down 24 aircraft of varying type. Imagine being an Argentine conscript and being told that your enemy has a warship literally named Invincible. Like, fuck, the aura advantage alone definitely gave the Brits an edge. Argentina launched a failed attack on her at the end of May with the literal last Exocet missile the country had, but the missile was shot down and as such, no damage. Oh, and she also had the nuclear depth charges on board because I fucking love causing ecological disasters for military gain. She's also heavily implied to have been carrying nuclear weapons for most of her career, which is always a nice thought. After the end of the war, the government finally saw the usage of these carriers and the sale to the Australians was cancelled. And after Hermes was sold, she became the flagship of the Royal Navy. After the events of the Falklands, she was refitted, her lingering missiles were removed in exchange for CIWS, and she got a few other miscellaneous improvements as well. Her next combat operation was the Yugoslav Wars in the 90s, enforcing the no-fly zone over the Western Balkans and carrying out strikes against the Serb troops in Bosnia. Later in the 90s, she went back to the region to support the NATO intervention against the government in response to the Kosovo crisis as well. She then continued her career with her most prestigious deployment of them all, appearing on an episode of Top Gear in 2003, where the gang shot a fucking Jaguar into the Atlantic Ocean while racing a Harrier, which is based as fuck. 2 years later, she would be decommissioned, where she sat in limbo, being gradually stripped for parts until 2010, when she was put up for sale. She would be scrapped in 2011. Illustrious II was the second ship of the Invincible class and was actually built to the same specs and design, unlike previous classes of carrier. She was laid down in October of 1976 and would be launched in October of 1978. The Argentinians did the thing while she was still fitting out, and as such, her later stages of production were rushed quite heavily, and she would be commissioned while at sea on the way to the Falklands in June of 1982. The war ended pretty quickly, however, so she didn't see action and didn't arrive on the scene until things had calmed down. That said, she was kept on station in the Falklands for a few months while an airfield was built just in case the Argentinians came back. She didn't do much for the rest of the 1980s other than do exercises and visit various countries to project power. She received the same refit her sister received, removing the sea darts and improving her launching capabilities, and in 1986 her gearbox fucking exploded, which required further repairs, but otherwise the 80s were chill. The following decade, she mostly followed her sister around. She partook in the NATO missions over Yugoslavia in both 1995 and 1999, and chilled in the Persian Gulf to keep Iraq from doing anything funny in the late 90s. In 2000, she would spearhead a big-ass task force to go back up the British intervention forces in Sierra Leone, which was in the middle of a brutal civil war, and a big-ass aircraft carrier is a good way to project power in such a situation. She missed Afghanistan 2001 by a few weeks because she was rotated out of the Middle East before Enduring Freedom kicked off. She underwent a couple of refits and a lot of exercising and visits afterwards, and I know I sound like a broken record here, but there isn't much else warships do in the modern day during peacetime. Her journeys in 2008 were recorded for posterity as a part of a documentary, which is pretty cool, and she attended a few events and was visited by thousands of people as a sort of display ship. In 2011, she was assigned to a helicopter carrier role as her Harriers were retired, and the main British helicopter landing carrier, HMS Ocean, was undergoing a refit of her own. This lasted until mid-2014, when she was finally withdrawn from service and decommissioned, the last of her class to be so. The Royal Navy tried their best to preserve the ship, but it was tragically found to be economically unviable, and instead she was sold off for scrap in 2016. God damn it, capitalism. Ark Royal IV was the third and final Invincible class carrier. Again, all of her specs were essentially the same, since again, she was actually completed to plan. The only slight changes were a steeper cope slope to allow for heavier aircraft to launch and some slight technical modifications here and there. She was initially meant to be named Indomitable, but the general public was so pissy over Ark Royal III being scrapped that they elected to resurrect the name one final time. She was laid down in December of 1978, launched in June of 1981, and would be completed and commissioned by November of 1985. As with most of these modern carriers, she did a lot of exercising and foreign visits, because why have a warship if you can't sail it around? Her first combat engagement came in 1993, where she was a part of the intervention force in Yugoslavia, conducting a few airstrikes and supporting operations of UN troops. She underwent a refit in the late 90s, which saw her missiles removed, and then in 2003 she was the only British carrier to partake in Iraq 03. This deployment was filmed for a documentary, and she only brought helicopters. The main thing of note is a major accident that occurred where two of her helicopters ran into each other mid-air, killing 7 people. Between 2004 and 2008, she went through 2 separate refits, and in late 2007, she was made the flagship of the Royal Navy with the retirement of her sister Illustrious. In 2010, she was actually utilized in a civilian transportation role after a big-ass Icelandic volcano blew up and effectively suspended most air travel in the Isles for a while. It was announced that she would be decommissioned later that year, which caused controversy again because she was named Ark Royal, and after 4 carriers bearing the most prestigious name in the Royal Navy, people had gotten kind of attached to it. Her final aircraft launch occurred on November 24th of 2010, and she would be decommissioned in March of 2011. Once again, she sat in limbo as the Navy once again hummed and hawed over wanting to turn her into a museum, and also floated ideas to turn her into a hospital ship or sink her as an artificial reef. But once again, no dice. Instead, once again, she was unceremoniously sold for scrap in 2013. Yeah, not a single British aircraft carrier was preserved, which is such fucking horseshit. So much history lost. But alas, what can you do? Alright, one last time. Going into the late 1990s, as the Invincible class were approaching the end of their planned service lives, discussions were once again had about the future of British naval aviation. The Falklands War in Iraq 91 had proven the usefulness of aircraft carriers in regions where bases may be harder to access, and their long-range striking power was still highly useful even in the age of missiles. As such, a government report in 1998 determined that the Invincibles were to be replaced by a set of 2, much larger carriers of roughly 40,000 tons with air wings of 50. These ideas were put out to a series of defense contractors to see what they could come up with. Designs evolved to be rather odd, not gonna lie. The carriers would not be equipped with catapults or arrestor wires, as they would be designed with VSTOL jets in mind, but they would have the ability to be quickly refitted with said catabar capability. This was kinda bullshit marketing, but we'll get to that in a second. Displacement was... well, nobody actually knows. The official Royal Navy website says 65,000 tons, but due to OBSEC reasons, that's likely at standard load. Other places give numbers as high as 80,000 tons fully loaded. But generally, when dealing with Navy stuff, the bigger number is usually the right one. The ships were also to be physically just fucking massive, and would be the largest carriers built since the Second World War by physical dimensions. This would allow them to bring a classified mixture of 72 aircraft, including a sizable strike arm of F-35s. Due to not being built with catapults off the rip, they were to have cope slopes to aid in the launching of aircraft. They would also come with as many electronics and radars as she could possibly fit, and a host of AA guns and multiple CIWS batteries. Again, with the ability to rapidly refit 30mm autocannons for extra protection. They would not be nuclear powered, but would still be able to make between 25 and 32 knots. And, of course, the carriers would feature their rare but iconic double island arrangement. After some shipyard merging and reorganization, the final design was accepted in 2008, and after the fucking global financial crisis had abated somewhat, construction would begin the following year. The first ship was the HMS Queen Elizabeth. Because modern defense procurement is complete bullshit, she was way over budget, took 2 years longer than she was supposed to, and underwent multiple redesigns during her construction. She was laid down in July of 2009 in the Rosyth dockyard in the Firth of Forth. Now, I haven't really mentioned dockyards, but Rosyth was one of the primary repair and construction facilities for aircraft carriers, even back in the days of the seaplane tenders, to the point that basically every single British carrier passed through Rosyth at least once. It's a pretty fitting place to bring this video to its conclusion. She would be launched in July of 2014, and after a couple more years of fitting out, sea trials, and defect rectification, she was commissioned in December of 2017. Of course, there isn't much to say about her service life. She spent her first years undergoing further trials and exercises, since she was far and away the largest ship ever built in a British shipyard by this point, and she needed to practice with helicopters and in an assault role. In 2018, she went to the US to test out the F-35s that she was getting, and performed the first cope slope launch of the aircraft. And in October, she made a trip to New York City, which was fun for the residents since American carriers weren't allowed to because, nuclear reactors. She achieved full operational capabilities in January of 2021, and undertook her first combat operations against ISIS later that year, conducting airstrikes and other assorted missions. In March of 2024, she caught fire while docked for repairs since her propeller shaft had broken, which caused some damage but nothing too severe. And to bring us to the present, she spent most of 2025 as a part of a carrier strike group that went on a long journey around the world to Australia and back. Otherwise, though, she's still in service and is projected to stay in service for decades going forward. There was, in fact, a second ship of the Queen Elizabeth class, the HMS Prince of Wales. The dark horse, sure, but a second ship nonetheless. Her development was hamstrung by all sorts of political bullshit and cost overruns, and there was a serious chance, in the early 2010s, that she wouldn't be completed at all. She was laid down in May of 2011 after a report the previous year had determined she was actually going to be built with catabar capabilities. However, despite the claims that these ships could easily be refitted for such technology, this turned out to be a fat fucking lie, and the conversion would have costed like 2 billion extra pounds for literally no reason, so this was reversed in 2013. Then the plan was to cancel her, but the contracts were worded in such a way that it would have also costed billions to actually do that, so she was then slated to be completed and immediately reserved. However, operational requirements changed again, and she was then determined to be completed to full readiness. All of this lollygagging meant that she wouldn't even be launched until December of 2017, and after her fitting out and early sea trials, she would be commissioned into the Royal Navy in December of 2019. Her design was the same as her sister, but interestingly, she was actually given a replica of the King George V Prince of Wales's Belle, manufactured by the same foundry using the same materials that the original was made of, to really carry on the legacy of the fated battleship. Her career started a bit less good, spending most of 2020 in dry dock due to a severe flooding problem that just kept reappearing, that specifically destroyed a bunch of her electrical systems. She spent 2021 exercising and trialing out the F-35s, and in 2022 was promoted to that year's NATO Naval Command ship. However, later that year, she needed to be docked again after her propeller shaft broke. This was a problem with this class. In 2023, she spent a lot of time testing out drones just as a proof of concept, and was the first British carrier to successfully launch and recover an unmanned aircraft. She was most recently deployed in Operation High Mast through most of 2025, which was a trip to East Asia where she sailed with the Italian carrier Cavour and the Japanese definitely not a carrier Kaga, and did exercising and visits. As of today, she's just chillin', and like her sister, the plan is to keep her in service as the backbone of the Royal Navy for decades to come. Huh. Perhaps the sun didn't really set after all. Now, to my knowledge, there aren't any concrete designs or plans floating around for the future of British naval aviation, OPSEC and all that. I did read in a few places that there are plans to order a third Queen Elizabeth with some modifications, but take that with a grain of salt. The British literally invented tabloid journalism after all. That said, there are 100% designs and conversions happening behind closed doors, because that's just how defense procurement works, but of course we probably won't know about these for a while. Otherwise, the British carrier program is kind of just chillin' right now. Not much else to say, really. Looking back on the entire history of British naval aviation, it's truly remarkable to see just how much innovation and advancement the Royal Navy was responsible for. From the earliest trials launching bulky float planes from jury-rigged seaplane carriers to the modern flat-top launching aircraft that break the sound barrier and are capable of literally hovering to land, Britannia certainly earned her reputation as the rulers of the waves. And though the Royal Navy is no longer what it was, those with hearts of oak can still look back on their accomplishments with pride as they continue the legacy of the greatest navy to ever exist. It's over. I did it. I fucking did it. I can't believe it. British aircraft carriers are done. Fuck, I don't know what to do with myself now. This was a uniquely fucking exhausting video to make, but god damn it, it's fucking done. Hope you all found this interesting and maybe learned a thing or two in the process. Surely that will be the most intensive aircraft carrier video. Right? Massive thanks to the board members of my military industrial corporation over on Patreon. You guys keep the war machine running. An extra special thanks goes to Ukrainian Shadow Government, Charles Jalak, Peter Bardos, Ministry of Autismus Affairs, Wolf Commissar, Jonathan Hernandez, Cheese122, A Normal Cow 5, Black Mare, Andrew Deffenbach, Jay, Ray Nertz, Ouch That Hurt, Seor, Harper's Ferry Blues, Zayam Z, Greek Nationalist, The Flag and Anthem Guy, Price, The Oil Master, Gangdolf Bangdolf, Arabian Nights, Kim, Codename Titan Zebra, L. Walter Doro, Protector of the Faith and General Secretary of the National Salvation Council, I Ratman, Billiam Bones, CT Oldsmobile, Clever Riley 9, Comrade Cosmo, Jimmy Legs, A Dog with Sunglasses, Snow Cone Squad, Newt Schmidt, Anthony, 23 Tavarm, Nick Fontaine, Aiden, Higgs, yours truly Shin, the shakiest gun in the Ozarks, the triple-eyed Cyclops, and Waffles 1811. If you too would like to funnel hundreds of billions into massive naval build-up projects, join my Patreon. Tiers 2 and 3 get access to bonus content every month. And on that note, that about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.